This story begins in an Isekai, Santi Incendio, set in the Dantaris Empire, the capital of Redefine, where massive creatures were tearing through nights, plowing through entire lines of them, as they watched the giant beings closing in, and according to the old king, they were the ones responsible for decimating his army of 2 million soldiers. A soldier reports that a huge part of the army was wiped out in the first attack and summoning, while others were critically injured. This old king placed the blame on the Demon King, accusing him of plunging the world into chaos and evil, which is why he was determined to make this his final stand. And with this display he earned the admiration of his men. Meanwhile, in the heart of the great demonic palace, a hero named Alex Bonjili led a group of heroes against the Demon King, Rafinhard of Santa Fe. Helping Alex stood Sirius, a sword saint who vowed that today they would end Rafinhard's dark empire, who was only annoyed that they treated him like his empire was in the shadows, and that they shouldn't use the name that he had given it himself. And at that moment, another overzealous hero named the Martial King, Teslin, shouted that once the Demon King was gone, the demonic nature of the monsters would vanish. This annoyed Rafinhard, since he didn't even have any demonic nature spells, given that all he did was show them human customs among which they found revenge. And tired, with no intention of arguing, he asked them about his 4 heavenly kings, and unfortunately for him, Sirius replied that he had finished off the filthy orc with ease, which finally made the emperor react. He couldn't believe the brave great orc warrior Tedith had passed away, since he always thought of this race as kind and loyal, caring for the weakest, remembering their gentle smiles. Annoyed that they were labeled as monsters, though he couldn't argue much about the smell, and then Tess arrogantly revealed he had dealt with the stinking troll, which made the emperor remember him as Gurur Attica, whom he knew looked ugly, but was spiritual and a nature lover. On her part, the advisor to the Saint Elian was the one who took credit for destroying the evil dwarf who worshipped the dark god. Another blow to the heart of the emperor, who remembered his friend Ashlyn and was upset they labeled him as a worshipper of dark gods, just for not following the 12 main gods. And then the Jade Mage Arcalita claimed his magic had banished the corrupt elf, which was the final nail in the poor heart of Redefine, who in a rage unleashed all his power at the memory of his beloved. Sirius and the heroes were thrilled because he was finally unleashing his evil, boasting about having finished off the dark elf he had tempted. Rafinhard grew even more furious upon hearing them calling Sirius a dark elf, when literally the only dark thing about her was her tan from living in an area deforested by humans, which made the heroes look a bit racist. But none of that mattered to them, since they were determined to attack, even though Antares didn't want to fight. But he knew they would never listen to him, until suddenly Alex launched into an attack, accusing the Emperor of being responsible for the darkness within the monsters. And this was enough to make them snap again, as he couldn't stand them judging all the species that refused to be slaves as if they were dark creatures. Seeing that Alex wouldn't stop, he decided he would give them the satisfaction of being the Demon King they wanted, unleashing his power, clearing the battlefield, and carrying his name with pride, while tears fell from his eyes, remembering his beginnings as a simple, ordinary great mage, though being a great mage wasn't very ordinary, and in a simpler time, where he learned how humans didn't see other species as equals, labeling elves as long-lived servants, dwarves as mining slaves, orcs as dumb beings for simple labor, and trolls as ingredients for medicine. And during his formative years, he saw that those considered slaves were much more than that, and became familiar with their forgotten culture. He lived with and learned from them spirit magic from elves and sorcery from trolls, and by combining them, he was the first to achieve circle magic. Thanks to this, he began to help them. And unfortunately, the more their civilizations improved, the more humans attacked them, destroying their territories. This forced them to move constantly and unintentionally. Through each of these defenses, they managed to claiming more and more land, eventually growing to form a bright and prosperous empire, which they named Antares, built on a clear principle: equality. And despite everything, they never sought to attack humans, but even so, it resulted in massacres. Even though everyone in Antera enjoyed living there, those humans saw them as victims of evil spells and sought to wipe them out. And although the Emperor understood that his army of orcs and goblins didn't look very friendly, he didn't think that was a good enough reason for this war. So he was determined to protect his empire, using all of his power. And just like that, he took out Alex, whom he looked down upon for using both magic and swords without being an expert in either. And in this way, he finished off all the so-called heroes, except for one, the Martial King. Tess, the most powerful of them all, who didn't think twice before attacking, making Rafinhard recoil from his brutal strikes, making the logical choice to escape. However, he didn't get far before Tess caught up, delivering a brutal elbow strike that crushed his skull, and yet the Emperor remained standing in battle, a bit battered, but determined, earning the martial king's respect. And though the Emperor was having second thoughts, since with a broken spine and a crushed head he'd rather give up, until Tess emphasized that by eliminating him he would also eliminate the bond between the species. This brought back his fighting spirit as he realized they truly believed that the natural state of monsters was to be slaves. So with his last bit of strength he pulls out the Eye of Time and Space, an artifact he didn't even know how to use, and against Tess's battle cries, Riefenhaar unleashed his power, activating the time regression spell. Unsure if it would work, and Tess tried to stop him by launching an attack, and in a massive clash of powers, the Emperor refused to die, standing his ground as best as he could, and then suddenly, it was a new day. Griffenheart felt a comfortable warmth, surprised to still be alive, and although he didn't think it would actually work, he now even doubted if he recognized the place where he was. Getting up, not noticing that he was now in the body of a young Tess. And that's when he noticed his extremely ripped body, realizing he had no idea who he was looking at, only feeling that all those extra muscles were unnecessary for a mage, who only needed a brain and not a shredded six-pack. He remembered that despite being a bit scrawny in his youth, he was always a lady killer and a total heartbreaker without needing a dumb sculpted physique. Because of this, he assumed the spell had failed, thinking it had simply transported his soul into the body of some random guy, until curiously enough, he noticed that if he grew a little taller and grew a beard, he would be looking at the face of the martial king, Teslan. He couldn't even process it before a giant, muscular old man appeared at his door, who reminded him that it was already morning. Even though the protagonist had no idea who he was, this didn't seem to surprise the old man, since according to him he had used the amnesia trick before, claiming he wouldn't fall for it, and so he grabbed him by the head to drag him forcibly toward training. Left with no other choice, he realized that this old man was Tess's master, and the greatest martial artist of all time, Gerard Cromproteus, who, with a huge grin, tied the supposed Tess to a tree. He tried to reason with the old man, but that proved way too annoying, so he preferred to just gag him. Poor wife could only watch as the old man approached, with a massive piece of bamboo which he slammed brutally into his abdomen, causing him so much pain he was almost in tears, writhing in agony, and unable to even suffer in peace, as he began to be relentlessly crushed, with nothing left to do but think that he would soon be reunited with his beloved. "Cirrus, I'm coming to see the light." Meanwhile, his master was puzzled by his attitude, assuming that maybe he really did have amnesia, which according to him was common in such brutal training, where he himself had apparently also lost some brain cells. Luckily or not for the protagonist, Gerard knew the solution: a good old-fashioned beating, which wouldn't stop no matter how much he begged for mercy, though every now and then he'd stop to share his philosophy, believing that those who used tools were weak and that martial artists were the ultimate tool themselves. Get with it. Kung Fu lives in everything we do, kid. It's all good, since one gets stronger through heat and strikes, just like steel, which only made the protagonist think he was completely insane. And with the philosophical breakover, he decided to resume the beating like it was nothing, remembering how few could endure that level. Glad to have Tess as his disciple, getting so hyped that he hit him again, demanding that he bring out the greatness within, which only reinforced Riffin's idea that the old man was crazy, but all those hits seemed to unlock a beautiful memory, which was enough to keep him incredibly alive, until the end of the training session, where it finally ended, with him thanking the abuse, only to end up later soaked in a comfortable bath of a healing potion that was insanely expensive without understanding why, but Gerard made it clear, all good steel, after being forged. It had to cool down, and even though the protagonist was confused, he understood it, and in this way, he pushed his body to the limit, and then used recovery techniques and potions to heal fast and get stronger quickly, realizing that although the method seemed insane, it actually worked. And remembering how strong the Tess he knew was, he figured that thanks to all that hard training, he was so powerful. And seeing that he was officially in the past, he could only think about the complications of it, wondering if there was another young Griffenheart out there, and not knowing if two identical souls could coexist at the same time, or believing that in the body of little Griffin was the soul of the real Tess. And now the next day, his master expected him to wolf it all down, referring to an insane amount of meat, which also seemed like method of torture. And Riffin noticed that once he finished eating, it was followed by a light jog to the peak of a massive mountain, carrying dozens of pounds on his back, with Gerard asking him if he was tired yet, but he'd deny it and keep training, wondering when this hell would end, and until his day ended once again, completely spent in his bed, crawling to a corner where he suffered, in a fetal position, thinking about escaping and trying to rationalize the problems he had caused, and on one hand, he was terrified of meeting the original Griffin for fear of vanishing in a paradox, though he thought it was unlikely, since that version should still be hitting the books in a tower for at least 10 more years. He also considered this possibility that the real Tess might have possessed his child self, though with that scrawny body. He doubted he could do anything, and he didn't see him as fit for magic either. But he also figured that as a master he'd fear reconnecting with his own body in its muscular and magic-powered version. However, he brushed that aside, since his main priority was to escape, and so he ran at full speed, with nothing on his mind but getting away, until Gerard cut him off. The protagonist froze in his tracks, hearing the old man say calmly that after 2 quiet months, he was trying to escape again. So out of options, Griffin confessed that he wasn't actually Teslan but a mage named Reifenhart, which didn't seem to surprise Gerard since apparently the real Tess had already used that reincarnation trick several times before. And before picking up the terrified protagonist, the old man confessed that at least this time it sounded convincing, congratulating him on improving his stories. While dragging him back to his room, Griffin, defeated and humiliated, didn't give up and was still determined to escape. However, all his attempts by air, land, or water were thwarted by his always smiling and understanding master, who seemed to see his younger self in him and claimed every time he dragged him back that soon he would see the reward. And so the dreaded Demon King, known for never quitting, finally threw in the towel. Seeing that the training method was just as brutal as the methods to prevent escapes, he figured that even if he succeeded, he'd have a jacked old man chasing him for the rest of his life. So he preferred to just finish the training this way. Griffin accepted his fate, enduring 2 years of tough love, until after so much suffering he managed to awaken his aura, amazed to have even surpassed geniuses like Sirius, who had only achieved that feat after reaching 20. And although for Gerard it was expected with that training method, since it pushed life and body to the absolute limit, triggering a massive spike in power that displayed the aura, finally ending the torture with the giant sledgehammers. And he was now moving on to martial arts techniques, which hyped up the former mage, thinking that he'd be able to get out of there soon, until he heard that his next training phase would be sparring matches with his master, and between one beating and the next, 3 years passed. And so, in the kingdom of Vasily Arcturus Mountains, Riff charged his entire aura into his fist to use all his speed and deliver a brutal strike that carved out a new cave. However, it wasn't enough, since he could barely master the third stance of the horn technique of calamity, blow that concentrated his entire aura into a single point, causing a massive destructive impact. But if he wanted to get down from there, he had to reach the fourth stance. This was a 9-stance technique, and the last one consisted of a rippling punch that could wipe out even the gods, something neither the original Tess nor Gerard ever managed to reach. And although his main goal was to leave that place, he noticed that for the first time his master had left him on his own, as he had gone back to town to hang out and drink. And he was surprised at himself for having wanted to escape in the past, because now he was clear and determined to finish his training. However, he also tried to use his magic and firing off a ball of energy at the trees. It didn't even have half its former power, stunted by his rock-hard body, and he doubted if at that moment he could ever get all his magic power back. Nonetheless, all those thoughts were cut short by a presence he recognized as non-human when he saw how from the forest emerged an orc armed and ready for a fight, with whom he locked eyes, until the protagonist received a warning to pretend he hadn't seen him. Griffin suspected it, and judging by his height, he estimated he was barely 4 years old, and most likely he was a runaway from some arena in the region, and that's why the nervous little orc kept threatening him. So the MC, knowing they were a race that didn't go looking for unnecessary fights, asked him in his own tongue if he was being chased. This shocked the orc, seeing that he knew his language. The MC claimed he had received a blessing, so the orc finally opened up, admitting that he was indeed being hunted. Rifen decided to help him, even though the orc, with extremely refined speech, recognized his kind heart, but didn't want to put him in danger. Still, the MC insisted he had the skills to help him, and cast his magic on the cave he had created earlier, forming a magic veil. The orc was grateful, but stunned to see the unusual look of a mage, jacked on steroids and having no more time for questions. He hid just as his pursuers approached. They were complaining about having to work for just a few gold pieces, and upon arrival, they ran into Rifen, from whom their leader demanded information, though a nicer knight offered silver in exchange, even though in reality it was just bait to get the intel, with no intention of paying a dime. But the MC saw right through that, so he wasn't planning on saying a single word. However, to his bad luck, he had forgotten to hide the orc's footprints, so now they wanted to search the cave. something he couldn't allow. This ended up infuriating the leader, even though his partner suggested not to underestimate the muscular kid, and despite this, confident in his numerical advantage, he decided to push forward. Rifan remembered the teachings of his master that had turned his fists into lethal weapons, so he decided to use something less lethal, summoning a massive mallet which he considered the only way to show them mercy. And so he stood before them, simply waiting while they all confidently rushed in to attack, only to be repelled by a simple swing of his mallet, leaving them humiliated. They came back for more, which he appreciated, though he felt pity remembering that the weapon techniques from his training weren't for actual combat, but for disciplining students, which unfortunately involved delivering heavy blows until one of the mercenaries managed to attack him from behind. But only the sword got damaged, surprising even Rifan, who didn't expect his body to be so ridiculously tough. So he quickly swatted the mercenary through the air and proceeded to beat them all down, confident that his giant club wouldn't actually unalive anyone, since it only shattered bones and joints. And that's how he left them all, groaning on the ground, with the leader of the knights furiously asking who he was. But the MC didn't answer him, as it felt unfair that he was the only one not yet writhing in pain, so he made sure to fix that, and once finished, he let them escape. They all left humiliated, and as they faded away, Rifan felt a bit sad, because the fun was over, realizing how satisfying it was to bash people with a mallet, thinking about getting a disciple. And as the sun set, the orc bowed to him in gratitude, and although the MC complained about the excessive respect, the orc recognized him as his mentor, and understanding the weight of that, he accepted, and the orc asked for his name. The MC was about to say the name of the body he possessed, but at the last second he called himself Rifan Heart of Antares, with the orc bowing to him once again. And then Rifan asked him about his next destination, but the orc didn't know, and hoped to find a place where he wouldn't live as a slave, so the MC sent him to a place called the Trailway, where an orc village was hidden away. The grateful orc accepted and set off. But before he left, Rifan wanted to know his name. He was the heir of the Chalata. Ironically, his friend named Tajir had the exact same name, and was one of his heavenly kings and leader of the orcs. This left Rifan a bit concerned, since he doubted that if the original Tess ever met his friend, the guy would even help him, though he realized he had already started to warp the timeline. Nevertheless, while watching him walk away, he was glad he did it. And he remembered his 4 friends and his happy life in his empire, hoping that one day they would all be together again. And so passed a 1.5 years since that strange encounter with his friend, and currently the most important thing for him was surviving his master's explosive strikes, who only increased the intensity if the MC complained, forcing him to use the defense technique, Spiral Gerard. Seeing this, he congratulated him for mastering the move, reminiscing with nostalgia about when his disciple tried to escape by pretending to be a mage. To the MC, that seemed like a totally random memory from 6 years ago, although his master remembered it with pride, since after 10 long years, his disciple had finally grown strong. Unfortunately, the downside was that he ended up a midget. Rifan doubted that someone standing 6'3" could be considered a midget, but his master told him a martial king must be over 6'7", and suspected he was cutting corners on his training. The MC blamed it on genetics, even though he actually had indeed skipped it, just to keep from getting monstrously huge. And even so, Gerard trusted him for the final test. And so the MC, in the middle of the mountains, watched over by his master, began by channeling his aura into his fist, and leaping up to activate the Horn of Calamity, plunging at full speed against the mountain, and upon impact he created a massive wave of destruction that spread across the entire terrain. Gerard, super hyped, celebrated, confident that with that power, no one could beat him, while Riven still couldn't believe it, standing there in shock, until his master told him it was time to go out into the outside world, watching him with pride, seeing that his disciple, Rivenheart, had crushed the training, revealing that he always knew he would, and now he was giving him the freedom to live however he wanted. Whether for better or worse, he gave him free will, as that was his payment for the hard training. Rifan now listened in disbelief, as his master said goodbye with 3 pieces of advice, the same ones his master Rastal gave him. The first was that amassing wealth was fine, as long as it was obtained fairly. Advice that in that flashback a young Gerard thought clashed with his freedom to be a villain, but Rastal made it clear, if he was going to be bad, he had to be a villain with class. The second advice was that he should always side with the unjustly mistreated, from whom he was sure to earn respect, and Gerard back then didn't understand what he meant, thinking it was just like protecting the weak. But his master clarified that many would be weaker than him, but not all of them were outcasts. The third and most important one, which Gerard followed to the letter, was to carry on the unbreakable, bodybuilding at all costs. In other words, he had to find a disciple to teach it to. A mission that Riffin accepted, though his master told him to take it. Easy since it wouldn't be simple to find a kid with actual talent. But once he did, he shouldn't let him escape. Literally. And just like that, tossing him some bags of clothes and a little cash, he wished him a safe trip. However, Riffin quickly realized that it would barely be enough to survive for half a year as a commoner. Having lived off someone with a massive fortune and a mansion, even though inflation had spiked compared to what he received in his time, he couldn't really complain. Plus, he also left him a map to find a little extra gift in the Star Mountains, suggesting he visit if he was passing by. And so a nostalgic Riffin began heading down the mountain, looking back and wondering if it was okay to leave after so long, feeling melancholy while looking at his home of many years, until a massive flash of light spooked him. His master was saying goodbye by unleashing his great aura, gradually destroying the landscape, hoping his disciple would leave without nostalgia or regrets, and that as a student of the greatest teachings, he would run without looking back. Riffin definitely ran, but mostly out of pure fear. Meanwhile, in town, a man was trying to hold back the boss who was confronting a lowlife. Knight, he was demanding payment for the food services provided to him and his men. But the greedy knight, annoyed by this, decided to arrogantly pay them with a single measly coin, feeling that as simple peasants, they should be grateful just to see that much money. But the nervous innkeeper insisted that it didn't even cover a fraction of the bill. This infuriated the old knight, who, claiming they wanted to scam him, viciously struck the old man. The villagers rushed to help him, furious because the knights, they were more like bandits who had hogged all the food, transportation, and lodging for a pathetic price. And right at that moment, a nobleman appeared, asking the infamous knight he called Sir Edward if there was any problem with it. The knight told no to the young Stephen who was approaching, and suggesting to them not to be so cruel to the miserable peasants whom he had to remind of their place. Meanwhile, Riffin remembered when Cirrus used to caress him in bed, praising his scrawny body as a sharp blade, a memory he held with pride. He lamented that now he was a muscular giant who might no longer be that elf's type. And even though he looked on the bright side of his height, he thought about winning back his love, who at this time should be about 70 years old, which in human years was like being 17. Looking at the city through the window, he remembered that in a year and a half, Cirrus could be sold at a slave auction. He was torn between arriving and destroying everything, though that might not be best if he wanted to regain his magical talents. So in the end, he chose to use the power of money, even though right now he was dead broke. So he planned to put that sculpted body and his knowledge of the future to work, aiming for the Shaitan Path runes. Strangely enough, these runes were also the goal for Stephen, who, along with the top mage from the Delphi Tower, an archaeology specialist, was certain he'd find the legendary site, where a legendary swordsman was buried. For his part, Riffin traveled across the map, searching for his next destination. And so, using his artificial flashback technique, through which he brought back memories of his past, he managed to recall Mage Todd, who must be investigating the ruins at this very moment, and these were ruins he had visited, with Cirrus in the past, finding a massive hidden treasure that scored him a ton of cash. And that's how he moved forward until finally reaching the ranching village. The villagers were gathered there trying to handle the request from those annoying knights who were demanding a guide for the Valley of Death. They were terrified to refuse the request, especially after what they did to their boss, cursing the nobles they feared so much. That's why an archer named Ted offered to take on the job, since he was the only one who knew the terrain, and he accepted the task, despite his family's tears and worry. He clearly didn't want to go even less after seeing the stone-cold glares from the other cowards in his village. Luckily, a huge face at the window offered to do it. It was Riffin, who, after scaring the crap out of them, formally introduced himself. Even though Ted insisted on knowing if he knew the area, the MC replied that he'd been there before. Still, Ted insisted that no one had ever come back alive, which was starting to annoy Riffin, since he had already explained it. Besides, they should be grateful he was saving their hides, and he remembered the Valley of Death as a dungeon from a forgotten era. Back then, a young swordsman named Cold, who awakened his aura at the young age of 45, went on several adventures all over Vasily. Over time, filled with fame and arrogance, he faced the Valley of Death with nothing but his maid by his side. That place ended up being his final resting place, along with the legendary demonic sword Alchian, the symbol of the Alchian family who hadn't stopped looking for it for 50 years. The same people who were now here, led by Stephen Altian, who was supposed to be Chold's grandson. He was accompanied by an elf named Lesha, who sucked up to him way too much, boosting the noble's ego. So he preferred to ignore her flirting, choosing to check on the group, like his saint, Cillian, who was extremely young, and despite his looks was actually a guy. I'd definitely smash, though he doubted this guy had any real experience with spells. So he was planning to talk to Toldo, but Toldo had been keeping Cillian away from them for a while, chatting him up excitedly. Eventually, the MC started to realize that the mage was a total creep who was into minors, and Refin wasn't about to let his friend get cuffed by the FBI. He was snapped out of his thoughts by Edward, who told him he'd made a great choice by joining them. Refin didn't think guiding them was that big of a deal, but according to the knight, no one else in the village wanted to do it. Edward found it strange, since they would be under the protection of the brave knights. The MC felt awkward seeing such a massive ego, remembering how most knights had narcissistic tendencies. He soon forgot about that, because at that moment several creatures dropped from the sky like whirlwinds, landing in the trees. They were harpies, and they were setting up an ambush against the group. Stephen looked down on the creatures and sent his troops to attack. Toldo repelled monsters with a massive whip of fire, while Cillian gave the knights a massive buff. Meanwhile, Refin just watched, amazed by everyone's power level, especially Stephen, whom he recognized as strong. But now that he was a martial artist himself, he saw Stephen's technique as pathetic. However, at that moment, a harpy dived toward the orcs carrying the luggage, forcing Refin to react, sending it flying with a brutal blow. And if the story played out as usual, the guide was supposed to be taken out during this trip. And all that without the expedition captain giving a single damn about him. His name was Stephen Altian, someone the MC didn't actually consider a bad person, but simply a selfish brat who focused only on himself until... But analyzing it further, I realized that is precisely the definition of a bad person. It's a personality that in another time would have caused him to lose his guide. On the other hand, Selena asked him to hide behind them, making it clear that at least there, not everyone was selfish, even though in reality, he wasn't in any danger, since he didn't even feel the harpy's blows. Unfortunately, he had forgotten that his eyes didn't have muscles, and one of them, Furious, hit him directly there, reminding him that he wasn't immortal. However, the battle ended quickly. Stephen was worried about his soldiers, the mage and the saint, but completely ignored both him and the ogres. And with the battle over, he proudly raised his sword, hyping up his cavalry's strength. Refin used the chaos as an opportunity to speak with Toldo, thanking him for his work as a mage, and taking the chance to ask him if at the tower where they came from, he knew his good friend, the current Reifenhart. Toldo was surprised that a kid would have such a rough-looking friend. He made a total creep face while remembering him as a kind and cute boy. This worried the MC, so he asked why he was so interested. The protagonist replied by asking if he hadn't noticed any changes lately. The mage insisted he hadn't, saying the boy was perfectly happy, studying magic, and that his face was still as cute and angelic as ever, praising him excessively. Refin saw him as someone truly terrifying, holding back the urge to punch him, while asking again if his attitude had changed. The drooling mage replied no, he hadn't noticed anything weird, even though he stalked him closely. Just then they were interrupted by the young healer, who asked the MC if he was hurt. He claimed he was fine, asking Cillian to look after the ogres instead. They humbly claimed to be fine as well, but the healer started treating them anyway, which annoyed the knights, who didn't want him wasting energy on mere creatures. Refin thought it was kind that they were being healed, but he couldn't help but notice that they were being treated like pets. And even though the orcs were grateful, he saw how long and rough the road to equality between species still was. At that moment, Stephen only remembered his existence to make him get back to work as a guide. So completely stone-faced, Riff decided to give them the directions, and so sometime later, after fighting basilisks, wolves, and ogres, everyone arrived exhausted and traumatized without understanding why there were so many monsters in those mountains. The reason was that Riff had intentionally chosen the most complicated path, getting a kick out of seeing that Stephen was exhausted, whom he asked if he wanted to rest. But he was furious and decided to keep moving his troops. The MC had a blast seeing the knights' arrogance, which is why he had taken them on a faster route, which curiously was also more dangerous, and despite everything, Stephen kept pushing forward, now understanding why Cholo hadn't made it out of there alive, and they reached a cliff from where he joyfully celebrated with his second-in-command that they had finally reached their destination, the massive ruins of Palton. As everyone reached the entrance, they prepared to enter. Refin told them he would wait for them there, but Stephen told him he could leave now, since he no longer needed his services. But the MC claimed he couldn't go back alone, so the Lord agreed, thanking him for his service, and offering to escort him once they get out. This left the MC cold, as he realized the original plan was to leave him to his fate, and so Stephen prepared his troops to defeat the monster dwelling inside, to recover the sword of Altion. And so all fired up, they follow him, quickly ready for battle, with Ryfin wishing them luck, with a smile waiting to be left alone, so that when the time comes, he can carry out his real plan. Remembering that while it was true that these days the dungeon was crawling with monsters in the Silver Age, it had simply been a military base. With miracle technology for that time, stepping into the place, he was filled with nostalgia for the days when he was happy, traveling there with his beloved Cirrus who, quickly with her skills, had discovered a secret path, and once it was open, they had used it to do some NSFW things, drooling as he remembered how he totally railed her back then. However, the blurriest part of those memories was the entrance to that secret passage, which he finally found, but it was hard to open since his body wasn't reacting well to mana yet. When he finally managed to do it, he decided to test his fitness carefully, putting away his coat because he didn't want to waste money, and he started to warm up. However, while he was at it, he began to hear screams which he ignored, until he noticed they were coming from the door they had just opened, and now confused, until he remembered it used to be a military base, and what he had just done was a form of illegal access that had triggered traps, unlike the first time he was there. When he went alone with Iris, this time the Altion group had fallen into a trap that took them to the basement where he had unintentionally forced them to face huge and terrifying demons which Stephen doubted they could even defeat. And now we head back a bit. Celian was found, healing the wounded men after the little surprise, Fall receiving everyone's gratitude. However, he's more worried about getting out of there, thanking everything for being the one who saved him from the fall. Nonetheless, Todd remains very serious, doubting that they are anywhere near being safe, when from that massive door, knights errant start being sent flying out, while others run in terror, unable to fight against the colossal monster attacking them, and the little cleric calls upon the goddess Felenzi to wipe out the evil. He blankets the battlefield with his blessing, bestowing divine power upon the knights. But the knights are still terrified, which annoys Celian. Feeling pity for the cowardly knights, cranking up the amount of divine power, he pumps into them until they become enraged beings similar to berserkers who now finally return to the battle, and Todd classifies this as a drug that's a bit much, but effective, since the army now charges fearlessly against the monsters while he takes care of buffing them, using his magic to lift fallen swords as well. Lesya enters the fray, fighting hard against the creatures. However, she ends up getting severely injured by a blow that leaves her clinging to life on the ground, and even so her only concern seems to be getting her master's approval, who practically couldn't care less about her. Returning to the attack, and after several precise strikes he managed to defeat the monster immediately, earning the admiration of Andrew and the others. But there was no time for celebrations. Still with worry etched on his face, he ordered everyone to huddle up since they were right in front of the place that had been capable of taking down even Sir Claude. And at that moment, the ceiling begins to rain fire, blindsiding everyone. The flames are coming from a gigantic, colossal monster which lets out a powerful roar, just before unleashing its attack on the knights, who fall engulfed in hellfire. And though their leaders tell them not to waver, most of them seem terrified by the Colossus, which quickly slams the ground, unleashing a wave of fire that consumes many soldiers. While the others try to escape, Stephen is one of the few still standing, enduring the flames and beating himself up, thinking he could be defeated right there, but he refuses to carry that dishonor, gripping his sword, determined to go back on the offensive. And he uses a random knight as a footstool to launch himself high up with the determination to uphold the honor of the Altion name, managing to pierce the monster with his attack. Unfortunately for him, it does nothing, and he ends up just being pimp-slapped, which sends him flying until he crashes into the ground, completely defeated, before the eyes of his army. And with him gone, Celian steps forward to invoke the blessing of his god's light, trying to attack the monster. However, these attacks only manage to piss it off more, and the creature sets its sights on the terrified kid, who has no choice but to brace himself, accepting his death. However, suddenly something hits the monster hard, making it turn away. Celian is shocked to still be alive, slowly looking up. He finds Ryfin, who has managed to strike the monster with just his fist, ready to keep fighting, until he sees how suddenly the monster shuts down, so he assumes he took it out. Confused that it was so easy, understanding now how a simple test punch really packed a punch in his past life. And now his priority was to get the wounded out of there. First, he'll have to step over a huge number of undead, and right before the eyes of Todd and Celian, they see how he simply crushes them with his bare hands. Later, Stephen wakes up seeing all the creatures defeated. Confused, he asks Andrew what happened, and he fills him in. The story leaves him stunned as he confirms that his guide is a martial artist. So changing his tune, he approaches to apologize and asks his name, although Ryfin almost forgets that everyone knows the real Ryfinheart. so he decides to just go by Riffin. Andrew had never heard that name before, so he tries to find out if he has any family. However, the protagonist doesn't have any. This makes Steven see him as just a commoner, changing his attitude again and looking down on him, claiming he only finished off the ones the others had already weakened, thanking him condescendingly. Riffin, tired of this, brushed his hand off, reminding him that he was the one who was useless. This infuriates the noble, who demands respect for his family. Andrew calms him down, reminding him he's just an uneducated wanderer, which settles him down, now asking about his master. And though he prefers not to say since Gerard was world famous, Steven doubts someone like that would have a renowned master, but Riffin suggested that instead of continuing with his interrogation, he'd better treat his wounded. And although Andrew keeps watching the protagonist, noticing that his arrogance is that of a high-ranking official thinking he could be royalty from some foreign country, though he also acted like an old man, and Riffin, for his part, has to deal with a very friendly Cillian who admires his height and big muscles, asking him about his training method, and though he tells him it just consists of getting hit, the cleric thinks he's lying, looking at him with glowing admiration. And this little Cillian, a small orphan who was bullied in the orphanage because of his size and appearance, which made him long for things he lacked, like a deep voice and rugged features, so he sought to train. However, despite all his effort, he stayed the same height and greasy hair, which drove him to despair. Even though he pumped iron, his only improvement was in the healing spell he used on himself. That's why he currently admired people who were tall and muscular, but Riffin, without context, sees him as just a stalker. Preferring to look for and exit the little guy, tries to stick to him like a leech, but the protagonist reminds him he needs to stay and heal the wounded, so Steven offers to go with him. The protagonist lets him follow, beginning to explore the hallways, where the noble is still salty about being saved by a commoner. And seeing him as stuck up, he hopes a monster appears so he can show off his skills and have him praise him like everyone else does. However, while he's thinking this, his brain gets shut off courtesy of Riffin, who, seeing they are near their destination, preferred to ditch him just when huge monsters come out of the hallway, which Riffin easily defeats. And now, with no dead weight, he goes for the treasure, reaching an old office where the infinite bag was located, an artifact that allows storing objects 10 times its size and reduces the weight by at least 10 times. And so he begins to find multiple valuable items. And so once he's finished, he returns to Steven, who has just woken up, blaming the monsters for knocking him unconscious, which makes him feel humiliated, and with no other choice, he thanks him for the help, but Riffin doesn't give it any importance, mainly because he knows deep down that it won't be the only time he knocks him out. And so while gathering treasure, he ended up knocking him out cold 3 times, worried he might have turned him into a total idiot. Though as a noble, his life will still be smooth sailing. For his part, Steven thinks he's just low on vitamins, and Riffin realizes that his bag is already full, so he decides to head back. And now, with the group back together, they push on, and just then Cillian asks if he's royalty, and even though the protagonist denies it, the little guy insists, because of his natural and confident way of speaking. He doesn't just talk down to Steven, but even to Edward, who is older. With this, Ivan realizes he had forgotten that now he was just a young kid, so he decides to blame it on his life as a hermit, and at that very moment, they come across a door, which upon passing through leads them to a colossal beast called Grelber, which Riffin never expected to find there, preferring to retreat. However, one of the knights points out to Steven the sword the creature is wielding, which is exactly the one they're after. So Steven, now gripping his sword, brushes off Andrew's warning and denies it, complaining that the sword of Asian must not be defiled. So he's determined to get it back at all costs, leading his squad, who follow him blindly, before the gaze of the protagonist, who just labels them as a bunch of idiots, and knowing that in the ruins dimensions there's a system that automatically upgrades its own weaknesses. Realizing the massive problem, that system had a glitch. In the process, it dragged in the monsters that were besieging them and turned them into guardians, stripping away their free will to make them slaves of the machine. And from then on, they were upgraded over and over, until they formed the massive being that they're facing right now, one powerful enough to have killed a legendary swordsman. And even so, Steven, he rallies his men for battle, claiming that it's just a chained-up monster, even though Griffin clearly tells him that if they fight, they won't make it out alive. Edward thanks him for his help, but makes it clear that as a wandering barbarian, he doesn't understand what honor means and why it's worth giving your life for. Without saying another word, he follows his boss straight into the fray, while the protagonist can only stand there watching, disappointed by the lack of common sense in thinking they can beat that beast. Then Cillian decides to help, giving the soldiers a buff that boosts their momentum. Unfortunately, in no time at all, everyone ends up getting sent flying. The MC insists they won't make it, but nobody seems to listen. he simply resigns himself to watching while dodging the soldiers, who keep flying through the air. Meanwhile, Steven doesn't give up and keeps encouraging the rest, which is enough for the protagonist to throw in the towel and stop trying to make them see reason, hoping Edward would be more sensible, even though he admits the stubborn noble is actually putting up a decent fight. At least he's still alive, and attacking no matter how little damage he deals. And then, the little cleric summoned the power of Philancia and blasted the monster with a massive lightning bolt, which Lilsi uses as an opening to attack the head directly, even though it does no damage. It creates an opportunity for her master to sync up with her, landing some damage on the beast, and this leaves Rifen stunned, seeing that maybe he underestimated them, especially Lilsi, whom he now considers the second strongest in the group. At that point, Todd joins the fray, creating a giant tornado that he plans to use to finish off the beast, hitting his goal or something like that because he only finished the first phase of the defense system, triggering the second phase, unleashing the beast from its chains. This worries the protagonist, who watches as the monster leaps up to deliver a brutal strike that shatters the ground, creating a shockwave. Before taking out more knights with a single swipe, Steven tries to strike back, but gets hit with a heavy punch that makes him spit blood, before being launched against a wall, where Edward rushes over to check on him. Lesia also tries to attack. However, the beast just swats her out of its path, and then it starts charging up its fire breath, winding up long enough to let loose a brutal fire blast that sweeps the entire battlefield, wiping out soldiers all the way to the rear lines, heading straight for Sicilian, who resigns herself to her fate. However, the attack is blocked by the body of Rifen, who takes it head-on, dissipating it with a simple move, and he apologizes for not joining the battle sooner, doubting if he can actually defeat the beast. However, he also sees it as an opportunity to test his strength, releasing his aura for the fight, and as he remembers that in the past as a mage he never fought with the odds against him, but now his warrior spirit was getting hyped for the challenge, and following the advice of his master at that time, who used to say, when in doubt, strike first. He lunges into the attack with brutal energy hits that connected against the monster, which reacted furiously, attacking with its sword. Rifen dodged but managed to take a small cut. Realizing that the demonic sword was able to pierce his tough body, the fight continues with both moving rapidly. This time, the beast wins, sending him flying with a kick, slamming him against a wall, as Sicilian watches in worry and Rifen comes out unscathed, leaving the little one shocked. However, he is a bit annoyed that he couldn't counterattack, noticing that even after his training, he keeps taking hits. Realizing he'll have to step it up, and with the beast furious and him hyped up, massive exchange of blows begins. All of this happens right before the confused eyes of Steven, who watches as a simple homeless drifter with no family manifests an aura before he does, unable to process it. He watches increasingly terrified by the brutal battle between the beast and Griffin, screaming in desperation and wondering who on earth that guy was as the fight continues, with the MC gaining ground and managing to push the creature back. Amazed by the results of his training, he manages to predict the beast's strikes and fire them right back. However, this is far from over, since the Ruin Guardians have a linked mana system that regenerates their wounds, making them even stronger and more monstrous. It tries to use its fire breath, which Rifen exploits to make his move, overpowering the beast's arm and launching himself to deliver a powerful kick. Recalling every single movement from his training, he starts using the beast as a literal punching bag, shocking the onlookers. Despite this, he knows the battle has dragged on too long, thinking about ending it with his calamity horn. But he also knows that if he goes overboard with power, everyone might end up terrified. And this slip-up allows the beast to counterattack while the MC defends himself. And at that moment, Todd suggests he shroud his sword in aura to cut it, but for Rifen, that's impossible, since he has no clue how to do it. This leaves the mage confused, since he's unaware of his clan's excessive weapon traditions. Meanwhile, the MC has to hold off the beast as best he can, while Sylvia seems to have a plan. Using his tanky body, the MC agrees, while holding the beast in place. This works for the little one, who asks him to hold on, as he unleashes Philancia's blessing, meant to, usually to objects, but he blasts it straight into his own body, charging him with such energy that it fills him with adrenaline, and this causes him to grab the beast and lift it with all his strength, to brutally slam it against the ground, and the MC shudders, seeing how insane that little guy is for using so much power, meant to be used on a sword, directly on himself. And though the good thing is it worked without hesitation, he told him to finish the monster off. He obeys the crazy little guy, running at full speed to land a divine kick, a divine knee, and finally, with all his power let loose, the divine drifter punch, vaporizing the creature and posing epically, until he realizes that it's all over. And during the celebration, Cillian just can't believe it, celebrating that it's all over despite Stephen barely being able to walk, having to be helped by Edward. That doesn't calm his fury toward the MC, thinking that if he had that power from the start, why didn't he use it? He feels his honor has been trampled. Turning his back, which a furious Stephen feels, is another sign of disrespect, so he attacks him only to miss and fall, straight into the pit, left feeling even more humiliated, and the MC approaches him to give him the sword he wanted so badly, stating that he never made fun of him. Andrew admired the boy's lack of greed, seeing him as a true adventurer while Stephen is left like a scolded child and the MC walks away, thinking that he is greedy, but that sword isn't even as good as the ones made by his comrades, and with that, Stephen finally decides to leave, and back at the village, Cillian heals the sick and spreads the word to bring more followers to Phalancia. Meanwhile, Stephen heads towards the outskirts, suggesting that Edward investigate Rifin since he still hasn't gotten over being surpassed. For his part, the MC heads off to meet Cirrus, followed by a flea-sized cleric, who is very happy to be following him, telling him that from that day on he will be a wandering priest. Rifin calls him a pilgrim, and knows those guys don't usually survive for long, and although the little guy doesn't know it, he is determined to follow the strongest, most jacked man he has ever met. Checking him out intensely, Rifin, feeling harassed about how he always keeps running into creeps, thinks that since the boy is a cleric, a healer could be useful for taking care of Cirrus. So he lets him lead the way, and so officially, Cillian asks him how to train for abs, even though the MC only knows about getting beaten up and lifting boulders, and the little one tells him that nowadays alchemists make whey protein for muscles. Crazy enough, the MC isn't interested in the slightest. Meanwhile, in Shantan, a merchant named Barrett was furious because his elf wouldn't let him get down and dirty, thinking that even though he bought her cheap, she was very defective. Because of this, he was determined to return her, seeing as this was now the third time she was being returned. And so the adventurers arrived at Shantan, a merchant nation in the north of the continent, bordering multiple cities, and a hub for commercial tourism. Thanks to the river that runs through it, and among all its settlements, the capital Cephalon stands out, the capital of trade and Rifin's destination, who was already there, walking alongside Cillian, who found it to be hectic being a market area. Rifin understood why, since it was a city founded by merchants who bought the land from the kingdom of Kraken, seeing it as a great spot for wealthy traders and where he was sure he'd find. Cirrus, a hyped-up Rifin, leaves the little guy behind as he begs him to wait. When they both noticed a scene nearby, a chubby noble was humiliating a poor person, beggar whom he was hitting with a bat, according to him for insulting the Refeliano Union, and this noble was the boss, Tarek, who was throwing gold coins at him for every blow he landed. Before leaving, Dillian rushed to help the beggar, looking for the police, but the victim didn't care, since he just wanted to pick up the coins, which he could use to settle down in the city. This upset the little guy, seeing how he let himself be abused for money. Rifin explained that in this place, every crime could be settled with cash, so nobody ever went to jail. Hearing this, the boy felt it was a sick law, doubting what Rifin was looking for in a place like this. Getting nervous, he ended up saying he was looking for an elf, so he was immediately labeled as a pervert. And though he tried to clear it up, he figured the reincarnation story wasn't exactly believable. So he preferred being seen as a creep over disappointing the mini-cleric who looked down on men for being perverts, until Rifin reminded him that he was a man too. Meanwhile, at the Refilon Union, the man was complaining that all the reports about his scams weren't his fault, since he considered anyone who got scammed to be an idiot, while his elf agreed with everything he said. And at that moment, Barrett entered, who hated running into the insufferable fat guy, who asked how things went with the elf he had bought from him, and he told the merchant he had to return her, getting mocked by Tarek for being unable to tame her, so Barrett challenged him to try it himself since no one else could. Tarek, seeing the chance to humiliate him, he accepted the challenge. Meanwhile, Rifin witnessed the pathetic sight of Cillian trying to do push-ups with his flabby body, which didn't improve no matter how much he pushed himself, so he told him not to overdo it, or he wouldn't be able to move from muscle soreness. But the boy clarified that was impossible, and with a great purple flash, he healed his body. Rifin then understood why the kid wasn't seeing results. Muscles must tear to recover and be able to grow. But with healing magic, they simply returned to the state they started in, thus wasting his time for 5 years. Cillian didn't understand why he looked at him with pity, so Rifin preferred to tell him later, asking if it didn't bother him. Having long hair for training, the boy replied that he didn't keep it short for very long, which according to Korean traditions, led Rifin to think it was due to perverted thoughts. Nonetheless, he brushed that aside, to head to the slave auctions, with the cleric leech sticking to him again. And once at the auction, Rifin remembered there was a wide catalog of slaves, from the female elves who were the priciest due to their beauty to the baby, or orcs who were the cheapest. Of course, if male elves didn't exist, who for reasons he'd rather not think about, had a high rate of voluntary tickets to heaven. And since female elves had such a long lifespan, it made no sense for merchants to buy them at a young age, since their life stages were as long as their longevity. Meanwhile, Cillian was pumped to be in Elfheim, a place with the finest female elves. Griffin, for his part, thought it was pretty twisted to hold an auction like this, in a place sacred to the species, but the little guy was still hyped, assuming that elves were treated better than orcs, though Griffin made it clear that they were still slaves regardless. This didn't seem to bother the boy, since he felt they were better off than living in the desert. Griffin couldn't complain because the culture made them think that way, remembering that it wasn't something he could change by force, as that would only bring fear, and seeing how he now had a second chance to improve his empire and avoid becoming the Demon King. He sought a free nation for all creatures. At that moment, the auction manager arrived, apologizing for the delay, taking them immediately to the cute elves who were a bit too sexy for the young cleric, realizing it wasn't a good idea to bring a kid there. However, Refin wasn't interested in any of them, since like a total fetishist, he asked for a darker elf. Everyone noticed his curious taste, and he got lectured for being the one complaining about slavery. He tried to fix it, but again, he decided to let it be, and the manager took him to his darkest elf, passing through all the beauty and cooking training for the elves, which quickly bored Refin, who asked to get to the point, so the manager took him to number 148, who was in a training field, and upon seeing her, Refin cried with emotion at being reunited with his beloved, and so Refin remembered their past together, when he would constantly blow up his lab because of the potions he invented despite the elf's warnings. However, his clumsy innocence seemed sweet to the girl, who was in charge of looking after him. But despite having such a close relationship, she never changed her formal tone, no matter how much he insisted. And so a long time later, Griffinheart saw his empire in flames, with his celestial kings saying goodbye to their king before his final battle. Confident, he told them not to worry, since it wasn't the first time they'd seen the end near, but he was surprised at how the humans had gathered over 2 million troops just to defeat the so-called Demon King, and seeing that the aftermath of the battle would also leave their countries in ruins. One of his kings claimed it was proof that humans would rather die than accept their existence. And so Tadith asked if he wouldn't join them, but Ryfin made it clear that if he did, he wouldn't be able to hide his identity, and he apologized to Mashlin because there wasn't much hope, despite their god's prophecy. And the dwarf told him it was a prophecy where a man with an elf and led by an orc would be their savior. And Riffin received that prophecy after accidentally destroying half of his sanctuary, and though he never believed in it, he received the dwarf's blessing before leaving. So he said goodbye to his friends, hoping to survive, and the last to say goodbye was Sirius, who swore she'd wait for him even if he doubted he'd make it out of there, hoping she'd find someone else, but she insisted on waiting while he kept telling her not to, and finally, with a cry of grief and rage, she repeated she'd wait before going in for their last kiss. And then we're back in the present, where the manager warned that the girl was a defective product because she had a trash personality, so she was given away to be a practice dummy for the other elves to learn how to cut skin. And he asked Riffin, when asked if he still wanted to buy her, he firmly confirmed it, which the manager saw as a typical fetishist he could take advantage of by bumping up the price a bit. And yet, according to Cillian, it was still a steal. And just like that, the deal was made, with the elf presenting herself before her new master. The manager apologized for her wounds, but Rafine said the cleric would handle that, handing her his coat for the cold, looking at her with nostalgia while telling her her new name was Cirrus. She accepted it with indifference, though she was surprised that they also gave her a last name, Valencia, which he instructed her to carry from that moment on, introducing himself to her as Refenkar and the little one as Cillian. Sometime later, Tarek arrived looking for the elf, only to see that she had already been bought, so he assumed it had been Barrett, but the manager told him it was a buff guy, whom he would surely recognize upon seeing him. Meanwhile, he was staring a bit creepily at Cirrus in her new outfit, claiming it would do until they could buy her something better. Then they continued their way through the city, and he asked her if she was hungry, to which she understood he wanted her to cook, but he rejected that, asking her not to treat him so formally. She then assumed he had already grown tired of her, wondering why he treated her like she was a human, and nervously he asked her to see him as her adventuring companion, so the elf assumed he was a pervert with adventurer fantasies, thinking that in his roleplay she would be a Chinese sword, so she agreed to the deal, even though she couldn't stop thinking of him as a simple pervert. And later the girl eagerly devoured a plate of food that, according to Refi, was the best in the restaurant of Cephaline, which honored the radiant goddess, and even though Zealand was also scarfing down the food, but he wasn't feeling it at all, since he thought that because it was a goddess's cult, it should be free. However, Rain clarified to him that the cult of the boy also profited off beauty. In an argument, the little guy ended up losing. And then Rain noticed Cirrus eating in a total rush. She thought he was judging her manners by stopping. He, for his part, thought she hadn't enjoyed the meal, even though that was his favorite restaurant in his past life, and he noticed that, unlike before, when she knew him as her savior, now she saw him as her buyer, and he thought that maybe he had rushed into knowing her, and later they went to buy weapons where Cirrus picked out a sword, which surprised the Prota because it wasn't her usual type of weapon. This ticked her off. Feeling stalked, for no reason, so he had to play it dumb. Luckily, Siri saved him by claiming that martial artists could tell what weapon their opponents used just by looking at their hands. This ended up saving his skin. Then they continued on their way with the priest flexing his new dagger. Along the way, though, the Prota didn't get what he'd use it for. However, he quickly sensed the presence of a group of people closing in, wanting to talk to him. Redefine asked what they wanted, and their leader didn't hesitate to say a noble wanted to buy that elf, offering a solid price or a trade which the Prota clearly rejected. This ticked off the leader, who kept pushing that he'd pay well, but the Prota reiterated that he wasn't interested, so the group ended up leaving them confused. And during the night, Tarek was furious with that guy who apparently was named Romat for coming back empty-handed. He explained that he had no intention of selling her, so he preferred to back off, though his boss bitched that he should have jumped them some coins and leave, but it was too public of a place to do it. So Romat suggested kidnapping the elf and faking her death, and then paying out compensation. And since they bought her for cheap, it would be the most budget-friendly way to go about it. This sounded good to the chubby guy, who offered Serlanto to help him out. Meanwhile, the Prota reflected on how, having found the girl at such a bargain, he had saved a ton of money, which could be useful to invest in reclaiming his kingdom, and remembering that right at that time the neighboring kingdom, Krobant's a farming village, would end up suffering a massive famine. And since they had always been prosperous thanks to the goddess Arden, they never prepared for it. So when the crisis hit, it caused many deaths from starvation and horrific scenes of cannibalism, so he decided to invest in grain, and for that he could use the guilds Roly Pine, Karen, and Toe. Van immediately ruling out Roly Pine since that chubby guy was a pervert who had hurt Cirrus in his previous life, and between his two options he chose Tovan, as it was the largest on the continent and specialized in agricultural products, which currently had Sibolt as its leader, who was currently pissed off by the lack of ethics from his rival who had excessively slashed prices, causing a loss of partners and an imminent crisis. And right then, he got news about a visit from an investor, but he doubted the chump change they brought would do any good, until he was shocked to see it was 1,500 gold coins. 1,500. And so Refi secured the deal by stating he wanted to invest everything in barley for the kingdom of Corbance. This confused Sibolt, who compared selling to that kingdom to selling soap to orcs basically pointless, and even though the Prota accidentally let slip that orcs actually enjoyed soap once they got used to it, he quickly changed the subject to keep insisting that if the investment went south, only he would lose, but if it went well, the guild would profit. Despite this, Sibolt couldn't allow a client to make an investment like that, to which the Prota replied firmly that he would just find another guild then. The merchant stopped him, confessing he had financial problems, and that with that money, he could save himself. Nonetheless, he suggested other investments, but Refi was clear that wasn't his problem, and rushed him to bring the contract, warning him not to even think about using his money for personal gain. The terrified merchant agreed, and Rifan also asked him, since there was a branch near Delphion, to investigate the other him, who lived in that world. Meanwhile, Cillian watched in awe as Cirrus practiced with her dagger. She remembered that high elves were originally the guardians of the forest who lived happily, sheltered by the world tree of Elfheim. There they coexisted in peace, with animals and plenty of fruit, until the humans destroyed their kingdom, condemning them to live as slaves, and so many years later she only remembered one phrase from her mother: "Our dear daughter, you must not forget our pride." This was enough for her to keep going, shedding tears while she trained. For her part, Cillian was hyped, clapping and asking her how she'd made those moves, but she replied that she had just given it her all. This annoyed the boy, since all the martial artists gave the same answer. However, at that moment, a large number of soldiers entered with Romad leading the way, claiming they would take the elf to her true master Cillian. He quickly stepped up to defend her as Romad followed through on his threats, but the tiny cleric made it clear that the elf was not for sale, which enraged one of the soldiers, who recklessly attacked the boy. Ciri protected him and with a swift move, finished him off. The other soldiers tried to attack her, but she moved much faster than them, wiping them out one after another, much to the annoyance of Ramad, who couldn't understand how she could be so strong, despite being a newbie, and at that moment Cillian tried to join the battle, invoking Phalancia to eliminate the villains. However, the boy was way too slow, so the elf had to save him again. From a sword thrown by the mercenary leader, the little guy, somewhat upset by what happened, was calmed down by the elf who protected him while advancing steadily, looking confident and showing off how well she handled the dagger. Seeing this, the annoyed mercenaries decided to fall back and make way for Takalta, a giant orc warrior who had a clear mission to capture the elf, though in his own language he apologized for what he was about to do. Ciri, knowing he was much stronger than any human, doubted if she could beat him and the orc. As soon as he received the order, charged straight into combat, quickly putting her in serious trouble. Frustrated, she thought she should have brought another weapon while blocking the hits as best she could, and in an attempt to surprise him, she took a moment to jump but failed. Ramad, demanded the orc, hurry up and catch the simpleton. The elf and this guy, sweating at the thought of them taking away his dinner. He got fired up as a form of punishment, and Ciri charged straight ahead with everything she had. She felt an uncomfortable pressure, and at that moment she stopped locking eyes with him, and both of them, determined, were ready to strike, and he threw his punch. Iris didn't flinch and planned to take it using her dagger, as her only block, executing a quick move that left her right in front of the orc, aiming directly at his neck. However, she barely missed, surprising the orc with how risky the move was, which even she considered a total leap of faith. Returning to the fight, and behind her, Sylvia asked the elf if she could dodge flying daggers. He said yes without thinking twice. That was enough for the little one to trust her while he gathered his power, and just then, someone threw a dagger. But the elf stepped in and protected him, winning the seconds he needed to finish the summoning of finanzas, and suddenly massive swords descended from the sky, leaving everyone jaw-dropped, seeing how they were heading straight for them, causing a massive roar that shook the whole city, and Ilian ran through the dust to reach Ciri, knowing perfectly well that his moves only worked against demons and monsters, so it had all been tricked to scare them off and make them run away, and taking advantage of the chaos. Ciri took him by the hand, and using the sword from before as a springboard, they climbed up to a window, and the mercenaries thought about following her, but they were stopped by an old warrior who seemed surprised by all the commotion they were making to hunt down a simple elf. Seeing that she even held her own against a seasoned orc, he got hyped, and as soon as he figured out which way they fled, with superhuman speed, the chase began, leaving everyone stunned by the power of an aura user. Meanwhile, he was taken aback by the kid's desperate hiding spot, who kept running while Celia told Cirrus they had to go back to their room for their stuff, even though she thought they'd be waiting for them. Nonetheless, the little guy knew he could handle one or two mercenaries, which was better than wandering around fighting with just a dagger. Cirrus was shocked because she thought the boy had zero experience in the world, and so they arrived right at their room, where with one kick, he knocked out the mercenary waiting for them. And just like that, she started changing, totally chill, while Cillian hurried her up, annoyed because he said they only came back to leave quickly, not for her to get comfortable like it was nothing. He used his blessing to erase every trace that they were there. Meanwhile, Lantos, a powerful, expert swordsman who controlled the aura, knew exactly where they were thanks to that skill that allowed him to sense the presence of people within 30 meters of him. Despite this, when he entered the room, he was surprised to see that the boy had used a high-rank spell to erase their presence, and at that moment Roman arrived. Surprised they had escaped, but Lantos told him they must be close, and asked him to release the hounds. Meanwhile, the duo was hiding in the alleys, and Cirrus asked him if they shouldn't head out to the main street. But the little guy knew full well that if they looked like slaves, escaping everyone would come after them, and thinking about how easily it all could have ended for him, since in the end, it is the fate of many pilgrims. And although her mind was made up, since she knew she couldn't go back, or she would face an even more terrifying priestess, refusing to fall back into her hands, or worse, with her fragile and delicate body. In her desperation, she let out a scream, asking him why Cillian was just wandering around instead of helping them, though, to be honest, Ciri still couldn't believe that kid was so strong, and with no other choice, the little cleric once again invoked Felenia Blessing, forming a spell that stretched a thread across the whole city, turning coincidence into destiny. Basically a red string of fate that transformed any seemingly random encounter into a predestined one, usually used to bring compatible couples together. It was a desperate measure that, however, didn't work out, and though they seemed calmer now, with Cillian complimenting Ciri for being stronger than the only other elf he had ever met. She complimented him too, realizing he was a high-ranking saint despite his youth, and with his so casual way of talking, the boy felt like he was talking to an equal, and not a slave, thinking that Ciri was truly special. Unfortunately, Lantos appeared right in front of them. Ciri stepped in front of the cleric to protect him, while the swordsman complimented them for making them work for it, recommending they stop running. She knew that if they ran, they would leave their backs exposed, so with no other choice, she decided to take the only way out attack. Knock him down and flee, but he dodged easily, earning recognition from Lantos for being so strong and talented, dodging while watching how hard she was trying, even though she was just a slave, and she kept pressing her attacks. Realizing she was facing someone completely terrifying, and from a distance Cillian recognized the man as a high-ranking knight, who couldn't understand how he ended up in this kind of dirty business with no other choice. He used his blessing to give a massive buff to the elf, which left both the girl and Lanthos stunned, and he noticed that the boy hadn't used just one buff but 3 at the same time. Something worthy not of a high priest but of a bishop. Everyone celebrated, remembering his fame in Vasily. Hoping the girl would finish him off, she determinedly began a clash of swords with Lanthos, who was surprised by her new power. However, they both got overconfident as the knight, with a single move, shattered her sword and then brutally wounded her, making it clear that she shouldn't think she was superior just because he had been playing with her. Cillian lost his smile as he rushed to help Ciri, and saw that the knight was an aura user, who was annoyed at having to use it on a mere elf. The cleric didn't understand how someone so powerful could be there, when he could live comfortably anywhere else, let alone hunting a simple hunter. And then the other mercenaries arrived, congratulating him on catching her, and yes, they recognized the name of the Aura Master, a powerful warrior from Taken of noble birth, who was once the pride of the kingdom, for producing a new aura user. However, that insane knight had a dark secret, a fetish that started with slaves, then spread to humans and nobles, making him one of the kingdom's greatest disgraces, and Cillian was surprised by how he had been hiding in Shantan all this time, since his name was used as a sort of boogeyman among young clerics, realizing he was just as horrible as the stories, and Romad knew it, even though the Rophelian syndicate only saw the advantages of letting him go free, and he even paid him a salary. So thanks to him, the syndicate had become the most important one of all, for having him as their mercenary, and at that moment, Lanto decided to eliminate the cleric to avoid his annoying power, knowing how dangerous it was to let him run free, striking his ligaments to leave him immobile. For his part, Romad begged him not to hurt the elf anymore, but Lando complained that they wouldn't let him have his fun. And in that moment, everyone noticed how pretty Cillian looked too, and the situation got awkward, with everyone staring at him like perverts. He spoke up again, to clarify that he was a man, though the sicko knight didn't seem to mind trying new things. However, Cillian didn't give up, and before they could touch him, he used his dagger, shocking everyone that he could still move. Nevertheless, Lanto concluded the best thing was to cut off all his limbs, and Cillian, terrified and now cornered, had no way out. It was then they heard something massive crashing down, and from the dust appeared Griffin, furious that they had gone after his elf, oozing power and ready for combat, presenting himself before the shadow of Lanthos, who couldn't understand how a mere young man who looked like a total junkie could emit such an aura. Romad explained that he was indeed the master of the huntress, which unsettled the swordsman, seeing that this man wasn't a pathetic loser as promised, since just by watching him move, he knew his aura was on his level. And then Griffin went straight to Cillian, thanking him for looking after Cirrus. Lanthos watched him, thinking he was a master who looked young, and praised him for being the strongest he had seen in a long time. Griffin told him to skip the formalities, especially if they came from a dirty pervert, and so they both lunged into battle, unleashing incredible power in the first clash, which generated a shockwave capable of destroying the ground, and thus the two faced off, fiercely, perfectly matched in their brutal exchanges, pitting the madness of Lanthos against Riven's tenacity, while everyone round them considered running away to avoid getting caught in the crossfire, as the warriors tore the place apart. And at that moment, Cillian healed Cirrus, who watched the protagonist in awe. Upon discovering he was an aura user, something the cleric thought she already knew, and as they traded blows, Lanthos managed to push the protagonist back with his aura, but he responded with the key bullet that could barely be blocked. The sadistic swordsman was impressed by the boy's great aura control, wondering if he had awakened his power as a child or if he was actually an old man with a baby face, unable to make sense of anything. As he continued his attack, though, Riven wasn't doing all that well either, because he felt the pressure from the dirty pervert. Admitting that he was strong, recognizing that martial arts never gave him much patience, shrugging off Lanthos's attacks, bursting his aura through his whole body, leaving the swordsman confused, seeing how his sword was blocked by a bare arm, though he thought that level could only come from a disciple of Marshal King Gerard, wondering why someone like that would get into so much trouble over a mere slave girl. And this fueled the protagonist's momentum as he grew furious. Seeing how he looked down on the feelings of slaves, he threw a brutal punch. Lanthos dodged it, annoyed by hearing nonsense about equality, attacking with brutal thrusts that the protagonist took without showing pain, upset knowing that this way of thinking was deeply rooted in the world, attacking with the idea that no matter how much slaves laugh or cry, they are never taken into account. And Lanthos proclaimed that humans were the kings of creation, and everyone else was just a slave, and the battle raged on, while the protagonist thought that when all other species were conquered, humanity celebrated, but if things had been different, humans could have been the slaves, asking him as he threw a punch full of rage if Lanthos would also accept being a slave. He dodged it, calling him crazy for thinking that, while Riven asserting that Sirius was not a slave, charged with all his power, throwing brutal strikes that Lanthos could barely dodge. Over and over he kept at it, thinking that in this world lower-class humans lived in semi-slavery as servants, realizing that the same belief had trapped humanity itself, while with a kick, he finally managed to hit the knight, cornering him. He thought that one day everyone would live in fear of those chains, which is why he decided to change all that and break them forever. And with all his might, he struck a terrified Lanthos, landing a direct hit, with so much pressure that he ended up smashing the wall and slamming him into a building, vowing that with his strength he was determined to change the world, so there would be no more slaves, and all for Sirius, who ironically watched him like he was insane, later remembering everything he said during the battle, unable to understand to what extent he was still playing his strange RPG, and Siri stood by her opinion that he was just a total pervert and a fool, though she found it weird that he knew her race as descendants of the pomegranate. And meanwhile, Lanthos under the rubble begged for mercy, but Riven had no intention of granting it, yet the swordsman pleaded, promising to atone for his sins, doing the right thing. The protagonist saw that by his expression. He seemed to be telling the truth. However, in the order of the yesterday that they belonged to, they were forgiven just by going to the temple to ask for it. That's why he told him that if he really wanted to repent, he should have turned himself in a long time ago, and Lanthos promised him that he would, begging him not to get his hands dirty with him, but Riven knew full well that since his past life, his hands were already stained with filthy blood, so he told him that the only possible surrender for someone like him was to pray for a quick death, and he kept his word. And before everyone's eyes, he unleashed a brutal blow that buried the warrior right then and there. And so it all ended, and Riven asked Cillian if he was okay, and the boy assured him that he'd fixed them up good as new, as if he were the best medical kit you could ever find. Sirius, grateful but keeping her cold tone, asked him if he was okay, which made him blush and get more excited than usual. Since she finally spoke to him, though, to her, that just made him look even creepier. And then, however, since the mercenaries were escaping, the protagonist suggested it wasn't a good idea to let them go, and asked them who had sent them. And though he knew they wouldn't talk easily, he still promised to be merciful, which made them doubt him when they saw him summon a club in his hand. Then, after a relaxing training session that left them nearly naked and beaten, the protagonist repeated the question, who had sent them. Tired of being beaten, they didn't just snitch on Tarek, but also gave his exact address. Riven remembered him well. He was the one who hurt Sirius in his past life, and although he intended to eliminate him then, someone else had already beat him to it, and the mercenaries warned him that if he went after him, he would become an enemy of the city. The protagonist was well aware of that, but he seemed to have a good plan. But before leaving, he decided to let them live, though he suggested they bundle up while Beret was with Tarek, asking him how long it would take for the elf and why there were two more. He replied that it was Lanthos's payment. However, he didn't understand why they were taking so long, and why there was so much noise outside, unaware that all his guards were being knocked out by Riven, who couldn't control his strength, nearly killing them. Luckily, Cillian was in charge of healing them and erasing their painful memories, even though the protagonist thought that only worked for broken hearts, but apparently it also worked for that kind of trauma. And the cleric nonetheless asked him what he would have done with so many witnesses, since luckily he was there with him, and the protagonist told him to enjoy the moment, to watch how he took down the fat guy. However, standing in front of him was Takalta, who didn't seem willing to let him pass. And despite Riven's attempts to show that the man he was protecting wasn't worthy of such protection, the orc was a noble warrior who, although aware that he was a slave, wasn't acting of his own free will. Feeling that out of honor, he had to fulfill his task. Sirius asked the protagonist to go on ahead while she dealt with the orc. Now that she had changed her weapon, the orc saw them as weak, though he recognized she was much better off than in their previous encounter. So the protagonist moved forward asking Cillian to watch his back, and Takalta asked him if he planned to ignore him, to which the protagonist responded that his opponent was the girl, and that it would be disrespectful to ignore her, and Takalta admitted he was right. And so they arrived at a room shrouded in a peculiar purple smoke that they identified as narcotics. And looking inside, they saw a massive red stain on the wall and the nobles naked with their eyes in a psychopathic trance. So when he entered, Riven admitted that despite all the horrible things he had seen in his life, what was right in front of him deserved brutal punishment. The fat guy was screaming for his guards, while the protagonist watched the gruesome scene with the elves. So he decided there were people who didn't deserve to keep breathing, while Tarek, in a panic, yelled for his orc and his guards, but no one came. And seeing the aura of fury surrounding the protagonist, he tried to negotiate, offering more than anyone else would pay him, but the protagonist saw him as beyond saving, regretting that he had put up with him for so long, and with hatred he landed the first blow, leaving him on the floor in agony. Then he grabbed him by the head and told him that although he hadn't done it yet, he felt it had been horrible, the way he mistreated Cirrus in the past, so he made sure to slowly crush every single limb that man had used to hurt her. Beret, terrified at the sight of what was left of him, the fat guy screamed, "Murderer!" And he accepted it, admitting he was one too, though Beret insisted that he had never harmed anyone. And at that moment arrived Cillian, and Cirrus, she seeing the scene, thought that perhaps he had overdone it, but the protagonist argued he deserved even more. The little guy agreed, and excitedly told him that Cirrus had defeated the orc solo, though she clarified it was thanks to the cleric's healing, and the protagonist stayed alert to his surroundings, making sure that Takalta was still alive, while Beret recognized Cirrus as the slave he had returned, and she asked him if he was the one who had left the little elf girl in that state. He basically admitted it, and then Cirrus decided to make him pay by slaughtering him, pissed off because even while dying, he tried to touch one of the elves he had hurt. And so amid the screams, everything came to an end, and a while later they had gathered all the slaves, elves and orcs, from the palace, thanks to the orc warrior who helped them, because having been defeated by his master, he now considered Riven as his new leader. Cirrus observed that it was a very diverse group, mostly made up of elves and orcs, since neither male elves nor female orcs were often used in slavery, and she remembered the protagonist's words, thinking that maybe she had misjudged him. And right then the protagonist showed up with the slavery contracts of the Rephalon, which he had accidentally found while destroying a wall and a safe. Cillian called him extra, which reminded him of his past, and he told her that he hadn't been judged like that in 50 years, before instantly taking it back, feeling like he was becoming a fool, leaving his friends confused. Then he offered freedom to all the slaves. Unfortunately, this only caused fear, since they had no idea what he was talking about. Cillian thought it would be best to return them to the trade, though. Riven had no intention of doing that, as he couldn't release beings with no home or place where they belonged. So they had to educate them first, and thus he took them to a terrified Sebold who noticed he was bringing along Tarek's slaves. The protagonist confirmed this, taking them there so he could hide them and keep them in secret, because if he didn't, he too would look like a suspect, which to them was just a routine threat. To make it up to him, he left him 100 gold coins. Seawold, although scared, found the money very useful, and thought the protagonist had robbed the Refiliano, but apparently he accepted, taking the slaves to a secret place outside the city. Griffin agreed, asking him that no one should treat them as slaves besides him, and the merchant thought that he had left too much money just to look after them, until he explained that besides caring for them, he wanted them educated. This baffled the merchant, who thought they were already trained, but Riff clarified that he wanted them instructed in math, languages, and other human disciplines. Evolt was confused by the insistence, since slaves are worth more the more useful they are, but the merchant doubted that they would actually learn, but the guy insisted. Nevertheless, no scholar wanted to teach them, so they hired peasants who had studied with scholars and needed money. Evolt wasn't sure if that was a good idea, but the kid insisted with his own money, and the merchant compared it to teaching pets. Griffin already knew he would say that, because in his time, people said the same thing about that idea, believing that was the real reason not to try. Although in reality, the goal was to prevent rebellions, while the merchant still doubted, but the protagonist was convinced that once they saw the slaves were capable of learning, he himself would teach his own to make them more useful, perhaps spreading the idea through religion, and maybe it would be the first step to change people's mindset. And although this later would bring him trouble with the protagonist, lending money to his little cleric because he had spent everything with silver, and Ciri suggested giving her clothes back. But this upset him too much, and he flatly refused, which brought a smile to her face, and what no one knew was that it was her first real smile since she became a slave. And that's how on the following day, the scandal broke. Two major union leaders had been brutally wiped out, and the guards were giving crazy versions of what happened, and the case ended up going cold. 2 weeks later in Illusion, Cillian used his blessing to destroy them, alive and to buff Sirius, who took care of the rest. Griffin watched in awe as they made a great team, especially because Cillian had a lot of experience on the battlefield. So he wondered how long he had been in combat, thinking that if he kept improving, he could surpass Archduke St. Elin, and he thought that if that kid didn't become famous in his era, it was probably because he died too young. At that moment, the cleric complained because the MC had promised him some easy ruins, but they were even harder than last time. Even though Rifen had entered through the easy part of the Grain Kingdom's dungeons, the ruins of Illusion, where they finally reached the door, sealed with magic. Facing Cillian, he remembered he'd said he needed a mage, but Griffin assured him he would do it himself. This left the little guy confused, hearing that besides being a martial artist, he was also smart enough to be a mage, while he, no matter how much he worked out, didn't have a single muscle. However, he noticed the MC was taking way too long, because he was trying to gather a massive amount of mana, which took forever, barely pulling it off after a long spell and a lot of focus, with Cillian timing him at 13 minutes for something so simple. And then he suggested that if that were the case, he should stop acting like he was some big-shot mage. The MC replied that he only cared about the results since he needed what was inside those ruins to become the first and only 9th circle mage again. But all he found was an empty place, with nothing but an old branch on the ground, so he walked through the snow completely let down, even though Cillian reminded him that you can't always win. However, the boy knew that he would be the one to discover that place, 17 years in the future. So he realized he had already changed his destiny. On his part, the little cleric claimed that at least he had found something cool. It was the small branch held by Cirrus, which gave off green energy. Called Nigelin's magic arrow, this formed a bow capable of firing arrows of mana, and though it looked like a plain old stick, it was actually a part of the Tree of Life, from Elfeinheim, whose powerful shots leveled everything, leaving both of them shocked, and Cillian asked him how anyone could have left it behind, and how Rifen knew it, though he only knew because Cirrus also used it in the past, pretending he had only heard rumors, and the cleric told him to stop being sad since there were still plenty of ruins to explore, but Rifen knew that nothing could replace the voice of illusion, the only artifact capable of restoring his magic. And yet they reached their next destination, the village of Jejalem, where they wasted no time and had a massive feast, totally pigging out on the food, which made the innkeeper very happy, who was grateful they were so polite. Unlike the previous guests, who complained about everything, they had been a group of nobles investigating some ruins. Rifen didn't hesitate to offer cash for info, but she kindly gave it to him for free. It was about Viscount Kelbier, who had arrived for an exploration. Although he was accompanied by someone of higher status, a friendly man in armor with a golden sword. According to the MC, it was probably the Golden Knight of the Grain Eustace Tenez family, who was being thanked by Kelbier for helping him extract the treasures from the ruins, which by the looks of it, he had taken full advantage of. And even though the Viscount didn't really care about the treasures, what he truly wanted was a good relationship with the famous knight. So he asked him what he had done with the materials he found. He replied that he had sent them to the dwarves to forge weapons. This didn't surprise Eustace. He knew their reputation as expert miners, but Beer preferred to introduce him to his daughters, even though he was already married, and the knight showed zero interest. Yet the noble pushed further, suggesting them for his brother. However, a loud sound signaled that he'd hit a sore spot. Eustace shattered his cup and gave him a murderous look, stating that he did not have a brother. The Viscount and his daughters were terrified, until luckily for them, a knight reported that in one of the relics, a demon named Sephiaton had appeared, and this demon was already slaughtering the soldiers while the knight watched calmly from the window until someone showed up, sparking his interest again, and as he headed down, the knights backed off to let the saints and mages take action, and they began summoning their gods and raised massive walls of ice to stop the demon successfully trapping it, trying to hold it off until the commander arrived. However, from above, a knight named Russ, wielding a sword, descended at full speed, and with determination, leaped onto the demon, successfully slashing the creature, or so he thought, because once on the ground he saw Sephiaton attacking him again, and he barely managed to block the attack with his sword, getting sent flying and ending up injured, while his companions looked at him like he was just being reckless. And at that moment his brother Eustace arrived, ordering them to stop babysitting fools and focus on the creature. Then he looked at Russ with pure contempt, annoyed at having heard him call him brother, stating that the Knights of Tenez are not born from street dogs, and then he advanced toward the demon, seeing clearly that those others aren't aura users and won't be able to face it. So he readied his golden sword, which he called the Rat, and asked it to open its eyes, activating its mechanism, starting to release hundreds of golden trails that moved through the air until they landed on the knight's body, forming his armor and getting him ready to take on the monster. Meanwhile, Refin was listening to stories about him from Cillian, surprised that he was so famous, and even Cirrus had heard of him, though the MC cared more about whether his pajamas fit right, until they got back on topic with the mini. Cleric, not understanding how, even if the magic armor was the most powerful, he still didn't get how it managed to surpass even the aura users. This must be because his armor and sword allowed him to boost his power to massive levels, thanks to its 100% real magic gold alloy, which right at that moment was standing face to face with the demon. However, the armor only gave its full power if the wearer was able to master it, and so Eustace leaped into the air, activating the Bram and engulfing himself in flames, triggering an 8th circle spell, Material Destruction, with which he reshaped the entire terrain, and Refin knew well how difficult it was to handle that armor, which surprised Cillian, since it was hard to manage magic in that state, and they watched, as many thought they were already toast. Sword skills, now relying on items, which favored him, and as the fight resumed, the demon unleashed a massive cloud of corrosive breath, but the knight summoned flames without stopping, while Refin narrated that although having an aura user was good for any family, it was never certain if anyone would make the cut, but they would always have a golden knight. However, it was much harder to find a magic swordsman who could use the armor like Eustace, who could also use ice attacks to disintegrate the demon, to everyone's cheers, except for his brothers. And so he posed triumphantly while Refin wondered if he could actually beat him. Nevertheless, this made Cillian uneasy, who thought he wanted to fight Eustace, something the MC accepted as the only way to get the artifact back. The little guy made it clear that while Sahantan helped him punish the wicked, in this case the Golden Knight, had investigated and obtained the artifact legitimately, so if they took it from him, they would become thieves. Refin, surprised, saw that he was right, but that wouldn't stop him, so he had to persuade him without mentioning his reincarnation, convincing him that as part of his brutal training with Gerard, one of his missions was to recover that artifact which were left there for disciples, and claimed it was his master who left him the instructions to find it. Since he knew the dungeon well, Cillian bought the whole story and understood the reason for his desperation, even if he didn't agree with stealing it. Meanwhile, Eustace was being congratulated for defeating the demon. He left the cleanup to the others, but not before belittling his brother again, claiming he was no longer a tennis swordsman, which frustrated Russ, and he decided to train tirelessly with his sword. However, his companion came over to call him out on his attitude from the day before for pulling such a dumb stunt and disobeying orders, and yet he still insisted on calling himself a tennis swordsman, which only fed up his companions, who told him that if he wanted to prove it, that they challenged him to a duel, leaving him alone and calling him a half-breed while he tried to build his momentum by practicing. Unfortunately, despite his strength, he had only managed to master a decent thrust, along with his breathing technique, a technique that, if perfected, could even cut through the air. However, even though his family knew many sword techniques, his position as a bastard son prevented him from learning any other technique besides that one, which was taught to him by his father, who told him it was their tradition and the true path to aura, and feeling his father's expectations, he didn't want to let him down. However, it was simply a move from a forgotten art, and Eustace also doubted he could do much, since all the other fragments of that sword art had already vanished. Yet he still saw him fuming, because even though he considered him a fool, he also saw him working as hard as a genius. On his end, Refin was heading there dressed like a goofy thief, uncomfortable because he had to enter the massive castle without being seen, avoiding the guards to start his heist, and upon entering, some guards in the hallways doubted anyone would want to invade them, knowing they had a golden knight on their side, and right at that moment, they were being invaded, though Refin managed to slip by undetected, realizing he had a knack for crime, advancing to the room he was looking for, where he decided to be nice to the guards, and by nice, he meant choking them out until they were unconscious, and that is how he reached a warehouse, where he found another barrier he couldn't break through with his trash magic level. Luckily, he found a core in a rune carved into a stone, which he smashed to get inside and see the huge variety of magic items they had and how well organized and classified they were. But what he was after was a black cube called the Voice of Illusion. However, when he went for it, he ended up stepping on a simple tripwire that rang a bell, making a fool of himself by falling for the easiest trap in the place, alerting the Viscount, his wife, and the rest of the guards, who headed for the South Tower, from which Refin came flying out, admitting that this would be his last heist, while knocking out guards hoping not to kill them. But his troubles grew when the soldiers arrived, backed up by mages, who prepared their fire attack and unleashed it directly at him. So Rifin, with a polite apology, grabbed a guard to use as a human shield, and the guard saw him as a lowlife for that move, although the MC figured he only used him because his armor would leave him almost unscathed. But now he had to deal with arrows, which he knew wouldn't hurt him. However, he quickly noticed how they reacted with his body and started to crystallize, beginning to restrict his movements, thinking it was clever as they held on as best they could. While they seemed to prepare a firebow, Rifin couldn't help but worry that such simple knights had so many skills, which didn't seem normal at all. But at that moment, from the ranks, Ross appeared charging at full speed, seen as an idiot by everyone there, even by the MC, who saw him as just a basic swordsman with nothing special, except for his sword swing, which was about to hit him, forcing him to back off while managing to dodging it just to come back, with a punch that sent Russ flying, confusing Rifin, who wondered how he had so much power to hit like that but not to dodge a blow. And although now he had to block the energy slashes from the Golden Knight, who arrived there amazed that someone so strong was just a common thief, even though the MC told him he had his reasons, which the knight didn't care about. So Rifin went on the attack just like the knight, going head-to-head, throwing strikes without any defense, which almost caused both to lose their heads, only to end up backing off, exchanging blows in a combat so strange that it left the other warriors completely baffled. For their part, both were surprised that their attacks weren't working. But Eustace attacked again, summoning the Howling Shadows, which Rifin, with his experience in spells, easily dodged, stunning the Golden Knight, who assumed he was an expert at countering, magic which he admitted he already knew, and so they continued fighting, with Rifin dodging the knight's quick movements until he found an opening to strike, which Eustace felt brutally, even with the protection of his armor, so he backed off to use wind and fire like daggers, trying to riddle Rifin, who had to escape, seeing how he was now being approached by a massive explosion of energy that was chasing him, and he started thinking that if this kept up, he's definitely a goner, eventually making it out of the smoke, surviving the attack, witnessing in awe such advanced, magic-like material destruction. For his part, the knight was also surprised that he was still alive, noticing that his speed surpassed even his eyes, assuming he was an aura user, so he wasted no time and used corrosive mist, engulfing the MC, who confident saw that he could easily dissipate it. With a heavy stomp, he shook it off to attack the knight directly, who barely managed to block the powerful blows, forcing him back. Unsettled by this, though now confirming that he was an aura user, he would respond in kind by activating the aura of his armor to unleash brutal slashes with Rifin dodging. Now frustrated because this was hard to deal with, thinking back on how he used to think the most annoying thing was aura users, but now he saw that magic was just as bad, while their battle trashed everything in its path. Eustace was confused why an aura user would be stealing. Rifin had exposed himself since he hadn't wanted to use aura because it was too flashy, but he couldn't hold back anymore, now that his rival knew, which led the knight to think that maybe he had only recently awakened that power. Therefore, he felt he had the upper hand. Leaping into the sky, he used his ability to awaken the drag and the drone, both flashing with pure power, lighting up the sky and worrying the MC as he saw the knight charging at him. Activating the light of Edril, and Rifin, sensing the danger, was thankful that the light happened to be golden, which let him use his aura, covering himself with it, causing a massive blinding collision that engulfed everyone. The Golden Knight fell back, stunned to see how he had been blocked. Meanwhile, Rifin, injured, fell from the top of the castle into the river, managing to escape. Eustace searched for him, asking his captain to check what exactly was stolen, while preparing a squad to hunt him down, doubting that he would die from something like that. Meanwhile, at the refuge Cirrus, she woke up terrified, having a bad feeling. Silent asked her if she thought something had happened to Rifin, who at that very moment was sinking unconscious into the river. And without saying how much time passed, Cirrus was running across the city rooftops with Silent, who felt humiliated being carried by an elf. However, they had no time to lose as the guards were cornering them, and Cirrus had to fight her way through, with Nigelin knocking out the confused guards. Meanwhile, the captain saw Eustace arriving, noting he couldn't handle the situation, so he himself would take charge, and Cirrus asked Cillian if she could carry him again, and he agreed, annoyed because Rifin still hadn't helped him train his muscles. But at that moment, a massive blade of air blocked their path. Nonetheless, the knight didn't immediately notice the skilled elf drawing an expensive sword, and that the little one was a high-ranking priest, who was mad at the MC for getting caught, and he didn't hesitate for a second, charging directly, with the intention of ending it all at once. As for him, Rifin woke up battered and sore, thinking that taking on the human with the world's strongest armor was a dumb idea, having no clue where he was, until a dwarf named Itos came to greet him. He was glad to see him alive. He asked if he wanted to eat, and Rifin Supposed he could, so the dwarf ordered. Tilla, a dwarf who grew taller than usual, who also greeted him, cheerfully bringing him the only thing dwarfs eat, barley, and Ryfin was very confused by all the kindness from the dwarfs despite being a human until an old man appeared calling him savior according to the prophecy of Alpot, which confused the MC to whom they read. The entire prophecy, which boiled down to the fact that a lucky guy would come floating down the river and must be saved. This prophecy was exactly the same as the one from his past life, which was updated 6 years ago, according to the god who gave him a second chance, glad that he still had his back, promising him that he would do better this time, and so time passed, until he finally recovered thanks to Tila, who was happy to see him doing well, even though he knew that with a little meat, he'd feel much better. And then the girl asked him to go see the priest, and with the little girl acting as a crutch and making him feel awkward, Ryfin realized he was with the tribe, Steelhammer under Viscount Caldera, who had managed to keep their culture alive thanks to their usefulness in slavery, being essentially technical laborers, since humans couldn't learn their skills, like their way of finding minerals, by listening to Mother Nature. Besides, that skill only worked well in a group, which is why they managed to stay together as a society, being a huge help in his past life for building his empire, and he took the chance to ask Tila how many of them lived there. And she replied there were 60, all belonging to the Viscount, also telling him that in those mines, the men worked while their families were kept as hostages, and in this way they finally reached the priest, who, while still not understanding how he'd be their savior, knew very well that Ryfin didn't see them as slaves, and he told them he saw them as equals. He didn't get how he'd help an entire species. Chill understood but had full faith in his god, trusting that his hand would save them, though he did see that the MC was a bit strange because he didn't seem surprised by the prophecy, which Ryfin acknowledged, but the reason he took him there was because he wanted him to see the high priest Alpot, remembering him with nostalgia. Smiling at seeing him again, though to Chill it seemed interesting how the boy had taken all of this so well that he doubted they'd believe he was complicating his own life, trying to find a way to make all of that sound even slightly believable. But he understood everything, remembering that although Antares fell in the past, he felt that if he talked to the wise dwarf he could change that, remembering that he should be at a forge nearby where they would take him with a guide, with Tila being the only option, one of the few of the warrior race. And even though Chill realized that while he didn't read his truth, Ryfin knew all about the high priest and his location, he was surprised that even knowing that he didn't get scared. In fact, he ended up being the scared one, seeing how he knew so much. But Ryfin told him it wasn't the time yet to tell them everything he knew. However, at that moment, Itos arrived to warn the MC that the elf and the kid with him were prisoners of Viscount Kelveron, where Usus was giving orders to his soldiers to use any method of torture on them, seeking information about the thief, though they were shocked to have captured an elf carrying a high-level magic sword and a little follower of Felinia with enough power to be a bishop. But the soldiers had no clue how to torture, trying to decide exactly what to do, and deciding to wing it, approaching their victims who didn't seem afraid. But you could tell they were a bit nervous, and the soldiers, Varus and Letos, decide to start. And about 30 minutes later they heard Cillian's whole story about the MC and his brutal inhuman training at the unyielding martial gym, which was a training so hard that the final exam consisted of recovering the relic, which they got to first, but originally belonged to Gerard the martial master. That's why Ryfin needed that relic, as it was the only thing he cared about, and after hearing the whole story, he agreed to let him steal it, waiting there for him to arrive, spilling the beans on everything, even though the soldiers hadn't even threatened him yet, talking so much that he ended up exhausted, asking for a glass of water, and Vara wondered why he was talking so easily, thinking he had zero loyalty toward his friend Cillian. He clarified that it wasn't a story he needed to hide, and the soldier told him he was ruining the reputation of the successor to the martial king. But the little guy responded that if he didn't want that to happen, he shouldn't have stolen it, leaving him speechless, although he asked him again if he knew anything else about the relic or the boy. The calm Silva clarified that besides having no way to contact him, he never thought they would fail such an easy robbery, leaving him silenced again and the others confused, as they didn't understand how the interrogation ended up like that. Meanwhile, Ryfin was with the dwarf Tila, who was amazed at how good the MC was at hunting, cooking up a deer, even though she thought the area didn't allow it. But the MC told her he couldn't worry about trivial laws, since after all, his main goal of freeing the species was already against the law. So he hungrily devoured the meat, which gave him the powers of a carnivore, starting to blow the vegan Tila's mind as she saw how his body healed, releasing a golden aura with which he could easily cause massive destruction with just one move. So he felt ready to keep moving. Meanwhile, Eustace thought it couldn't have been a coincidence that they were after that relic, remembering how a month ago a strange hooded figure came to see him with the seal of the Silver Sage, a secret that only chosen descendants of the Tennis lineage know. This was an organization capable of toppling nations, whose power and knowledge were far beyond modern societies, and they operated from the shadows, unless humanity was in danger, standing above any king who would bow before them. That man gave him orders, tasking him with the investigation of the Tennis Illusion ruins, offering him all the relics he could find there, except for the Voice of Illusion, which he had to hand over or else the Tennis family would suffer the consequences. Once the flashback ends, his men arrived with information about the strange interrogation and the ensuing but unbelievable story. Meanwhile, the front gate guards were dwelling on their traumatic encounter with the MC, hoping that now that he'd stolen the relic, they would never see him again. But unfortunately for them, the wind revived their trauma with the arrival of a very happy and glowing Ryfin. Eustace, for his part, finished listening to the story, confused as to why the Silver Sages would want an object belonging to the unyielding Jim, and though he thought Silent might be lying once he saw he was basically a priest with the power of a bishop, he doubted they'd taught him spy tactics, assuming he was telling the truth. He still thought he didn't care about those two and would abandon them, annoyed by all the resources he'd have to use to follow him. With no guarantee of finding the object, however, at that moment a massive explosion occurred and he could feel the MC's energy, who was there for his friends. The commander pushed forward, claiming they wouldn't lose this time. Ryfin also declares they're getting serious now. Varus and Letos are the first to attack, only to be sent flying with a simple aura blast. With this, the MC realizes he has no idea how to fight an aura user, but the knights still don't give up and go straight to ask for blessings from their priests so they can push forward with good buffs. Confident they'll avenge cannon fodder they sent in before, but they just end up getting thrashed one after another, until Ryfin decides to slam the ground, sending them flying, and is now attacked by ice, fire, and lightning mages, so he has to deal with them, using his aura to attack them from a distance, striking them lightly but enough so that the rookie mages can't handle the pain. And now he's going after the priests he passes by, one by one, choking them until they're knocked out. This leaves everyone terrified, watching him normally, even though he just wants to prevent them from having any bugs from their injuries, and so the desperate troops order an attack with everything they've got. But everything is repelled by the power of Ryfin, making them even more scared as they see him getting stronger. With no other choice, the commander sends Eustace, who is completely frozen, even though he usually jumps into battle without thinking. This pisses him off, promising them punishment if they make it out alive. But the boy just stays paralyzed, seeing for the first time an aura user, overwhelmed by the intensity flowing from the MC by the glow, and the force he releases with every strike, reflecting as he realizes he can see absolutely everything. Every move, its direction, and how his power flows. And just by watching, he understands it, something he was never taught and never could be. Witnessing the movements of someone who has reached the pinnacle of martial arts, gripping his sword tightly, his power beginning to flicker. Admiring that power he wants to achieve. Meanwhile, Ryfin finally comes to a halt as he dodges a sword strike from Eustace, who arrives in heroic fashion to save the day, receiving cheers from everyone who sees him as a noble knight, ready to avenge the fallen, though the fugitive blabs for him to stop acting like a hero. Spoilers, because he knew well that he'd been hiding in the tower the whole time, watching the chaos and his subordinates get beaten up, mocking him for being caught red-handed, without knowing how to respond. And the fugitive says it was pretty low to use his comrades as simple scapegoats, just to size up his strength. And as expected, everyone starts to criticize the knight for leaving them hanging like that, while Ryfin adds fuel to the fire by not understanding why he took so long to arrive, seeing he isn't the noble and just knight from the stories. To which the knight says he overslept, getting mocked even more for being such a heavy sleeper, which annoys. Uses so much he chooses to get on with the fight, starting his brilliant transformation with Ryfin, hyped for the battle. And so the knight doesn't hesitate to charge, reciting a spell that will give his sword absolute strength, and the MC recognizes it as Arcane Blade, a pure mana spell that rivals his aura, meeting it with a blow, and so the battle began with both of them, evenly matched in every one of their clashes. However, the MC gets cocky, seeing that even though his muscles are like steel, they're no match for that weapon, which fills the knight with momentum as he reinforces his attack. Therefore, Ryfin must block it with his arms, managing to shake him off with a move that leaves the Golden One's guard wide open, taking the chance to try and finish him off. While in the prison, Cillian heard the commotion coming from outside. Cirrus was excited that Ryfin had come to rescue them, and the little guy couldn't help teasing her when he saw her so full of hope, since deep down he had his doubts. She admitted that she did expect it, as she was still confused by the attitude of the musclehead who was kind to her. The boy assumed he just had a thing for elves, and she thought that at first too. But seeing his determination, she began to feel he was different, to which Cielo blurted out, half joking that she was already love-struck, since the phrase, "he's not like the others," is what women in love always say. Though he then added that as soon as they marry, those sweet lines turn into, "That son of a bitch lied to me," or at least, that was the info he got from the nun in his congregation whom Siri thought was a little crazy for teaching a kid stuff like that, and he, for his part, just complained about Griffin. Failing the heist, though, Siri didn't see him as being upset, because the boy considered himself an accomplice for not stopping him, agreeing that you can't always follow the law. The elf was surprised to see him so mature for his age, but he told her he was only 3 years younger than Rifen. This left the girl in shock because by her math, he was like a newborn, while she saw Rifen as an old man. Luckily, the weird conversation was cut short by Tila's even weirder rescue, who arrived there leaving both of them. Confused at the sight of her, and Cirrus recognized her immediately as a dwarf, but Cilia thought she looked very human except for her ears, to which the elf for some reason told her while they escaped that she needed to grow up, contradicting what she said when they were locked up. Just then the guards appeared, only to be easily defeated by a smiling Tila, who told them to hurry up, and so they went flying out a window, leaving a flash that alerted Griffin to the escape, though Eustace saw it too and realized it was just a distraction. And now that his friends were safe, the MC told him he'd start fighting for real. The knight saw him as arrogant, deciding to attack, only to be dodged and met with a brutal jab, reinforced with a key bullet, which sent him flying. Desperate in midair, he thought about how to turn the tide, unable to do more than block or dodge Rifen's brutal hooks, who frustrated him to the point of using Eldraine, which the MC takes advantage of to strike, though in reality, he didn't land it, since the figure he hit vanished, seeing how he was now everywhere. And even though he thought it was an illusion, he quickly discovered they were actually clones, seeing it as a very good move. So Rifen, before the knight could invoke the Light of Destruction, used his speed to find the real one, hitting him brutally, leaving him confused and in pain at being found so easily. But Rifen knew because of his experience with mana flow, though Eustace had no intention of giving up, deciding to unleash all his magic power, using a fire spell that Rifen dissipated with a Spiral Guard. Then he used Ice and again Spiral Guard, Wind and Spiral Guard, and so many spells, against which Rifen just keeps spamming the Spiral Guard, which started to annoy the knight, who saw how Rifen just kept posing in his guard. And he was having fun with it too, since the Spiral Guard was ridiculously simple, but no ordinary aura user could use it, as most could only emit aura to protect their bodies. But only members of the Unbreakable Jim could curve their aura without shattering into pieces. Eustace felt humiliated by this and tired of that nonsense, demanding to know who his boss was, to which Rifen blamed some random guy from Eustace's group, which only served to piss him off even more. So clenching his teeth hard, he began to summon once again the power of his swords, and charging up the attack, he activated the drill light, determined to finish off the MC, who was about to charge right at him, furious, thinking that now he really had a problem. So he would use his most powerful ability, Horn of Calamity, and just like that, both determined, they charged with all their might, ending in an epic clash. The whole kingdom felt the energy of the powers, colliding with no winner in sight yet. And suddenly the energy pierces through Eustace, shattering part of his armor, even though he tries to stay in the fight. The energy increases the pressure on his body, leaving him vulnerable, as he sees how Rifen's ability basically releases waves of explosive energy that keep hurting him at such close range, resembling ripples in the water, that also form a whirlpool, preventing him from pulling away, taking another hit. Now all he has left to do is hope the energy runs out, refusing to lose. But with one final explosion, all the ground in its path is destroyed, leaving him open to the direct attack on his body, which sends him flying instantly with a whirlwind that is only stopped by a wall, with his sword falling to the ground, and Rifen, feeling that the battle is finally over, and the commander of Tenos watches in terror as Eldrad has lost, though the MC notices the sword is intact, allowing it to also regenerate the armor, though he figures that will take time. So picking it up, he hands it to the commander of Tenos while apologizing for all the ruckus he caused because of the item he stole, since he needed it, being seen as someone who wasn't greedy, though. Honestly, he thinks he wouldn't like to steal it for Sirius, but he feels like that would be crossing the line, so he'll look for another one later. For now, he'll head out. However, Russ returns, claiming it's not over with the sword of Tenos because he's still there, though neither Rifen nor his commander take him seriously, with the latter being the most annoyed because he thinks he'll do something stupid, threatening to look down on him even more. The MC, for his part, seeing he's brave but useless, decides to ignore him, letting him attack. However, Russ charges at him, releasing his aura in a brutal sword/witch. Riffin barely manages to dodge, getting wounded in his abdomen, and he's stunned to see that right in front of him. Boy is an aura user, which also shocks the others with Russ, feeling like he's finally redeemed himself as the sword of the family. But Riffin can only be even more amazed, recognizing the imposing sky blue color of his aura, having a bad memory of the ancient and powerful sword master, Sirius, who is the real name of Russ, whom he remembers as Sirius Bontenos, who by not being recognized as a knight by his peers, would be renamed by the name his humble mother gave him, having forgotten that back in that time he was there, remembering that while currently the main draw of that family is the Golden Knight. In 30 years, everything will change with the rise of Sirius to Sword. Saint and the family would rise to the rank of Marquis and lose the dishonor of their swordsman, depending on magic items. That's the reason why he forgot about the Golden Knight, since in his time he wasn't even that popular. Although for his part, Sirius is not only surprised because he knows his name, but also because he gave him a title as high as Sword Saint, which makes him blush. That's why he prefers to say he got the person mixed up. Disappointing the boy, though. Riffin remembered Sirius as being indifferent, seeing the huge change in his time, and the fight begins again where the MC seems to take the lead. However, the strike he thought landed ends up being repelled by the aura, leaving him shocked by how he uses his newly awakened aura, going back to trading blows, which the other soldiers must escape from, with Riffin backing away, until he stops when he sees that the movements of Sirius are becoming completely unpredictable, and he saw how he moved differently from the Grandmasters who passed down their teachings and attack patterns. Instead, Sirius moved erratically without any care. But what in theory should play against him ends up becoming his biggest advantage, since his movements are so powerful that Riffin can barely counterattack, retreating with every hit, dodging the moves, realizing why he was a genius and sword saint, the very same who defeated Tadit, this being the exact memory that reignited his battle spirit, cutting off the boy's momentum. He returned with a war cry in the name of Tennis, brandishing his sword and preparing a move he had practiced for years, which seemed capable of cutting ice. Riffin recognized the power of his future enemy, so he decides to change fate, eliminating him and landing a brutal blow full of hate and fury, thankful to find him so weak, unleashing his power in the crushing impact, thinking he did it. But Sirius continued, alive, still fighting, and with no intention of giving up, leaving Riffin confused because he knew that unlike the others, that blow was meant to take his life, yet he was still standing, itching to keep the fight going. He was shocked, and starting to doubt if he should kill him since he hadn't committed any sins yet. However, analyzing it and remembering Tadit, he figured that as an honorable warrior, he wouldn't forgive him if he took away that rematch. So he decided to let him live, even though the warrior wanted to fight, but Riffin told him to live and get stronger, for his friend's sake. Since throughout history, Tadit and Sirius had many battles, becoming rivals, and maybe that was the reason why the orc became so strong, considering it was his duty to help them have that rematch, as only Tadit had the honor of taking down the Sword Saint, who, feeling defeated, screamed, unleashing his aura in frustration. Meanwhile, Riffin arrived at the forest where Tilla was happy to see him along with his friends, who seemed to be fine, although Cillian, first and foremost, thanked him sarcastically for helping her experience what prison is like, which clearly could have ended badly for a pretty girl like Cirrus, even though she felt the guards were very kind. Even so, a worried Riffin reflected that he should watch over her more next time. Though everyone wanted to know if he got what he was after, he simply showed them the cube. Cilia looked at it confused, seeing no connection to Marshall. Arts and Riffin just replied that he didn't know either, but that his master had tasked him with it. Of course, that was also a lie, and just like that, they hit the road again while in Tenos everyone was rebuilding the castle, following the destruction, talking about how Russ had managed to awaken his aura while in the castle, the still wounded Usus. He remembered those rumors, not understanding how a mere bastard could have achieved such power, though he remembered that his father had always been affectionate toward him. And he also recalled the elders who, even though they flattered him for being the Golden Knight, also lamented behind his back about having an aura user, and now that one appeared, the status of his family could rise. However, then, he wondered what would happen to him. So full of frustration, he gripped his sword, seeing himself as the one and only true sword of Tennis, while Sirius watched the forest from the mountaintop, happy that he had now awakened his aura, changing his world completely, seeing that he still had much to improve, and wanted to catch up to Riffin. However, at that moment, Usus arrived, congratulating him on awakening his aura and asking to see it. Sirius, excited by this, showed it to him, with his brother looking at it as something beautiful, which made Sirius happy as he finally felt recognized by his older brother as the Sword of Tennis. However, he didn't expect him to suddenly stab him, wounding him severely, while he remained confused, and Eustace furiously recited the tennis motto while Sirius, still dazed, tried to defend himself, quickly overpowered by his brother, who screamed at him that he would never accept a bastard like him. As the sword of tennis, however, something caught him off guard just long enough for the boy to escape, falling from the heights straight into the river, though Eustace knew perfectly well that in these kinds of stories, it was common for the hero to survive and come back for revenge, so he decided to cook up a believable story. And when the guards arrived, he told them that his brother had attacked him, wanting to steal his position as patriarch, and everyone believed him, discriminating against Sirius as a mudblood, and they began organizing a search for him. Golden Knight smirked, seeing that everyone bought his story, since he knew that even if his bastard brother were powerful, he'd be no match for the power of the dragon, celebrating his victory with a sinister smile. Meanwhile, Riffin's group continued their way through the forest there. Ciri asked him how he knew Tila, and he replied that the dwarves saved him from drowning in the river, which surprised the elf, even more when he told her they considered him a savior. Tila confirmed it, stating that according to their god's prophecy, he would be the one to save him. Cillian was also surprised to see that dwarves believe in gods, to which Tila replied that such a notion is a prejudice, classic of humans who used to see them only as slaves, and Riffin explained that they believe in Alpoth, and the little cleric commented that he was an evil god, though the MC already knew that, since within the Saiyajin pantheon and the 12 gods, there are 2 who aren't recognized by the church. One is the goddess of the elves, and the other is Alpoth, the god of the dwarves. Known for his reputation as an evil deity, though, Cillian clearly had no idea why, and all that took a backseat when Sirius alerted them that she saw someone floating in the river. Upon pulling him out, Riffin recognized Sirius, though he didn't mention how he knew him, while wondering why he was there, and why he had a stab wound, so Cillian began to heal him. Sometime later, the boy woke up inside a carriage confused, remembering his last confrontation with his brother, thinking that although he never held a grudge against Eustace, the feeling seemed to be anything but mutual. Since he only wanted his recognition, however, he understood that Eustace had always despised him, yet he still stood up in pain. Outside, they were waiting for him, Riefin and the others, his saviors, who had brought him to the barony of Vadi. 3 days from the barony, they planned to leave him at an inn so his wounds could be treated, but Cillian insisted that someone with less experience couldn't save him. Riefin, on his part, made it clear they had already saved him. Even by getting him the carriage, Sirius thanked him, though they also demanded he thank Cillian since he was the one who paid for it, convinced that it was useful to have him in their debt, even if one day they became enemies. So they thought about giving him money to return home, but Sirius couldn't go back. And so night fell as he finished telling his story, stating that he had surely already been framed as a traitor. However, that didn't match the memories of the Prota, who knew that after awakening his aura, Sirius was supposed to have an official duel with his brother to win the leadership, and he figured it was his fault again. And so, not knowing what else to do, Sirius decided to join Riffin's group. Everyone was caught off guard, including the Prota, while the boy insisted he had to repay them for saving his life, and he would do it with his body. Though Riffin didn't want to accept this, Sirius persisted, thanking him for helping him awaken his aura, and saying he wanted to learn more from him. Riffin remembered that now being considered a traitor, he wouldn't be able to train with any other aura user besides him, although that could be beneficial. He also kept in mind that Sirius was the one who had finished off his friend, the orc. However, in this version of events, he was swearing loyalty to him. Riefin wondered if it really was a good idea, and although he thought it would be cool to turn his enemies into allies, he doubted he could fully pull it off since Saint Elam hadn't been born yet. The same as the hero, Alex, and basically he was stubborn, so that only left the light mage of Jade, whom he didn't even want to go near, especially remembering that she was the one who finished off his beloved in his past life. And in the end, he decided to accept the boy, who, very excited, asked him to be his big brother, though that would be a bit difficult, since Riefin was 3 years younger than him. Meanwhile, Eustace was on his knees begging for mercy from the Silver Sage, who was furious, thinking he had given him an incredibly simple task, feeling like he had overestimated the Golden Knight. Though he felt looked down upon, he couldn't say a word. Humiliated, he just watched in silence and knew that for an average mage, teleporting was already a tough feat. But for the Silver Sage, that was no trouble at all, projecting an illusion into his room, leaving Eustace terrified, begging him to take the punishment himself and spare his family. However, the sage made it clear his fate looked grim and ignored any further pleas as he vanished. This mage is actually in a study, using an orb to cast the illusion, disappointed by the Golden Knight. Also aware of his future of being gifted by the sword sage Sirius, and although at that moment he was called to meet with someone, and upon entering the room, an old man addressed him as Sage Leston. This was the seventh most powerful man in the kingdom, Duke Iranod, who rebuked him for using his divine symbol, seeing him as a prodigy who awakened his aura at just 20 years old, and highly regarded as a sage for helping them foresee future troubles, recognizing immense potential in him. However, he made it clear there'd be no penalty this time, but warned him not to do it again. Leston apologized, and the Duke accepted it, though addressing him not as Leston, but by his real name, Teslan in Riffin's old body, who now belonged to the powerful organization of the Silver Sage, capable of toppling a whole country if he wanted, though he knew well that he was just in the lower ranks, clinging to his belief that Riffinheart was a demon king who sowed chaos in the world. And now, with his body of steel and the brain of a great mage, he feared he could only be stopped once he regained his magic, determined to be the one to do it, though it had gotten complicated. Now that Riffin had recovered the illusion, which he remembered was the piece that, along with the four symbols relics, was the source of his power, and according to the great mage, boss, he had to get the remaining piece before the Demon King determined to stop him. For his part, Cillian was stuck in a girl talk session while Cyrus observed the strange interactions, confused by the group dynamics where chores were raffled off instead of making the slaves do them, and he found this out when he was picked along with Riffin for cleaning, and while going to get water, he asked why the slaves weren't handling it, but Riffin told him that to the world they were, but to him they were just his friends, and he wanted them to feel that way. And although this left him confused, Cyrus, since he had sworn to follow him despite his weird ideas, he had no clue what Riffin was actually doing in the carriage. He was busy gathering mana to activate the illusion voice at its beginner level, creating a really boring virtual reality. So he upgraded it, generating images of excessively voluptuous elves. Wow, these graphics are sick! Damn, they're good! Enjoying the view, though, only for a moment, as the mechanism seemed to kick in, sending panels flying towards him. So he had to repel them with wind bullets, then using fire arrows, however. This kept increasing more and more, and things started getting tricky with the elf girls. They were aggressively cheering him on to do better, but it was too late. Riffin missed the first few pieces, seeing how even the easy level turned out to be really tough, and although he finally managed to beat the level, soaking up the cheers from the girls in bikinis, he returned to the real world, remembering how that artifact is basically a training method that transports you anywhere full of hot girls who praise you for every single thing you do right. It was something used in the Silver Age, whose creators were either super lazy or just needed some motivation. Even so, he believed he could regain his magic power with it, even with Tess's brain, which was way less sharp than his own. And at that moment, Sylvia spoke to him to alert him they were arriving at Extra Sanda, a base that serves as a military and trade hub for the northern routes. There he received the information he had requested from Silbo, where he saw how his original body lost its mind at the age of 17 due to a rare illness that convinced him he was Tesla, which served as confirmation that the Martial King had reincarnated into this world, although he hoped it wasn't the case. Upon reading the document, he realized that from age 20 onward, there were no more records recognizing that the new him had been more skilled back then, managing to escape the tower, something he himself couldn't do, and yet he still needed more information. That's why he was looking for a mercenary, though he also knew he had to head toward his same destination. And later Sylvia told the others about her first encounter with the lead, whom she saw as just some local guy who turned into a total beast. Cyrus thought he had hidden his skill out of humility, but the little guy knew full well it was just because he was a liar, which he admitted himself. For that same reason, he hesitated to tell them about his fate. Eventually, he did it because he considered them friends. So he explained to them that they were going to some Silver Age ruins. Cyrus thought they were heading to the Adarellan Mountains. Riffle said yes. But before talking about the specific destination, he would share his dream with them, reminding them that he didn't see elves, dwarves, or orcs as slaves. So his dream was a world where slavery didn't exist. Everyone was in shock except for Tilla, who was very happy. Meanwhile, Cyrus was the most skeptical, feeling like it was like releasing beasts into the wild. But Riffin corrected him, reminding him that they had emotions and thoughts, though this only left him more confused, since he understood that humans viewed slaves as the equivalent of farm animals. Unlike him, Cillian understood how Riffin wanted to change the world. He confirmed it, asking him if he'd join. Silas signed up quickly, surprising Cyrus, while the little guy had known for a long time that they weren't just slaves, though he also considered it an impossible dream. But he decided to stay with this good group he had formed, Besides, he wanted to preach the faith of Valencia's love among the different species. Griffin made it clear they'd be outcasts and would commit crimes like freeing slaves, though Cillian agreed with it, as long as they wore masks. Meanwhile, Cyrus, for his part, didn't understand a thing, but he'd already sworn loyalty to Griffin. He saw him as an honorable warrior, and affirmed that everything from that point on was confidential, since their destination was the great forge site of the temple of the dwarven god. And so they reached the mountains where Tilla used her natural connection to fight ogres, while Cyrus also accompanied her. Griffin just smiled, seeing the great strength of both, and joined the battle, taking them down one after another, finishing off a huge number of goblins, ogres, harpies, and other monsters, and they ended up winning in the end, though. Cillian complained about how many monsters were there. The MC chalked it up to the fact that very few humans had ever made it that far, making it the perfect spot for the dwarven temple, even though Cyrus couldn't see it anywhere, but Griffin just told him to trust him, while trying to hold back a griffin. But those were just illusions of the original, and he had to find it, so he used his magic to create a massive magic shield, leaving his friends speechless at how much his magic had improved in such a short time. But then he asked them to step in, because he was running out of mana, letting them down once again, and Cirrus thought he was adorable, but she was also worried about how long it would take them to arrive. Tyla told her they were 2 weeks away, which freaked out Cyrus, who didn't want to put up with 2 more weeks of that. Luckily, Griffin made it clear they'd take a shortcut, arriving in just 1 day. And that's how they reached the ruins of Damien. However, Cirrus was suspicious of how he knew that shortcut. He pretended he'd heard about it, but she wasn't buying it at all. This only kept fueling her doubts about him and what she felt for him, which was making the MC more and more nervous, until they reached a cave, where he once again easily activated the door's mechanism, blaming his master Gerard for telling him about it. And though he claimed it was a bulletproof excuse, she didn't believe him for a second. But regardless, it was time to go in. Inside, everyone was blown away by the place immediately. Griffin noticed a mural written in the ancient tongue. Hawkrill looked at it with some nostalgia for a couple of seconds, and then smashed it in one go, leaving Cyrus completely terrified. Then the others approached, and suddenly a bright light appeared. It sprouted from the site, pulling them inside, and once they were in, everyone looked around the place in awe, blown away by its architecture and by the power it had to transport people. However then, she asked the MC about the massive beams that had fallen, wanting to know if they were responsible for it. He told her, yes, it was because of their entry, but that it wasn't a problem. Though shortly after, he began to feel more concerned, since in his past life, the Oracle had predicted his arrival and that it would collapse half the temple. But now the prediction had changed, and right in front of him, he faced a large number of dwarves, furious over what happened. Griffin just laughed, much to his companion's disappointment. Right before starting the immediate attack by the dwarves, Cirrus was annoyed by how dramatic everyone was from the start, but the MC explained to her that it was normal when someone invades and destroys your home, until Cillian reminded her that he was the one who did it, leaving her with nothing to say. While all the dwarves were livid, comparing the situation to a father's rage when finding a man in his daughter's room, an oddly specific comparison. Cyrus, fed up with everything, got serious and looked down on the dwarves ready to attack, but Griffin stopped him, asking for a truce. They responded with arrows. Many arrows, though they did no damage. This only made the dwarves angrier, feeling belittled and comparing him to a monster. However, Griffin shouted at them that he didn't want to fight. The dwarves, being lie detectors, accepted his words and stopped attacking, asking him who he was. Griffin, with total confidence and zero shame, shouted that he was their savior destined by Alpot, with so much conviction that Cillian cringed and Cyrus doubted they'd believe him. Luckily for him, everyone excitedly accepted, changing their attitude to basically worshipping and pestering their savior. And that's how they showed them the forge, a massive city that had a river and a solid heat source. Everyone stared in amazement at the grand architecture, especially Cyrus, who thought it must have taken many dwarves to build it, making him doubt why they hadn't rescued their enslaved comrades. Cillian, finding it funny, pointed out that he was finally starting to understand why they shouldn't be enslaved. While Cyrus kept thinking on it, the dwarf guide explained that they had only remodeled the interior of the ruins. However, Griffin clarified that the Silver Age was also a dwarven city, since the doors were extremely low. He then asked Cyrus if such an advanced civilization deserved to be enslaved, and even though he knew he couldn't erase the brainwashing he'd had since he was a kid, it left the boy thinking. Then the dwarf guide left to get dinner ready, while Cillian could only think and complain about how he fit through the doors perfectly. Then they served the banquet, which was made up of basilisk liver. This immediately made Cyrus go vegan, just like Tilla, even though Cillian had seen her eating meat just yesterday. However, no one seemed to want to touch the food, until the dwarf guide clarified that it was an amazing male aphrodisiac, which convinced the guys, who started eating right away, disappointing the girls. Then a dwarf girl went to get Rifin, who had to go meet the head priest, and so they took him to the massive staircase, where he had to continue alone, mostly because the dwarf guide wanted to avoid the extra work. Finally, Rifin stood before his old friend Machelin Pot, Hammerlane looking at him with nostalgia. Then we see a memory from the future, of the Antares Empire where Teslin and Refenhard faced off. The buff guy warned the demon king that with his defeat, his curse would end and he decided to go all out. And just as Refenhard activated the artifact, causing a massive flash, was exactly when Tess woke up, and now in Riffin's old body, he's rattled by the dream that made him think he had to get stronger. And although in those 6 years he had become the youngest to awaken his aura even with that body shield that blew the tower mages away, managing to get out, network with the powerful, and become a Silver Sage member, he still doubted he could take on the Demon King, since he knew he had to keep searching for his lost magic and reunite his subordinates, needing his own squad to face him. Meanwhile, Riffin greeted his old and loyal friend like they were besties, which confused the dwarf, who knew he wasn't lying, even though he'd never met him. The MC told him they'd meet in 10 years, causing Machelin to think he was crazy, which was a bit hypocritical, considering he's an oracle himself, but Riffin asked him to listen. He told him everything about his journey as a mage, his connections with other species, his empire, and the war against the humans that caused its downfall, and his subsequent time travel. That was the truth, and though Machelin knew it, it still felt unbelievable. However, because of his god's message, he decided to give him the benefit of the doubt. So he proposed a test. If they were close friends in that future, he asked if he knew the color of his beard. Rifin knew the answer to the trick question because Machelin didn't even have a beard, just like 30 years later, when he tried to fake it by wearing a false beard to command respect among the dwarves, since it was a symbol of masculinity. Seeing he wasn't lying, Machelin took it off, accepting the truth. He realized he couldn't give advice to someone who already knew more than he did, so all he could do was swear his loyalty as the savior of the dwarven race. Griffin wanting to return. That devotion told him to stand up, because now he needed his counsel. He told him that Shantan had managed to get the slaves an education, which could inspire others to do the same. The dwarf congratulated him on that method, but also warned him that it would take a long time for a human like him to see any results. And that was exactly the problem. He knew that with his new power, and by recovering his magic, he could rebuild his empire, but that would only turn him back into the feared Demon King, drenching the continent in blood and failing once again. However, Machelin gave him a reality check, claiming he was underestimating this world. He asked if he hated humans, and though Rifin said no, it seemed he didn't like them much either. Then the sage pointed out that his change wasn't just about power, and that wasn't his only mistake. His real failure was that he had no human friends in his past life. He mistreated humans while respecting other species, so he asked him why he didn't include them in his army. Rifin, getting nervous, told him then that he couldn't trust them. Machelin questioned him on why he didn't include them in the administration, to which he replied that elves and dwarves were incorruptible, especially with the dwarves' ability to detect the truth, so he figured he was doing the right thing. But the questions kept coming. Why didn't he give them political positions, and why human citizens had no rights? He basically discriminated against them, which according to Machelin might be understandable for farmers but not for nobles. Rifin claimed that everything worked better that way, and with that Machelin laid down the law, expressing that it made perfect sense why he was called the Demon King, since that title doesn't belong to a beast that drinks blood by the leader, but to a being who only considers those he likes, taking whatever course he wants. And as Rifin got nervous, Machelin called him out once more, because even with his good intentions, he was definitely a Demon King. And Machelin wondered why he hadn't told him that back in his time. That's when Rifin explained that when they met, humans were slaughtering dwarves, which basically led to him becoming his right-hand man within the Empire, and that fact made him too ashamed to lecture him. He then summed up his advice. He had failed because he thought it was a war against humans, when in reality they are species that don't need each other to fight, and he hoped Rifin would figure out the rest. Meanwhile, in the mountains, a massive dragon was battling a group of dwarves who were trying to hold it back. Cyrus jumped into this fray using a Kai Slash, which missed as he realized he hadn't mastered it yet, and Sirius also tried to help, but his shots did nothing against such a giant beast. However, right at that moment, a dwarven warrior came flying through the air, shrouded in aura, and sliced the beast, shocking the humans, who were completely stunned. They couldn't believe dwarves could use aura, as they saw not one but 3 masters. And so a month passed, during which, despite cultural differences, they adapted well, especially Cyrus, who learned a lot from the dwarves. All this was happening while outside the storm continued to rage on. Cillian was celebrating having grown at least 1 centimeter, with everyone congratulating him, except for the dwarves who didn't see the point in growing taller. And while the group had no idea where he was, Redefine had apparently been spending a lot of time in the tower that housed the city's power source, the Sun of Magrin. There, Redefine basked in the light, appreciating the glow of a species that had almost forgotten its traditions, even though they managed to preserve them, thanks to the power of the great relic of their god Alpot. This deity, due to the enslavement of his followers, had lost a huge chunk of his authority. He could only maintain that one relic which could be used to modify Teslan's inefficient body. He needed to improve his mana, and it was said that in the past, he had successfully controlled the power of Magrin at will, something only a god could do, creating a powerful 10th circle spell, comparable to a nuclear bomb. He now remembered it with embarrassment, since he used it to wipe out a kingdom in a single strike. But most importantly, since it was a state of pure mana, there couldn't be any impurities when entering. So he stripped down to his underwear to dive in, feeling self-conscious about being naked but grateful that no one could see him. Or so he thought, because through a surveillance camera, many dwarven women were checking him out thirstily, from his back down to his glutes, waiting for him to turn around to see his chest. Even though they all looked like young girls, it was made clear that they were actually old married dwarven women enjoying the show. And so 40 days after their arrival, the storm was still raging outside. Redefine was still pursuing his goal, casting a 5th circle spell, which he considered enough for the time being. Now he had to increase his mana, though he also needed to obtain the other relic passing through. Chaitin and Krobantz following Macalin's advice. Returning then to Cillian, who was training, congratulating him on having gained some muscle. She was happy about it, even though she found it weird to see the MC around since it wasn't mealtime, and Redefine replied that he had already finished his business there, which worried Cillian, since that meant he'd be leaving soon. Although he'd grown fond of that place, he wanted to see how his achievement boosted his faith. So Cyrus also had an epiphany, locking himself away to meditate, surprising Redefine by making so much progress in such a short time. While the kids were playing with Ceres, watching them with a certain sadness as she recalled those days of the little elves playing, a memory she thought she had discarded. And at that moment Redefine appeared and saw her looking pensive. She said she was just watching the free children, thinking that a future full of gloom awaited them, and that not all of them would survive. Then she asks the MC to forget that dark comment. She was just remembering her home, which Redefine remembered as an area devastated by humans, though he also remembered his in-laws lived there, so he thought he should visit them, and asked the girl if she wanted to go. But she pointed out the distance as an obstacle. But he knew a shortcut, asking that just the 2 of them go, and so literally, they arrived in a second, through an ancient portal, from the Silver Age, which Cyrus knew only powerful mages could use. Redefine explained that it was complicated. If you didn't know the mechanism, to which the elf, still doubting him, asked if his master had also taught him that. The MC now blamed a friend of his master's who supposedly taught him that, although she still wasn't buying any of it. But first he had to dealing with a massive dinosaur that was heading toward them, which Redefine took down with a single blow. That actually turned out to be really handy, since it looked like a great source of protein. So with his magic he created shade, lit a fire, and drew water from the lizard to drink. Thinking about how useful magic was, while Ciri could only think about how to cook it later. She already served a nice skewer to her master, who devoured it while asking how long it would take to reach her home, and even though he already knew he needed to work on his acting, she told him it would take a while, but she doubted anyone would still be alive. He confidently made it clear to her that they almost certainly were. However, once the night had passed, they reached the village, which appeared to be completely desolate. This was a heavy blow to the heart of the elf, who still held onto a shred of hope, which was now shattered. At the thought of never seeing her parents' faces again, nor hearing the voices of her friends or brothers, she couldn't even reclaim her true name, which she had forgotten over time. She felt the shadows consuming her, while Redefine felt that once again he had messed everything up, since in his day that village should have been fine, thinking that it was his fault, even though he didn't know how. But regardless, he noticed something weird about the village. Even if Ciri didn't see it, he made it clear to her that it wasn't just some abandoned village. He asked her if the village fell years ago, because it looked as if it had been abandoned very recently. She snapped out of it, and they both heard in the distance a cry for help. Meanwhile, in the middle of the desert, several elves were being held captive by a group of human outlaws, among whom was Brig the Hunter tracking Tadith. The latter was fuming because even if they managed to sell those slaves, they would barely break even on the operation costs. He was annoyed because his jobs had gone downhill ever since the day he met that buff kid, proving that in the end, everything was still the fault of redefine. And while his men complained about the heat, some tried to calm their boss down, saying that at least they got 3 slaves, even though 2 were very young, and 1 was a man. Right then, they all went on high alert when they saw female elf approaching at full speed, getting excited because she looked mature enough to be worth good money. Meanwhile, Tesla received a visit from a girl who was shocked that he was still studying. Her name was Felina, and he told her to stop asking pointless questions. He recognized her as his cute childhood friend, who was the only one that supported his crazy idea of changing his name and helping him awaken his aura, so he smiled upon seeing her, even though he knew that in reality, she was a friend of the Demon King. As for her, she was happy to see him smile, just like when he was Riffenhart and she gave him info on the great martial artist, Riffenhart, which turned out to be a huge coincidence, though Tesla didn't see it that way, asking if she had contacted Usus, who was basically recruited by the girl for his power, and Tesla felt he had a solid ally. Plus, the girl also got another person for him, Stephen von Altian, the family leader, who he thought would be useful, even though he didn't know him yet. Because of all this, he thanked the blushing girl with a hug, though he was actually being malicious, thinking only that just as Rifle stole his life, he would do the same to him. So he smiled sadistically, thinking about stealing everything he had. Now back to the group. They were about to face Cirrus, who was furious and didn't even give them a chance to react to the first one, whom she had already ripped to shreds. With everyone freaking out over her power, trying to attack her, but Ciri simply kept making heads fly, terrifying their leader, while the mage tried to repel her by summoning flames with a fire beam, and the fireball seemed to incinerate everything, but once it cleared, Riven was protecting his girl, telling her not to just dive in like that and warning the others not to move. Then he stared at a terrified Brick, who was having flashbacks to his trauma, alongside the trafficker, and the MC was annoyed that his memory had room for guys like them. So channeling the old days, he asked if those elves were the only ones. Brick had no plan to answer, but Riven told him he'd better do it if he wanted any mercy. He repeated his question, and the hunter confirmed it. Next, he asked how many elves he had killed. The hunter said 40, so Furious Riven made it clear that he'd have to pay in blood. Getting ready for the fight, the traffickers' mages attacked, but they couldn't even dent the MC's arcane shield, leaving the mage terrified. However, Riven didn't waste a second and started summoning dark flames that wiped everyone out. And though his goal was to burn them to ashes, he was bummed he didn't have enough mana. Now only the mage remained, trying to beg for mercy by offering to return the elves. But Riven couldn't care less. The trafficker just wanted to know why he wanted to take him out, since even though the MC kept saying it, he didn't get the deal with the elves, assuming they belonged to him. So he apologized for thinking they were wild animals and killing them for it. That only served to further infuriate Riven, who saw how they kept insisting they'd done nothing wrong just by slaughtering elves, and became determined to finish off the terrified mage, who thought he was a total psycho, and Rifle asked him what the difference was between a human and a beast. The mage replied that it was reasoning, which the MC saw as being exactly the same as the elves, but the mage made it clear that there were still human slaves, and that was the system that ran the world. And Rifin stated he didn't want to be a slave, feeling that no one should be. When trying to push that idea, the mage thought he was arrogant, which reminded the boy of what Machelin had said. However, he accepted that he'd rather be arrogant than agree with a worldview so absurd it would end him. Then, before the surviving elves, she arrived to help them, recognizing her as Chillin. The oldest immediately identified her as Serendi, which brought back memories to the elf that this was the name everyone knew her by. Serendi burst into tears as she remembered, happy to see her friend again. However, the elf rejected her, telling the little ones not to go near her, considering her unworthy for being a human slave. Cirrus didn't know what to say, so Rifle stopped her, stating that she wasn't a slave and asking the elf not to talk to her like that. He then asked Cirrus to clarify that she wasn't a slave, but she asked him if she really wasn't. He fired back with another question, if he had ever treated her like one or made her do anything against her will. She said no, so Rifle made it clear that to him they were equals. Iris got it, understanding that he treated all races as equals, but with her it felt different. She felt like he didn't really see her, but was projecting someone else onto her. And disappointed, she told him that if she were a slave, she wouldn't have any problem with him continuing to treat her that way. Riven took a critical hit, because he finally got it. He thought he had saved Cirrus, that he had rescued her from an imminent doom, but the one he had saved was the Cirrus from his past life. The one standing right in front of him. He had bought her and been extremely kind, trying not to treat her like a slave. But she couldn't accept feelings that were meant for someone else. Rifle accepted it, stating that Serendi was free, and that from that moment on, whether she wanted to follow him or not was her choice. She thought he was asking her to leave, but he clarified that he hoped she would stay with him, though it had to be by her own choice. She asked for time to think it over, so Rifle asked Chilin to take her to her family, and since he knew they couldn't reveal their location to humans, he said he would stay nearby. But the elf asked them to accompany them, since she wanted to return the kindness she had received. Besides, she knew Riven would find them easily, even if they said nothing, which he interpreted as a sign that she was very sharp at using logic, and Chilin apologized to Serendip for that, though she understood, nodding with a smile when she said that she had met a good human. Meanwhile, an elf arrived before Elder, Railhard, to inform him that no matter how hard they tried, they only had 1 day's worth of water left. The Elder asked for updates on the humans, who according to them had abandoned the search. He asked about their fallen warriors who apparently had already been swallowed by the desert. Then, he ordered that Raquel be taken to collect their spirits and guide them to eternal rest. However, his aide warned him that they couldn't hold out much longer, so they had to move out that very day. Even so, the Elder didn't really know what to do, and he prayed for help from his goddess, Eldia. Meanwhile, the scouts recognized Chilin and the little ones, Natina and Ryder. However, they also quickly spotted the human blocking their path, using their slingshots to hurl stones, which scared Serendi but not Riffin, who saw they were just trying to intimidate him. He actually picked one up to analyze it, noting that while they were just rocks and glass, they were imbued with spirit magic. And although it was weak, due to the absence of the world tree, after years in this desert, their spirits had merged with the spirit of fire, which explained everyone's bronzed look, even those who have been away for a long time like Serendi. Doubting him, she asked if he knew that because of his master. Riff once again blamed his master's friend, without being convincing at all. But now was the time to show that he wasn't a threat. Raising his hands to speak in their tongue, he was met with hundreds of blows that didn't hurt him at all, so he was mistaken for a monster once again. Still calling them descendants of the Great Spirit, he asked them to see him as an ally, and the Elven Elder, noticing he knew their language and traditions, was confused since he still didn't trust him. Riffin understood, so he activated his aura and unleashed his power, bewildering everyone including Serendi as he calmly let his power flow. He was aware that to humans this would look like a threat, but for the elves, it was different as they recognized his massive power and figured that someone so strong had no reason to lie about what he was saying. They just accepted it, which left Ciri quite confused. Later, Chilin introduced Ciri as the daughter of Arel and Piana, who were lost during the day of the nightmare, which made another elder elf happy that not only had their lost kin returned, but they even got back a member who had been missing for many years. She thanked Riefin, who acted humble, suggesting they organize everything to return to their village. And so they went back celebrating around a bonfire where Cirrus was seen, reconnecting with old friends, all under the watchful eye of a worried protagonist who, seeing her so happy, doubted she would stay with him. So he stood up, still having something to take care of, approaching the elder to ask him to teach his friend spirit magic. Although he can use it, it's only for summons, and the elder claimed that without the Tree of Life, he couldn't do much with that power either, meaning Riffin was a better choice as a teacher. But the Prota begged him to do it because he thought it was sad that an elf couldn't connect with the spirits. The elder, surprised that he knew so much about their culture, told him that if he didn't want to part with his friend, he could stay there and be like a brother. However, Riefin knew he couldn't do that. Even so, they stayed with the tribe for 3 days, waiting for an answer from Cirrus, who was trying to learn spirit magic from Chilin, though she didn't seem to be making much progress. She didn't understand what she was doing, which Chilin found normal since it took her 3 years to learn. However, suddenly, Cirrus seemed to pull it off, leaving her shocked. Riefin understood why, because while most elves struggle to learn, since Cirrus had taken different kinds of lessons for so many years, she had developed the ability to learn, like humans. Seeing she'd mastered the basics, he approached to ask if she wanted to stay there. Cirrus answered yes, crushing the Prota's spirit. However, the girl clarified that even if she wanted to help them, nothing would change, asking him if going with him would change their lives. Riefin swears it will, so the elf, with a huge smile, decides to go with him, making the protagonist so happy that he starts laughing with excitement. determined to change the world, until out of nowhere, he throws a punch at the sky, making Cirrus feel awkward though he apologizes by blaming the adrenaline, but she thinks punching or attacking the sky isn't exactly the best way to show it. Unable to argue with that logic, he says he'll start changing her tribe right now. Returning to the emergency shelter where the elder still is asking him what brought him back. Wife tells him that this emergency shelter will from now on be their village, confusing the elf since there's no water there. The Proto then asks Sirius about the artifact, explaining that she was able to learn from the spirits through the relic after being recognized by it. So now she drives it into the ground and, reciting an incantation, plants a sapling of the world tree before the astonished eyes of the elder, who watches as the spring bursts forth from the branches. Griffin is proud to see it. The elder is in total disbelief at the sensation he's feeling, which he describes as pure clarity and unity, which according to the laws he recognizes through tears as Alfheim, the world tree. And weeping they hailed him as the savior sent by the deity, though he only said he was a friend who wanted to help them. He also apologized to Cirrus for using her, Mana promising her a better one, even though she still didn't understand why he did so much for them. With that finished, they went back to the Great Forge. There, Cillian received him, annoyed that he had left without saying a word. So Refin praised his muscle gains to distract him, and it worked. And along with the mini-cleric, they met up with the dwarves, who also called him Master. They complained about his disappearance too, but were hyped to show him their progress by casting a spell. Refin looked at them in surprise, remembering he had chosen 20 dwarves to teach magic to, who had actually come a long way. So he congratulated them and told them to keep practicing with the book he left for them. Eros was also there, so the Proto asked if he was done meditating. The boy replied something like that, noticing with his new skill that the Proto was very grand, which worried Refin, thinking he'd grown even more. But the knight told him that rather his soul seemed like that of an old man, making Refin feel awkward over the roast and the kid's new ability. Just then, Celia asked if they were leaving now. The answer was yes, but first they needed to get some cash to reach their destination, Krobantz. Meanwhile, in a far-off cold land in the northwest of the kingdom of Grain, a group was trying to survive a storm, with the mage trying to keep the fire steady so as not to lose the 10 remaining survivors in their group. They had managed to recover their loot from the ruins of Chalkarna, specifically a book containing years of lost history from the Silver Age, which they could use to reveal the era's story. However, a noise put them on high alert. 2 of their comrades fell to Tess and her crew, terrifying everyone. Tess sent her new allies to wipe them all out, something the Golden Knight, Eustace and Stephen, Alchian seemed eager to do, with sadistic bloodlust in their eyes. They began the slaughter of the defenseless adventurers. The mage, he begged for his life, giving up the relics, but Tess made it clear that she was coming for him, finishing him off right then and there, all under the terrified gaze of Felina, who didn't think that was right, but Tess reminded her that those were orders from the Silver Sage, since unfortunately for them that group discovered a history that no one was supposed to know. But the girl assumed that the Silver Sage was a protector, not agreeing with killing innocent people. But Tess saw it as a small sacrifice for humanity, and she also asked Stephen how he liked the Berserker armor, which he wore with great confidence, thinking that with it he could defeat the arrogant aura user who humiliated him. Eustace joined his thirst for revenge, but also asked what they would do with all the relics. Tess told them they would take the useful ones and sell the rest, especially those that the Silver Sage needed to keep track of, since they were the only ones who could contain relics dangerous to the world. Meanwhile, Eustace could only be grateful for the thermal necklace they gave him, very useful for the snow. And in that hotel, while investigating the relics, Tess found another illusion orb, considering it something that humanity should never see, given how the Demon King valued it, although Felina didn't understand what that history was that no one else could know. Tess told her not to be curious, as that was something only the Silver Sage should know. As for the forge, Cirrus went to Michelin, who asked her what she needed. The elf asked to know everything about Refin, not understanding how he knew so much about everything, especially about her, from the day he met her, including her real name. Michelin stopped her, because before answering anything, he would ask her a question. Could she trust Refin? She claimed she could believe it even if he were a god from another dimension. But the dwarf insisted that his question was whether he could trust Griffin. This left the elf rattled. Sometime later, Cirrus returned to an anxious Griffin, aware that she already knew everything. She confirmed it, recalling how Michelin told her that the protagonist was a time traveler, who was a 10th Circle mage in the future. He tried to change the world with his ideals but was branded as the Demon King. He failed and came back for a second chance to fulfill his dream, a future where Cirrus Valencia, the voice of all elves, an 8th Circle mage, and a 7th grade spirit magic user, was renowned as the mercy of Eldia to other species and Reffinghart's partner. So in the present, she called him out on it, stating it would have been better if he just reminded her of an old flame. Rifen asked for forgiveness, and she assured him she'd keep traveling with him. Heading toward the exit, she said she wasn't the Cirrus he remembered, but at least she didn't hate the idea. With that, she left, leaving Rifen blushing and confused. Later, the group headed to Krobantz, the kingdom that cultivated the most grain on the entire continent, making it one of the most powerful nations. It was led by King Gottram, who had named Telion as his heir. However, both the king and the prince died under mysterious circumstances. With no one occupying the throne, the nobles sought to take advantage. 2 candidates emerged, dividing the nobility and sparking a war. One side supported Karsus, while the other backed Yovel, the second prince and son of a concubine, which made him unwelcome in the royal lineage, unlike Karsus, that he wasn't the king's son, but he did have royal blood, and the backing of the house of Count Fernando, and so Krobantz was plunged into a civil war between the skilled and beloved swordsman Karsus and the king's useless second son. Meanwhile, in the barony of Delphinia, Yovel gazed thoughtfully out the window, complaining about the pointless war and how it now seemed like even the gods were pissed off, ruining the crops. He couldn't hate the idea of being king more. Just then a female voice asked him if he really wanted to escape that burden so badly. He said yes, but at this point, it was either the throne or the grave. The girl seemed indifferent, but Yovel reminded her that if his head rolled, hers would be next. The dwarf understood that fate, having fallen in love with the man, she was Phinia, the prince's maid and lover. He then apologized for being the kind of man she ended up with, but she tried to cheer him up, reminding him that while there was a shortage, at least there wouldn't be a battle. Resigned, he thought his only salvation was for the soldiers to starve. Phinia, hugging him, suggested running away to a far-off nation. Though he doubted a spoiled brat like him could handle hard work, she offered to support them both. She held him tenderly, taking on the mission of earning money for her master as his servant. But Yovel made it clear she wasn't a slave, getting affectionate. They knew that no matter how much they loved each other, nowhere would ever accept them as a couple. Suddenly a voice interrupted them, congratulating them on the lovey-dovey scene. Phinia stood guard to protect the prince, seeing a massive figure who introduced himself as a mage who wanted to help the rightful heir to Krobantz. He arrived using his ability to detect lies. He knew he was telling the truth, but Yovel hesitated at the sight of such a buff mage. He soon accepted that his disguise had failed, on top of receiving complaints for his earlier sarcasm. Even though the prince actually understood him, Rifen apologized, assuring him that he wasn't judging since he was also a partner of an elf, leaving the couple in shock, especially Yovel, who didn't expect to meet another pervert like himself. But the important thing was what kind of help the protagonist was offering. He answered with 1,000 gold coins. This left the couple stunned, as it was half of the kingdom's budget. A tempting but suspicious offer that got even better, with the promise of 6 mana users, which surprised the guy, since he knew there were only 5 in his entire kingdom. Suspicious, he asked, what the payment would be. So Rifen only demanded a portion of land, independent of the kingdom's control or laws. A place for dwarves, orcs, and elves to live in peace. And so later on, Rifen returned to the small village where Cirrus was. She asked him how it went. Apparently it went well. Determined not to make the same mistake as in his past life, striving for his nation to be recognized. Cirrus wondered if he already knew the prince, but the answer was no, since in his time the king was Karsus, and Yovel ended up beheaded, hoping this time to avoid that fate. They reached the inn, where the others were to report their achievement, with Cyrus noting that since they left the forge they hadn't stopped finding ruins, which he considered a huge success. But he complained that it had been harder to collect the loot than to eliminate the demons. But Ciri reminded him that in none of those ruins had he found so many gold coins. Rifen clarified it wasn't money, but grain valued at that amount, which he bought from silver due to inflation scarcity and the silver coins. Bruna's value had increased, although Tyla also thought it was a shady deal. But the MC maintained that it wasn't illegal. Meanwhile, Cyrus was more worried about the fact that he offered 6 mana users when there were only 3, wondering if they had found more elves. Rifen confirmed they had, but said they were handfuls. However, his real plan was to recruit Kalkin, as he explained to a confused Cyrus that there was an orc tribe nearby. They weren't fearful like servants, nor were they wild, like common swordsmen. They were a tribe that preserved traditions, combining savagery with reason, the Blue Bear tribe, where Tadit should be, Although the swordsman doubted their strength, the MC clarified that orcs were the strongest species of all. Meanwhile, in a field, hundreds of rocks rose with magic circles on them, forming crystals that projected the illusion of the chaos. Sage who reminded Tess of the importance of keeping information hidden. As he vanished, he seemed annoyed at being summoned just for a useless chat, thinking that with a better position, he could warn about the Demon King without being labeled a lunatic. Remembering how, thanks to info from the Light Mage Jade, he learned of Irana and the Order, using his past life knowledge he managed to get in, to safeguard a truth from 1,000 years ago, a time when humans weren't the dominant ones, being surpassed by the elves and the Great Tree of Life. The dwarves ruled the land building, civilizations so impressive they were named Eldrad and Altrin, who worshipped Eldia and Alpat. A history that the Silver Sage hid due to humanity's ego, though this only makes them more ignorant. Anyway, back with the MC's group in Destron, a very barren place, which he recognized as a site where the weakest orcs of the pack were kicked out to test their survival skills. That comment was enough for Tila to call them savages, though Cirrus basically told her she was speaking from her privilege as a girl living in a safe place. Till claimed that had nothing to do with the fact that abandoning one's own kind was still a barbaric act. This sparked a fight between species that reminded Refin a lot of how humans act, though he was more worried about how they were going to get in. And Cirrus thought that as a returner he had it covered. But the last time he had arrived there with Tadir, and things were very different now. At that moment, more trouble appeared in the form of a pack of furious orcs delivering a grand speech in their own language, which basically boiled down to they were going to kill them. Cillian panicked while Refin tried to speak their language to calm them down. But this only seemed to piss them off more. Cirrus felt like they were already toast, and so the fight began with Cirrus dodging the orcs. Tila held them back, and Cyrus fought hard, acknowledging they were very strong. Even though Refin was taking hits, without even feeling it, he reminded them that they had one major weakness, and so activating a magic circle, he cast a sleep spell that knocked them out instantly. Cillian was the most shocked since he never thought that spell would work in battle, but Refin explained that this was the orcs' weakness against humans. They had zero defense against magic. And although he also clarified those weren't warriors, but simply rookie scouts, Cirrus couldn't believe it because they seemed so strong to her. However, Refin suggested she get ready, because they both saw they were being surrounded by actual warriors. From among them, a hooded figure stepped forward to speak in the human tongue, ordering them to leave. Refin told them he had come in good faith, but the hooded figure didn't trust humans. Hearing this, the MC asked for a chance to prove it by offering a battle ritual. A ritual that orc tribes perform to strengthen bonds, serving as a way to earn respect, since they believe a coward can never be strong, trusting only the brave. However, he wasn't sure if they'd agree to perform the ritual with a human. Luckily for them, everyone seemed to be on board, making it much easier than they expected. Cyrus had no problem with it, though she didn't know if the girls would participate. But Refin explained that orcs don't discriminate by gender. Meanwhile, Cillian was afraid he'd have to fight too, but Refin told him no, adding that they'd likely just think he's a kid. And so Cirrus stepped up to battle the orc, Salcator though he spoke in his own tongue, leaving her confused. So he repeated it in the human language. Now, with Cirrus getting ready, Cyrus for her part was shocked they knew their language, and Cillian was skeptical, since humans usually only know one language, which in a way made the humans look dumb. And so the battle began with heavy clashes between the elf and the orc, though Cirrus felt the power of every hit she found them, weaker than the grueling training she had gone through, so she was able to dodge and even control the orc's sword. He tried to strike back, but she didn't just dodge his move. Cirrus took advantage of it to land a brutal spin kick to the orc's face. He was stunned, coming back with fury and recognizing her as a great warrior. Cirrus backed away from the blows, remembering that just as Refin said, orcs were the strongest among all species, observing how skillful his sword attacks were. But she felt that swords weren't a good fit for someone so agile, and she unleashed a strike that locked the orc's sword again. But Salco used his raw strength to break free and attack Cirrus, who was forced to back off, stunned to see his weapons appear to be wrapped in an aura. The orc recited a verse, declaring that his soul was his weapon and that his soul could never be broken. Refin, watching from afar, was also shocked, warning her that this technique was called Soul Weapon, a technique exclusive to orcs. And even though Cirrus wanted to know more, the battle raged on without giving Refin a chance to do anything. Cirrus backed away again, managing to brace herself for a quick move, throwing a kick that threw off the orc's stance. She seized the moment to try and knock out the orc with a massive upward kick. He blocked with his swords, but the kick was so powerful that it sent them flying. And although he was still fine, the swords were up in the air, and to Sirius's amazement, they began to descend directly toward her. Just then Refin shouted that orcs could also control their swords. Sirius was pissed off for getting that info so late, right as the sword crashed down, kicking up a huge cloud of dust. However, Sirius managed to dodge, though the swords kept chasing her, shredding her clothes with every move. She was frustrated to see such an exclusive skill, thinking she might have to admit defeat, but she didn't want to give up, especially not to an ability like that. So while she continued to dodge, she remembered that elves also had a unique ability, summoning the wind spirit. Cillian, in the name of friendship, Riffin, he was blown away, because even though he knew she could do it, he didn't expect her to pull a move like that so soon. And as the spirit prepared itself, absorbing the air, she used it as a springboard, soaring high into the sky. On her way down, she shook off the orc's annoying swords, getting behind him, and placing her blade at his neck, checkmate. The orcs were hyped, congratulating the outsider, Ciri, returned to her friends, and Cillian fussed over her, trying to heal her while Riffin praised her victory. Though the little guy wondered if the spirit would be mad about being stepped on, the MC knew they didn't care about trivial stuff, even if Cyrus thought stepping on it like that was overkill. Still, none of them knew that Riffin understood Ciri's tough love all too well. Now the orcs wanted the next fight, and Tila was hyped up, offering to go only to get beaten instantly. Now thrashed and disappointed, she had to listen in, orcish as they criticized her for having great skills and key control but failing to use them in battle. So she was lectured with them, saying if she had tried harder, she would have won. In their tradition, that seemed like a disrespectful way to put it. However, they valued perseverance, though. She had to ask Riefin to translate. He summarized it by saying she could have tried harder, which annoyed the dwarf. But the MC preferred to move to the next fight, sending in Sirius, asking him not to kill the opponent. He nodded as he marched determinedly into battle, introducing himself as the Sword of Tennis, who would prove his honor, releasing his aura and surprising the hooded orc. The orc decided to jump into the battlefield, introducing herself as Tala Langar, one of the leaders of the tribe, who recognized him as a Karuga, the name given to talented orcs who awaken their aura or spiritual weapons. Because of this, they admired Cyrus, though. He felt pretty awkward about it, thinking that if they were already overreacting for him, they'd lose their minds when they saw Riffin. The female orc introduced herself as the tribe's matriarch, unleashing the power of her aura. Cyrus, acknowledging her strength, did the same, causing their auras to clash. This ended when the swordsman sliced through the air with his blade. As the clash between them began, she pushed him back. With every exchange, the boy recognized his rival's massive power. She noticed it too, telling him he was good, but still lacked experience. Then she had to say it again in his language, so he'd understand, while ramping up the pressure with hits he could barely defend against. Tala, excited by the fight, drew her sword friends Kata and Rander, which she hurled at the boy in waving motions. Cyrus had to block them, feeling how tricky it was to deal with that ability. He managed to get the swords off him, but not her, as she launched a direct attack at his stomach. Luckily, the boy managed to block the blow with his hands, remembering how he had been hit by similar attacks before, thinking he could handle it. However, he could barely withstand the pressure while defending against the swords at the same time, taking deep cuts. Riefin, watching from the sidelines, regretted that the boy, even with all his experience, still didn't know how to deal with an aura user, which left him at a disadvantage. And so he watched as Cyrus fell to his knees. Tala celebrated her victory, but the boy wasn't giving up yet and stood back up, thinking about his final move, which he wasn't sure would even work. He flooded his eyes with aura, and to everyone's surprise, he swung his sword, managing to create hundreds of duplicates, launching them straight at the orc, who confidently dismissed them as mere illusions. She picked out the 3 real ones and blocked them, praising the boy for such a great move for someone so young. However, she got way too cocky, because one of the weapons managed to wound her. It was the man himself, Cyrus, who had camouflaged his presence, stunning both Riefin and the orc. She claimed that tactic wouldn't work a second time, as Cyrus tried to repeat it, forming more afterimages. However, Stala cut through the illusions with total calm, believing she had completely figured him out. But Cyrus's afterimage vanished entirely, and he appeared from below, ending a deep cut on Stala's leg. Thinking he had won, Riffin saw him as a genius for how he used aura to create a distortion of reality, creating sword illusions and even manipulating the presence of his aura. However, he knew this wasn't the end, but the start of the signature skill of the Sword Saint, the Void Sword. Feeling a bit nervous, remembering that power, seeing his friend as someone truly powerful. Even so, Stala seemed more interested in fighting Riffin, feeling like she needed to wrap up this fight quickly to get to him, and so she apologized, because everything was going to end right there. Unleashing birds of prey, a dozen gigantic swords moved into formation for the next attack. This terrified Cyrus as he watched Stala's swords swirl all around him, carving massive gashes into the ground. So he had no choice but to give up, and Riffin tried to hype him up by asking him to show him that move. Next time, though, Cyrus refused since the protagonist didn't even dodge attacks, making him doubt the orc could handle him. Then Riffin flexed on them, shedding his coat to show off his physique, causing all the orcs to fall for his muscles to the point that the matriarch didn't even want to fight someone so hot, even though she had to the protagonist. Ignored all that and introduced himself. But just then, a massive hooded orc called out to his wife, Stala, and asked to take her place in the fight. She was shocked that he had actually made it there. The orc said he'd watched everything from a rock on a distant mountain, though she was still surprised, since he was supposed to be hunting a legendary beast. He said he saved the beast for the feast and introduced himself to Riffin as his opponent instead of his wife, revealing himself as Calquan, the tribe's chief. Riffin was stoked to face someone as legendary as his master. So the orc, equally hyped, unleashed his power and charged at him, but the protagonist countered with a spell that put him to sleep like a baby, disappointing his friends and making his wife complain. Riffin just wanted to make it clear that he had magic to match his muscles. While she woke up her husband, Riffin warned him about his powers. The chief thought he just needed a nap. But knowing his rival was a mage, he told him to use every skill he had to fight him. And while some argued over whether it was legal or not, in the end, the only thing that mattered was resuming the ritual battle with a clash between the two warriors. Meanwhile, far from there, they were harvesting the great serpent that Kalden had defeated. An orc was standing next to a hunting dog, a super cute one to whom he tossed a steak. But while doing that, he saw the massive green flash from the battle and decided to head back, this being the current version of Tadit. Meanwhile, both Riffin and Calcan were rushing excitedly toward their next clash, colliding with similar force. The protagonist tried to get the upper hand with a key bullet, which was blocked easily by the orc's massive sword as he lunged at him. Riffin recognized him as highly skilled and pushed him back with hundreds of key bullet strikes. They were all blocked, but he figured that was enough to prove his worth as a warrior. Using the sleep spell again, he knocked him out cold. It seemed funny to him that even as an aura user, he was so weak to magic. He decided to end it while he was asleep, approaching far too confidently, not noticing that even though Kalden seemed unconscious, his aura was still active, and he launched a colossal slash with his sword, which Riffin barely managed to block. Everyone was blown away, especially Cillian and Cyrus, who wanted to practice that reflex move. Then, the orc woke up, realizing he had fallen for the same trick again. Riffin, for his part, unleashed his power, amazed to see something he'd never seen even in the future. He figured that was why, in his timeline, he gave amulets to all the orcs to defend against those kinds of spells. He attacked once more, freezing Calcan with a spell. However, even though he couldn't counter the magic, his aura fought back automatically, breaking free to shatter the spell and launching into an excited attack. Riffin was just as hyped, and that he could use another spell to end the fight. But his warrior spirit was itching for a real battle, so they both started going all out with every strike, making the ground shake with every impact, leaving everyone stunned as they both geared up for one final blow. Hyped up, Riffin used his horn strike, and Calcan went with his cross slash, with both of them charging at each other, tearing up the terrain with every step, until finally they clashed, causing a massive explosion that could be seen from everywhere. A little while later, Riffin was groaning in pain after the fight while Sylvia treated his wounds, telling him not to be such a crybaby and to stop rushing her, remembering how Stala had declared the match a draw. Since both had similar auras, it left Riffin sore, and Tila was surprised that the healing process was so painful. But the mini-cleric explained that it was because his opponent's aura was still inside him, and that aura, mana, and divine energy were all different and didn't play well together, especially mana and divine energy. Zilan also offered to heal the orc, but he said he'd heal up on his own, and reminded them that from now on, the human heroes were his brothers, excited to have a new family. He told them that according to their tradition, they celebrate with blades and booze. So, they gathered around the bonfire, where the orcs were partying with horns full of alcohol, a scene that most of the humans saw as just a typical celebration. Then Calquain offered his drink to Riffin, who remembered he couldn't stand it in his past life. He tried to turn it down, but once he tasted it, he actually liked it. When the orc asked for a whole barrel, his wife gave him a suspicious look, thinking it was just an excuse to get wasted, but even so, Riffin ended up chugging it all, earning even more respect from the orcs. Meanwhile, some orcs kept calling the elf and the dwarf fat because in their language, even though it annoyed, Cyrus Rifen explained that's how they labeled everyone, who didn't show off their muscles. Others tried to fatten up Cillian by stuffing him with food, while Cyrus tried to wrap his head around what Rifen wanted to teach him with this scene. And right then, Calkin cheered at the arrival of the shepherd, whom the protagonist immediately recognized as Taddy. Taddy was stoked to be recognized, despite how much he had changed, calling him savior, and explaining that it was actually him who had saved him and sent him there. The tribal leader, happy about the coincidence, finally asked Rifen what had brought him all the way there. Full of confidence, he offered them better land to live on in exchange for their help. Calkin was shocked that they wanted to give them land just for fighting, which Rifen basically confirmed was the deal, since his goal was to take over the Viscounty of Galpine near the mountains. Calkin asked Taddy what he thought about it, having grown up among humans. Taddy replied that humans couldn't be trusted, but Rifen could. However, he suggested that for everyone's sake it would be best to ask the parents of the weapons, basically their blacksmiths whom they considered wise. They went straight to Galter, to whom they introduced Rifen and his plan, asking him what would be best for the tribe. Apparently things went well because later on, the group was satisfied and Rifen stated that the orcs would hide in a safe place, and after a while, they would send 100 men. However, Cyrus noticed they were already bringing one of them along, which was Tedit, who came along to later bring the others, even though the swordsman figured he would become part of the group, just like the other species, surprising the MC with his prediction. Meanwhile, while on the move, they wiped out a huge convoy, carrying military supplies as it passed, through one of the most important trade routes in Krobantz. It was guarded by the Karsus army who were disappointed by the prince's terrible management, seeing how the supplies had almost zero protection, with just a few men, no mages and nobody who looked like a warrior. They even looked really short to them, making them think they were just kids. One orc, believing the prince didn't have the resources to form a decent squad, got cocky about the attack. Determined to get an easy win, they charged in full force, making a lot of noise. But when they got close, the hooded figures revealed themselves as well-armed dwarfs. Even though the Kars army thought it was a joke, that anyone would consider that a real military force. It wasn't long before the dwarfs decided to strike back, causing total chaos. This stunned the army leader, watching how the dwarfs were quickly taking out his men. However, the leader didn't back down. Looking down on the dwarfs, he sent the rest of his troops into the fray. With 800 men charging at full speed, even though the dwarfs felt outnumbered, the main issue was that they couldn't use aura by Riffin's orders, so it was going to be a longer fight. The Karsus people remained cocky, viewing the dwarfs as mere inferior beings, until they started getting the crap beaten out of them. Riffen watched everything from a safe and quiet distance. Seeing the humans stood no chance, Cillian was amazed at how easy it all was. But the MC knew they only had the upper hand because of strategy and the element of surprise. Not to mention that nobody knew they had 3 aura users. Meanwhile, the army leader looked down on the owner of the dwarves for letting his knights fall to inferior creatures. This annoyed the 3 aura users, though they let it slide, thinking of him as just a dumb, ignorant guy. The one who didn't seem to let it slide was Takalta, who charged full force at the enraged leader, whom he took out easily. Then the orc returned to Riven to tell him that he had eliminated the leader. However, the MC was just uncomfortable that he was still calling him master even after all that training from Tobavan. But that's how the fight ended. And back at the barony, the nobles who supported Juvel met to discuss Riven's proposals. Among them was Count Fionin, the prince's grandfather, who thought the idea of hiring dwarves as mercenaries was extreme. And although Riven defended their military worth, most nobles didn't believe a few dwarves could make a difference. No matter how hard he tried to convince them, they still saw them as useless for war, even suggesting selling them off to hire actual mercenaries. The MC didn't like that lack of trust, but the nobles didn't seem to want to back down. So he decided to give them a little demonstration by tearing down the Sinai fortress with his troops. In front of a skeptical Fionin, who, even seeing how serious the MC was, could only laugh at the thought that Sinai was just like some forest bandits, since it was the strongest place in the kingdom and already housed the aura user Tesvault. Because of this, all the nobles felt uneasy, seeing the mage's arrogance in sending so many slaves to be wiped out, but Juvel didn't see it that way. So trusting that they needed an army, not slaves, and the fact they wouldn't use army resources, which Riffen confirms, stating they will only take 1 week's worth of food. So seeing that they'll use very little food, he doesn't see the harm in letting them try, and with some people backing him up, Juvel uses his authority to officially assign Riff the task of taking down Sinai Fortress. He accepts the mission, and later on, Riff returns to his group, asking if Tadid has already left. The answer is that he went to bring his troops. Though even with them, Cyrus doesn't believe that 200 troops will be enough to bring down the fortress. Riffin doesn't underestimate the Krobant's troops, since he knows they are strong, but not compared to Great Forge Bluebear and Zealand. He feels that if this works, everyone will look at the dwarves and orcs differently. And at that moment, Reinhardt appears, including the elves in this mission as a thank you for reviving the World Tree, showing the power of the spirits by summoning the Fire Spirit, hoping that soon the other elves will feel how Elphegene has been reborn. Right then, Juval appears, asking what all the fuss is about catching everyone by surprise. He arrives with Phineas, who wanted to meet the other dwarves, though he's mainly there for Ryfin, for whom he showed concern even though everything was going according to plan. He isn't sure if they'll hit their goal, but the MC tells him they will if they prep well. Juvel seems satisfied with the fact that his lady is happy, spending time with the other dwarves. So based on their shared trust, he leaves the rest to Ryfin, who promises he won't let him down. And with that, as spring arrived, the war kicked off with the first attack on Sinai Fortress. And though everyone was on high alert and clearly desperate to aura user, Tesfalt von Fernando, all that tension was a total overreaction, since in his eyes, there were no real enemies, only slaves, and assuming from their emblems that they belong to Prince Jubal, and even though the slaves are in position, they think it's a waste of money, leading him to believe it's actually a trap, so Balt won't take any chances and sends out knights and soldiers ready to retreat, if it is a trap or if not to get rid of the ogres and dwarves, while keeping the elves, especially the female warriors, looking for a good profit. The soldiers charge, viewing the situation as ridiculous but following their orders clearly. However, before they could even react, the large group is engulfed in a brutal orange flash from the aura of one of the dwarves. He didn't remember if they could use it now, but his green aura companion tells him it's authorized, allowing him to let loose. They release their power, overwhelming all the knights. The soldiers watch in terror as their leaders fall, seeing the dwarves as monsters, while these three enjoy taking out the humans and avenging their race. Meanwhile, Balt watches in horror, not understanding what's going on. Then he receives advice from his subordinates to protect the fortress, ordering defensive spells to start, forming the magic circle that activates the dome covering the entire fortress. Griffin notices the quality of the spell, and Cillian thinks they're at a disadvantage, but the MC is already prepared and sends in his elves, who each summon their colossal fire spirits, which march imposingly toward the shield. Balt is terrified at the sight, and just like him, his subordinates realize it's spirit magic, something they've only seen in books. Even though the prejudiced knight doubts that mere elves could do such a thing, this move shatters the barrier, leaving, clearing the way for the dwarves to smash the gate, entering as all the soldiers were paralyzed with fear. And Bald charged to the front with his knights, determined to wipe out the inferior races, confident in his own superiority. Meanwhile, the dwarves, Malloy and Isloyd, were protecting their allies, and Carmite lunged directly at Bald, starting the fight. Right from the first clash, Bald was stunned. The dwarf's strength matched his own. Even Carmite recognized him as a solid warrior, especially for someone so young. And outside, Riffin felt confident that Carta would win. However, he noticed the group was starting to tire, and Ciaro asked him to step in. But the MC couldn't do it, as this goal was to showcase the power of the other species. Even though his friend reminded him that nothing would matter if the plan failed. The MC got the point, so he decided to wait for his reinforcements. They arrived just in time, though a bit late, led by Tadit, and Riffin scolded him for the delay. But the orc reminded him that it wasn't easy to make 100 orcs go unnoticed, and Ryfin admitted it, blaming Teslin's muscle-brained head for not thinking of that. But now the orcs had to fight, charging in a massive stampede, reciting their battle cries and breaking into the castle, starting to cut down the soldiers determined to fight until their hearts burst, unleashing their brutality with every move, trusting in the protection of the warrior spirit. All that raw power and euphoria terrified the knights, who tried to make a break for it. Some tried to counterattack, but ended up crushed by the orcs' massive weapons. Rifen smiled from the sidelines, remembering that back then no one expected the combat style of other species. While the elves preferred thin and light weapons, the dwarves, long-range weapons, the trolls, any weapon derived from nature, and the orcs with their massive, beautifully giant weapons. Plus, these were empowered by spiritual gifts that flew across the battlefield, wiping out everything in their path. Silent watched in awe, though Rifen admitted that making a weapon fly wasn't always the best move, since if the knights split into two groups, they could gain the upper hand. That's why, according to him, humanity was losing due to their arrogance and ignorance. Meanwhile, inside the fortress, Caleb joined the fray, while Carlos kept fighting Val outside. Griffin watched, knowing he didn't think Cillian would be indifferent to seeing humans die, which the latter confirmed. However, he also understood that they were at war, and finally the battle inside the fortress ended with the fall of Balt. Meanwhile, in Croton, the capital of Grobance, Karsa received news of the battle. There, the aspiring king couldn't believe it, even though his subordinates insisted on informing him about Balt's defeat. He fell into despair, seeing that his army had been cut down to 12,000 men. And with the fortress lost, he knew the capital would soon fall. Because if Yubel arrived and performed the coronation ceremony, he would win the support of the neutral nobles. That's why he had to gather his allies, surprising his subordinates with strategic skills, worthy of a king. Meanwhile, at the summit of Sinai, Yubel, still in disbelief, celebrated the victory alongside Riffin, who had promised not to let him down. The prince thanked him, asking if his men were resting well, even though he knew the nobles wouldn't like it. The nobility? Riffin understood they wouldn't be happy, that slaves slept in beds while human soldiers, they were camping outdoors. Nevertheless, Yubel made it clear that no one would complain after a victory like that. Both knew that there were inevitably losses among the wounded dwarves, orcs, and elves, though they were few compared to the enemies, but it was still too many when they had so few soldiers. That genuine concern for them made the Proto feel proud, confirming that he did the right thing by backing the future king. And sometime later, he was walking through the halls, seeing that in Yubel's army, there was no room for discrimination. However, there were still idiot nobles trying to buy his friends as if they were slaves. No matter how much the Proto tried to talk sense into them, the necessity of some things forced him to hold back his rage to keep from wiping them out. Meanwhile, news of the victory at Sinai was spreading throughout the world. Some soldiers were amazed at how a dwarf had defeated Balt, and even nobles were shocked by the orcs' power, starting to see them as something more than just slaves. Still, there were those who considered those rumors ridiculous and kept treating the orcs like fools. They even believed that a priest in Valencia was controlling the dwarves. This caught the attention of a massive woman who was very interested in this supposed priest. And upon hearing that it was a small cleric who looked like a little girl, the woman got so excited that she crushed her glass, spilling the wine which she licked off her fingers in ecstasy, thinking that she had finally found her fiancé Cillian. And so on the plains of Levante, Karsa showed up with an army of 10,000 troops while Yubel had only 3,000. Rafen watched Karsa's desperation after having gathered all his forces, and watched as Raban Bonperia stepped out from his troops, an aura user who demanded a duel with anyone brave enough, accusing them of using dirty tricks against Balt. Karda saw him as even weaker than Balt and considered taking care of it himself, but his dwarf companion stopped him, because they had apparently already chosen the opponent. It was Cyrus, who would represent Prince Yubel. Raven was shocked to see that he was so young, and Cyrus, aware that he faced a tough opponent, started the duel. The fight began with brutal exchanges evenly matched in power, much to the surprise of Yubel's soldiers. Though they didn't know him, they were thrilled to see an aura user on their side. Because of this, Karsa began to feel the pressure, noticing that the opposing side had more aura users than the kingdom itself, which boosted his enemy's morale. For his part, Raven recognized the young man's power, and the latter was happy to gain experience against other users, since in terms of pure swordsmanship he was at a disadvantage. As the fierce fighting continued with every strike, Riffin watched in amazement as Cyrus exceeded his expectations and suspected he would soon become a sword saint. Raven, furious at the humiliation of losing to a kid, concentrated all his power into his sword, but Cyrus unleashed the spectral dimension, creating sword illusions. Confused, Raven couldn't react and took the final blow. He fell to the ground, admiring the boy's great power and that technique. But before dying, he only heard how, for Ciaro, that had been just one more failure, since he knew it was a good technique, with a grand name, but it cost too much to use. Meanwhile, as Karsa felt morally defeated, he tried to win by sheer numbers, sending his entire army to charge with a battle cry, but Yubel didn't back down, and also launched an attack alongside his knights. Ciaro led the orcs. They quickly mounted their beasts and launched an attack. Karsus's knights still believed they could win if they managed to knock them off their mounts. But clearly, these weren't horses. They were giant wolves that tore through Karsus's soldiers. Terrified to see the rumors were true, he thought his special ops agent should have reported this. However, he understood now his forces remained almost untouched, because those 1,000 special ops men never made it past the dwarf fortress court. Be that as it may. At that moment, the fire spirit, Ignasis, appeared on the battlefield, setting everything ablaze. Karsus tried to fight back with magic, but his mages couldn't cast anything due to a disturbance in mana. His stunned leaders assumed the enemy had a high-level mage, and they did. It was Riffin who noted he still had the touch, even though he was low on mana. With all this, a frustrated Karsus saw no other choice but to surrender. The troops withdrew, bringing the battle to a close. It would go down in history as the Battle of Levante. The victor was Yubel, and upon taking the capital, he received his subjects' support, though he knew full well most had supported Karsus, and his grandfather reminded him that Karsus had returned to Croton, still intending to fight. Since many nobles now backed Yubel, there were still many neutrals, and he knew the need to win them over. Though Yubel wasn't sure how, he knew one thing clearly: he had to be a king who cared for his citizens, feeling he owed them that much. Meanwhile, in the county of Hendrik, a pair of guards stopped a Saiyajin paladin at the entrance. They recognized her face as extremely beautiful, though what really terrified them was her Amazonian physique. Meanwhile, inside the place, Cillian was giving it his all against the lizards, though. Rafen suggested he rest his arms and switched to doing some squats instead. And he kept going and going while the Proto wandered around, remembering how the boy had earned everyone's respect on the battlefield. Seeing someone so young and seemingly weak walk among the wounded, healing them tirelessly, even though he turned his attention back to the little one, insisting that he stop. The boy knew he needed to gain muscle fast. However, Cillian stopped when he noticed what Cyrus was doing. He seemed to be trying to please the wind spirit. Rifen reminded him that he'd already been warned, but the elf suggested they'd get over it in 2 days, claiming that spirits have the memory of a goldfish. The Prota couldn't help but notice how cold she was to her friends, wondering if in his time she had just been faking her personality. At that moment, a knight informed them that someone was looking for him. Upon going to the reception, he encountered a giant paladin. For a second, he thought it was his sister. But no, it was Christine, who made it clear that she wasn't looking for him, but for Cillian. Riffin understood the guard's confusion regarding the size difference. And just then Cillian walked in, wondering who was looking for him, only to be met with Christine's love-struck gaze, a total contrast to the terrified expression of the little cleric, who watches as the girl runs toward him, begging him to please stop running away from their marriage. But Cillian doesn't want to give up his single life, which confused his shield, meaning Riffin, who didn't understand a thing. Christine, intensely in love, told him they would marry with the permission of the great god, which later caused Cillian to be driven to desperation, packing his bags ready to bolt, although Riffin tried to calm him down to get more out of him. And that's how he learned that Christina was a woman from a renowned noble family who dreamed of being beautiful, and she nailed it, though she also went a bit overboard with her growth. Thanks to this, she was heralded as the sword of her god, destined to be the mother of a great warrior, training as a paladin until one day, in the Vasili kingdom, she fell in love for the first time. It was love at first sight with her soulmate Cillian, a young cleric, full of life, who healed men in battle, and who seemed to have everything the girl was looking for. So she returned to the Order of Sayar, where she claimed to have found her destined man. But unlike her, the Order weren't total pervs who would approve a marriage between a 20-year-old woman and a 12-year-old boy. Or at least not unless their god gave the word, which he eventually did. So Felenia's order had no choice but to accept, provided the boy agreed, and that's how Cillian's nightmare began. Rifen summed it all up as an arranged marriage, though Cillian only remembered the obsessive woman who followed him everywhere. And that was the original reason why he joined the Prota, and the Prota figured it was also the reason why Cillian wanted to get jacked, hoping that would make her lose interest. But the Prota thought it was all just a bias because she was tall. Rosina clarified that it was because she was controlling and obsessive, to the point that she had already picked out their future children's names and planned out their lives. Stein, if it was a boy, a future paladin of Saiyajin and Elin. If it was a girl, a future saint of Saiyajin. Riven felt that was definitely going too far, until he thought twice about it, and when he asked her again for the name of her future daughter, the answer was Elin. The little cleric didn't care about that, but Riven certainly did, who took a moment to realize that was the name of his future arch-enemy, Saint Eileen, the one who had finished Mashlin, with power so massive that she revived the fallen. She was a formidable warrior, capable of blessing 10,000 men, until they entered a berserker state, worrying that his friend would be the father, and Rifter remembered that Saint Elin hadn't been conceived naturally, but through a forbidden Saiyajin ritual called the Holy Grail, a ritual so twisted that the baby absorbed the father's life during conception, and the mother's at birth, which was the reason why he had never heard of the little guy in his time. So he warned his friend that if he married, he'd die, and he already knew that, though not for those reasons as he took it literally. Supporting his mission to not marry, but Cillian had no choice but to flee, and the scene felt like a dramatic farewell with nosy guards watching everything, and Rifle saw him as a friend and teammate. So he tried to convince him not to run, but Cillian, with puppy dog eyes, told him he had no other choice. The Prota bitched about being abandoned, but the cleric knew it was the only thing to do. He didn't want to be a burden in the war. Rifle begged him to talk to her, but he knew she wouldn't listen. Meanwhile, the soldiers thought they were witnessing a romantic breakup. Just when the third wheel arrived, the crazy Christy ready to take him away. Poor Cillian blamed Riffin for stalling him, finally falling into the hands of the giantess, who didn't seem to hear any of the little guy's complaints, and the Prota just watched the scene and couldn't help but ask himself a question: why she liked Silent. She replied that if they ever had children, they would be the perfect height, which seemed surprisingly logical to Riffin, and the girl insisted that she didn't want to inherit the divine punishment of their respective statures. Even though Cillian claimed he didn't feel punished, she responded that they were both insecure about their height, and according to her, it was fate closing in dangerously. With every intention of sealing the deal on a relationship predestined by the gods, Dylan tried to refuse, but he knew it wouldn't work. So he looked to Riffin for help. However, that wasn't much use either. So he had to resort to the most bizarre plan for his reputation: jumping into Riffin's arms, his supposed true love. This shocked both Christine and Riffin as well as the guards. Cillian, brutally honest, claimed that he and Riffin were already bound by the red thread of fate from Phalancia, which was technically true, since they had used it in the past, and the guards, confirming their suspicions, thought they made a good couple, believing they were just on the verge of breaking up. And while they both talked with their eyes, Riffin complained about the plan, but Silent insisted he had no other choice, because in the end it was the only person he had in sight, and Riffin suggested one of his maids, but the little guy knew that wouldn't work to shock and push Christine away, and still the pro could only think about the consequences that would have on his reputation. However, he had no choice but to pretend to be a happy couple. The paladin seemed to resign herself, which thrilled Cillian, thinking that he had pulled it off. However, all of this turned out to be the calm before the storm, since Christine, seeing this as a test of love, challenged Riffin to a duel, with all the knights joining in on the gossip, including Cirrus the MC. He had no intention of accepting, but Silent had already thrown him out there like a Pokemon, trusting in the power of their love. And although he didn't want to do it, he knew it was the only way to save himself. To make matters worse, Riffin's romantic troubles only grew when Ciri noticed the lack of chemistry and eye contact between them, assuming they were a couple, much to the MC's suffering, while Christine excitedly offered the mage the first strike, and seeing there was no other way out, Riffin decided to end it quickly, conjuring a massive lightning storm that surrounded the girl, with the sole intention of knocking her out. However, the paladin shattered the technique with her divine light sword. The guards thought he was an aura user, but Riffin knew the truth. She was one of the few knights of Sayer capable of mastering that power. Realizing he'd have more trouble than expected, preparing his next spell, launching massive energy waves heading straight for Christine. She dodged them with ease. Silent yelled angrily at Riffin for only using magic, but he was trying to maintain his mage persona, while the little cleric was getting desperate, so Riffin got serious and cast a high-level spell, summoning a glacier that trapped the paladin's feet, long enough for his next move. However, she didn't plan on giving up and using the power granted by Sayer, contracting her muscles. She broke her body free from the ice with brute force. Cillian, terrified by that display of power, asked if she was an aura user, but she replied no, even though she had received the blessing to equip one. However, Riffin was the one who noticed something else, the breathing technique she used, asking her where she had learned it. She then remembered her childhood, before serving Sayer, when she met a buff old man who assured her that the technique would make her healthy, and for her, it was a blessing in her life, but Riffin knew exactly who it was, his crazy master, and seeing what he did, Riffin started to think that maybe he wanted Christine to stay single forever, or he's just stuck on the idea that bigger is better. But he chose not to say anything, while the girl didn't stop and kept charging straight at him, while the MC tried to attack her with energy slashes, which she managed to repel easily thanks to her strength and breathing technique, and Riffin dodged Christine's attacks, worried, seeing how she kept using that breathing technique that he had purposely ignored so he wouldn't grow so much, even though he recognized she was very talented at using it and thought that if it really worked for everyone, the unbreakable gym would be swimming in cash because of how insecure people were about their height. Christine, on her part, was nothing but furious because Riffin wouldn't lose, though he didn't quite get why. After all, he wanted to win too. According to her, it was all the fault of his big mouth. The mage talk he probably used to seduce the minor cleric, demanding that he lose by appealing to the power of love. Completely lost, he decided not to overcomplicate things and hit her with a spell so powerful it sent her straight to the ground, thinking that would end it and she would accept defeat, which she finally did, though sadly for failing to rescue her beloved from that buff giant who, according to her, could rip him in two without even trying. Cillian preferred not to put any more images in anyone's head and suggested that he and Redefine were a ride-or-die couple, asking him to back him up even though he didn't want to. Through their silent eye contact, he ended up agreeing, although he was crying inside and out. With that, he sent her packing. The paladin ran off in tears, while Redefine asked him, Cillian, how were they supposed to fix that? And honestly, they couldn't, since the rumors reached the ears of the nobles and community leaders, who didn't see them as a bad match, and even showed positive acceptance. And more than that, it became a curious topic of discussion and a common ground between humans and various species, sparking debates about acceptance and love, and for Ciri it was a sacrifice that represented a huge step toward the dream of Redefine, who in embarrassment refused to come out from under the sheets, blaming Cillian for everything. Although the little guy said that playing the blame game solved nothing, luckily the elf gave them a clue by mentioning that the rumor spread because Cillian looked like a cute girl, even though he was a boy. With that, they both found the solution. Redefine finally went into beast mode and decided to turn Cillian into a real man of steel. Cillian backed him up, celebrating with hype, while Tadit, seeing how close they were, thought the rumors would only get worse, and Ciri seconded that idea. But in the end, they knew that over time, they would die down. Now they were back to war. Joel's army arrived at Croton Fortress, where the prince ordered the surrender of the traitor, Karsus, and urged him to submit to the will of the heavens. But Karsus's generals rejected the idea, and the dishonor of using monsters in the army, demanding that he disband his army of aberrations and surrender. Redefine, losing patience, demanded they get straight to the fight, and Joel charged forward alongside to his brave soldiers, launching the attack, and the prince encouraged them to fight, especially his allies, Kalkin and Astala, who also charged to the front. The dwarves were also there, complaining about not being used to riding horses, but Ciro told them they looked great, while Garza, furious, decided to respond with a volley of arrows, which simply bounced off the confident orc and Cyrus. Then they tried spears, but the same thing happened. Advancing at full speed, Cyrus led the charge, readying his sword, powering up his aura, until it formed a massive spirit blade. That's when a surprisingly alive Raven appeared, annoyed that his technique was stolen, but Ciro didn't stop and destroyed the fortress entrance, allowing Kalkin to enter, who didn't want to be outdone, leaping and using his cliffside technique, shattering everything around him, and both users showed respect to each other, fighting side by side while the soldiers watched them in awe. Astala admired her comrades and didn't plan on falling behind. She remembered how Rifle asked her not to harm the soldiers, making her priority tearing down the walls. So she summoned her two sisters, launching them at high speed towards strategic points on the wall, charging them with power to demolish it. This surprised her husband and the dwarves due to her architectural knowledge, and even Ciro thought about stealing her technique. Meanwhile, Karsus didn't know what to do. Raven offered no solutions either, simply suggesting they escape the castle. But at that moment, they were alerted that Ubel and his troops had retreated, leaving them completely confused, since they thought they had won. And in the distance, a general from Ubel's army, he raised his voice, reaffirming the victory, but making it clear that he had no desire to hurt the city's innocent citizens. That's why he called out the traitor, Karsus saying if he were a true leader, he would surrender. This painted Karsus as the villain, labeling the one who planned it all as a twisted mastermind. This mastermind, of course, was Redefine, who was congratulated by Uve, seeing that the move was a total checkmate for Karsus. And so at Karsus's meeting of nobles, his father, Duke Fernando, asked him if there was still any way to win. One noble was annoyed by the cheap tricks the lower races used to pose as Laura users. Another suggested just laying low for a while. However, Karsus reminded him that Juvel had the crown and the seal, and if they left the sacred hall, he'd crown himself king. Some nobles wanted to beg for help from another kingdom, but to Karsus that would be the same as giving up everything. Yet they were desperate not to lose. The young man knew they only cared about themselves, and it deeply annoyed him that even his own family backed those ideas. Many felt they had to take out the prince, though it's not like they hadn't tried already. Someone also mentioned that Raven might be able to do it, but as a knight of the realm, he couldn't touch a member of the royal family, though he was all for getting rid of someone like Redefine. Meanwhile, on Viscount Cyber's land, a massive celebration was underway, where the nobles were patting each other on the back for their help in the war, raising a glass to the true king. And even though Juve didn't get why they were celebrating, when they hadn't done anything. Riffin knew they needed these kinds of events to keep envy down and win approval. So he sucked up to the nobles for their supposed support, hoping it would help cool the hatred toward the other races. The nobles, swayed by the flattery, considered them to be very smart and wise, something that surprised Yubel, seeing what a great politician Riffin was, despite being a mage, and meanwhile Riffin kept accepting the praise with humility. For his part, Silent introduced Count Halton and Kalkin, who greeted him politely in his own language. Thanks to the translation necklace Riffin had given him, the Count congratulated his brave warriors, distinguishing them from the cowardly orcs, which annoyed Kalkin. Luckily, Estella stepped in, being kind and cordial, assuring him that they were the true orc warriors, the ones who respected strength. That was enough for the Count to take it well and respect his aura. Riffin had already suggested to Kalkin and the others not to pay too much attention to the comments of the humans, like that one he almost fell for. And so the MC saw how over time everyone was getting used to living together, also noticing how useful Cillian would be in representing the dwarves and nobles, and how even the refined elves seemed to fit in well. Ironically, the biggest problem was Cirrus. He seemed to have a cold and mysterious personality, though in reality he was hiding massive social anxiety. And yet the nobles didn't find him disrespectful. Now Riffin was looking for Sirius. But first he ran into a hooded figure whose presence he hadn't even detected, assuming he was facing either a ghost or a Laura user who had mastered the technique of existence erasure. This hooded figure was Raven, who apologized to Griffin for what he was about to do, promising it would be for the good of the kingdom. Charging at him without hesitation, Griffin barely blocked instinctively with his arm, surprising his rival, who saw his steel skin magic and his reaction speed. With that, a brutal rain of blows began, which didn't cause any damage at all. Realizing that no spell should be that durable, Riffin, exhausted, fired off his energy blasts, forcing the warrior to back off, who understands that he must be special considering he's just a slave. So now he's going to get serious, and Riffin is worried, seeing that once again he couldn't predict the target. Watching as Raven goes for him again, dodging the blow, and out of options, he breaks his mage facade, landing a solid right hook, with the warrior recognizing him as a combat mage, something that makes sense, given how giant and prodigious he is. The prodigy hopes to use that info while avoiding his aura, but instead threatening him with the 6 aura users currently in the mansion, though the warrior is certain he'll take him out first. Riffin doesn't know if he can hold out, seeing his opponent prep his energy for a savage thrust, slamming into his arm. However, the only result was his clothes getting shredded, exposing his buff arm, and Raven is confused by his incredible physique, but he doesn't care, going back on the attack while Riffin keeps busy dodging the blows, until he manages to leap over him. But far from being safe, Raven charges back at full speed, dumping all his energy into that strike, which hits Riffin head-on, repelling it with his aura and leaving himself exposed to the warrior, who's now totally baffled. Meanwhile, he is pissed that things never go as planned, remembering how the last time he fought someone strong without using his aura, he ended up at the bottom of the river. Not wanting a repeat, Raven recognizes that aura as belonging to the successor of Gerard, who is also now a mage, identifying him as the Martial King. Riffheart with this, telling him to get used to life's surprises. But Raven is grateful for that because he can stop feeling guilty about taking out a mere mage. Riffin waits confidently, to which the warrior responds, activating his power, filling his sword with so much energy that it pierces through the mansion's roof, and the MC launches into the attack, creating a fierce collision that wrecks the place, ending with both of them on the roof, with Raven noticing that he's already shown his true nature. But the MC reminds him who started the fight, and that he's the one who's going to finish it, erasing Raven from existence. Raven was waiting for him with his spiral guard, using it to close in on him quickly, and striking him with a brutal kick that echoed through the entire area, sending Raven flying into the sky, alerting the soldiers, while the MC finished the warrior off with a whip-like strike, sending him crashing fiercely into the ground. The impact was so powerful that it destroyed a huge part of the area, leaving him agonizing on the floor, regretting not only his failure, but that if he doesn't get up, the last aura user of the Karsus family ends right there. His last breath is taken as Riffin lands on him with all his might. With that, the MC emerges, wrapped in his golden aura, recognized by the guards as the bearer of the light of Gerard the Martial King. Ravenheart. The dwarves were confused, because nobody knew their savior was a user of aura, and though they knew he wanted to hide his identity, they thought it was just because of his massive muscles. Yubel watched the Martial King in awe, descendant of the unbreakable Jim, as everyone else began to praise him. and Riffin remembered that reactions like these were exactly why he used to hide. Sometime later, Yubal's troops moved forward with many remembering how Raven was defeated by the Martial King, considering it to be an honorable end, unlike Balt who fell to a dwarf trash-talking the warrior if he heard this. Annoyed that they were still looking down on other races, but Raven noticed they weren't exactly belittling them, but rather refusing to acknowledge their strength, which was a step forward. And so they moved on to Croton Fortress, where Juvel watched with excitement after such a long time. The castle gates, though he was surprised that Karsus hadn't given up yet, which wasn't like him. The Prota assumed it was because of pressure from his subordinates, who were likely pushing back against him. Phaonin suggested attacking, but Rifen prefers to enter first. Cillian was already surprised, since he thought he didn't want to fight, but he told him that everyone already knew who he was, making it useless to hold back and marching to the front, with Karsus's soldiers trying to act tough by ordering to loose arrows, which didn't even sting the Prota. Then they catapulted stones that stung a bit more and then followed with fire arrows that burned his clothes. Luckily, they put it out with boiling water, which, ironically, just made him feel like he was in a sauna, being seen as a monster once again, preparing to tear down the gate and asking them to step aside, with full support from his soldiers, which was annoying because basically he was doing the same thing as in his past life, but now they were cheering for him, remembering how 2 days ago after that incident, all the nobles were chatting happily, celebrating all the achievements of the Martial King, even being intrigued by his idea to treat slaves like humans, thinking they were chosen by him, sending him to handle their education. Rifen didn't quite get it, since in his past life he called his followers villains, but Ciri explained it before. He was a mage, someone who represented a power reserved for the few, misunderstood by most, that created fear, and that fear turned him into a demon king. But now he was a warrior, a role that anyone could aspire to, since he didn't project terror but strength, even if it seemed absurd that someone deflecting iron with his bare body was something just anyone could do. But he understood that now he could let loose in combat, and yet Cirrus was clear. He had to fight as a warrior, and in the present, following the advice of Cirrus, he would let go of his mana granted to only a few, to focus on his fists, with which he would strive, for them to follow him with admiration and without fear, tearing down the gates and letting his troops enter. However, Karsus's troops charged at them, ready to die with honor, starting a tragic massacre with Rifen, begging them to stop their useless resistance. Meanwhile, Yuvel and his knights reached the throne room, where they found Karsus, who was waiting with a crazed smile that reminded Rifen of his own time as a demon king. Yuvel asked the lone knight about the others. He replied that his family evacuated, refusing to end their lineage, and although they told him there was no place for traitors in the kingdom, he was at peace, since they fled to Shantan. Juvel didn't understand why he didn't escape, but Karsus made it clear if he had, it would unleash a war between kingdoms. Admiring that he thought of his people before himself, the prince accepted this and honored his wish. Karsus thanked him, asking who would give him his final battle. Yuvel, respecting his royal bloodline, stepped up as his sole rival. Even though his grandfather said it was a bad idea, he remained calm, being backed by Rifen. So he charged into the fray, a clash between the candidates for the throne. While watching the tight battle, Karsus was annoyed, because he thought Juvel only flirted with dwarf girls. But now he saw he was hiding his strength, even though Yuvel reminded him he never had a chance to show it, tanking the hits behind his shield. His skill, however, amazed Phaonin at his grandson's power, and Karsus was desperate at not being able to break through Juvel's guard, and even more when Juvel shrugged him off, making him fall back with lunges, feeling that finally all that grueling leg and hip training he needed to keep up with his beloved had paid off, even though Fine didn't want him talking about their private business, leaving her blushing while Rifen incredibly understood it. For his part, Karsus noticed Juvel was overconfident, so again with sweeping movements, he put him at a disadvantage, mostly because his techniques were for dwarves only. So like a puppy, he begged Rifen for help, who stepped in, throwing honor aside. With a swift move, Karsus saw it coming, his fate in the form of a massive punch, the impact of which released a huge flash, blinding everyone and filling the whole castle. And when the light faded, there was Rifen in front of a giant hole in the wall, holding the only thing left of Karsus, his head. Yuvel, sad but determined, ascended the throne with his ring and crown and ordered the traitor's head to be hung, and Phinia led the ovation for the new king, everyone on their knees, for the birth of Juvel II, news that spread throughout the world. Quickly, everyone in disbelief at the final result. Plus, it came with the news of a new hero, Riefenhart, the Martial King, who will lead an army of otherworldly species straight to victory, shocking the world at how those beings could fight like that. News that reached Grimm, specifically Teslin, who was furious about his enemy's progress and the downfall of the man he knew as a wise and reliable king. Worried that Refin was taking out his enemies ahead of schedule, and just then his allies entered. Eustace was pissed because Cyrus wasn't just alive, but had actually beaten Raven, and Stephen was also salty about Riffin's fame, though the Golden Knight was the most heated because he expected his brother to beg for forgiveness for his betrayal, making Tess uncomfortable, since he knew who the real traitor was, though he ignored it, since he needed him for the time being. So seeing their state, he told them with a terrifying aura that made them nervous that it was time to fight and eliminate Riefenhart. Meanwhile in Cruton, the nobles were complaining about giving autonomous rights to Refin, considering the lands they were giving him enough, though. Juvel made it clear to them that he was the one who did everything, and if he didn't give him those rights, he'd give him more land instead, taking away benefits from other counties, which was enough for the nobles to look out for their own wallets, no longer protesting, so Juvel could decree it as king, granting him the land and autonomous rights, renaming the land Antares, giving birth to a new nation within Krobantz, the county of Antares. And so, in his new kingdom, in his castle, Karsus woke up to a beautiful sunrise of a new day, confused, recalling that the last thing he remembered was his fight with the martial king. Just then, Tilla arrived and introduced herself to the knight, who thought he was in heaven. Tilla told him almost, since it took him days to wake up. Karsus was confused about why he was spared, contrary to what Juvel would do, but Tilla told him that they didn't do it, since his head was hanging in the public square, seeing only a replacement they made for the blonde. This surprised him, but he assumed they used the brilliant aura to pull off the switch. Tilla was amazed by how sharp he was, telling him that he was already in the secret hallway, ready to make a change, and the hole the MC made was for his escape. He was shocked that they knew about that passage, which was an insult to a dwarf girl with architectural knowledge. The blonde couldn't help but wonder if that betrayal against Juvel was part of some conspiracy from another nation, but Tilla told him Riffin just felt pity for losing someone as smart and capable as him, asking him to recover soon. And she left with Karsus trying to stop her, left even more confused. Meanwhile, Iris, like any noble, congratulated his master on being king of a nation, with him being humble by saying that this place was very small. To be a nation, the boy asked him why he didn't ask for more but for Riff. He didn't care about size but autonomy, plus true to his old ways, he could always get more land through war, which disappointed Cyrus. At that moment, the butler notified him that the dwarves were ready for the meeting, arriving right before a bunch of dwarves who greeted him as their king, who he assumed belonged to the previous count, to whom he would give the freedom to leave or stay. However, if they stayed, the mines would be his property, so he would rent them out to them. Basically, he asked them to mine as much as they wanted to pay the rent, or if they wanted to buy them, he'd give them a payment plan in exchange, or a monopoly on whatever they protected. The dwarves, amazed by him, called him their savior, and seeing happily that while it was a pathetic piece of land, compared to his empire in his previous life, the beginning back then had been much worse, and so with all the tribes gathered, they began to distribute the lands, starting with the blue tribes. Even though the elves said those weren't part of the kingdom, he clarified that since the mountains didn't belong to any kingdom, but the bear tribe conquered them, then he would annex them, though he feared the humans living there would want to kick them out. But he also clarified that if they did, that attacking a citizen of Antares would be an invasion, having the law on his side. With this, the orcs felt at ease leaving their lands. The elves were also excited about the distribution, though the MC told them they would have to expand to take in the other elves from the continent and plant a world tree, even though Reinhard didn't know if that was possible. The MC told him it was if he knew the requirements like he did, since he knew where they were. All the seeds that in his past life he had planted to strengthen the elves, and now with the dwarves it was less complicated, since they would build underground, though they would have to expand if their population increased. The problem was that they were far from the Great Forge. Rife reminded them that he chose that spot for a specific reason, nothing more than a dungeon in the Coltan Mountains that had a portal to get them closer, which the dwarves saw as useful for another refuge, though they had to clear it out, a task they would take care of themselves. However, the elves noticed that there was still an empty plot of land, doubting why. Griffin told them it was reserved for those they hadn't crossed paths with yet, and meanwhile, in the freezing mountains of Cloten, an elf walked through the frozen forest, and in the kingdom of Helene, in the mountains of Gitaran, the trolls were predicting confrontation, and so time passed in the new kingdom of Antares, where Cyrus and Tadith trained fiercely, though it looked like the orc was schooling Cyrus, who ended up exhausted suggesting to the orc that he should get another weapon for when he blows away. His soul weapon, but the orc compared that to staying faithful to a friend, even though the boy reminded him that Salka used twin swords, meaning he had two sworn friends, but Tadith didn't want another one, which was very complicated for the warrior to understand, who wasn't even allowed to rest due to the yawns of Tadith's giant wolf, who was extremely lazy, embarrassing its owner, who preferred to watch Cyrus's aura. It seemed amazing to him, hoping to achieve it one day, to which the human told him that usually takes decades, which was good news for the orc, since he was just about to turn 10, making Cyrus uncomfortable, although he told him that's the same age, in human years. So the orc preferred to keep training. Cyrus watched how both the boys and Cillian were working hard on the exercises, and Tila was on her total mission to give Karsus a makeover, who still wasn't used to his new face, and the dwarf girl reminded him that he had to or he'd bring trouble to everyone. He understood this, but wondered if the dwarf girl wasn't tired of watching over him. She told him she was the person with the second least amount of work there, only beat by the king himself, who was still fast asleep, and Iris tried to wake him up, but he stayed lazy rolling around in his bed, until with the persistent help of the elf girl she finally managed it, seeing how she was just as bossy as in her previous life, but without the benefits of being his partner, and so went the breakfast, specially made by her, while she lectured him for slacking off, while everyone else was working, and so he decided to get back to his missions. The next one being the nearest branch of the world tree, the staff of the blue sky Gatuten. Tiri assumed it was similar to Nijale, a weapon she really liked, with Ryfin promising a match. With his power as a end-circle mage, though, the elf saw him as a total amateur. This reminded him that he had to improve his mana, even though his body was terrible at it, being stuck at the 7th circle. But now he asked Sirius to gather the group for their next destination, the freezing Central Mountains and the Kelton Ruins, using Damien's portal to get there fast, while 3 days later in Sarud Teslan got the news that his target was gone, apparently for a few days, and annoyed by the fact that they had to wait for them to return. Stephen was being extremely rude, eating like a pig, and insulting Ryfin, until a kind man suggested he stop, even if he wasn't around, since he spoke of the brave Marshal King, who helped build peace in the kingdom according to the Knight's Code. His loyalty went beyond what anyone thought slaves would be capable of, so insulting him could start a fight. Eustace watched annoyedly as the rumors were in his favor, but not everyone seemed to appreciate it, seeing the giantess Christie approaching, with information on his whereabouts. Tess asked what she wanted in exchange, and she only asked to go with them to wipe out Ryfin. Tess, seeing she'd be useful, agreed. Meanwhile, in the Eteral Mountains, 8 days later, the MC's group was already there, where Cyrus and Tadith teamed up to fight against a creature perfectly coordinated and learning the patterns. They seemed to do it with ease, and while his companions continued investigating specifically, Sirius picked up the cool relics into the MC's bottomless bag, although Cyrus was annoyed that they kept shopping while he was struggling and with the creature about to enter Phase 2 according to Ryfin's warnings, which were once again spot on. According to Cyrus, who had heard that, he knew all that from his master Gerard, who was a dungeon expert, but he still suspected that it wasn't true. Meanwhile, Ryfin was just activating a spell to cut off the flow of mana, whose shockwave reached the monster, causing it to be unable to regenerate, which left the path clear for the duo to finish it off in one hit, and with the monster refusing to die, desperate until it finally gave up taking much longer and with more complaining than Ryfin expected. And right at that moment, Sirius arrived carrying something that the MC recognized with a smile as his goal. It was Gatuten Siri. He thought his mission was over with this, but Ryfin still had something else in mind. Pulling out the map they gave him, after finishing his training, remembering how they were right on Mounty Settler in a place that was way too easy to access, arriving there and seeing it as just a simple and abandoned training ground. However, Sirius claimed to feel a strange energy. The MC thinks this is going to be quick, but everyone felt nervous with every step. Ryfin told them they were overreacting right before falling through a massive hole in the ground. And in the middle of freefall, it was Cyrus who managed to calm down to use his aura, while Tadith surfed on his sword. However, Cillian also tried to use his power, but Ryfin warned him not to, since he was using magic. So the three of them, they ended up trapped in a clash of powers, spiraling out of control while still in freefall, with Cillian telling him to stop faking it, being a mage, and Cillian noticing how loud they were. Luckily, in the end, everyone ended up hanging onto the weapon of Tadith just before falling, and once at the bottom, they noticed the hole they fell through was gone. And although the MC thought his gift would be there, he only saw an empty warehouse, continuing to explore the place until they were guided by strange messages to some kind of arena, where they walked around confused, but Cyrus was the first to realize that something was coming toward them, and Cillian was the first one to get terrified upon seeing it, though Sirius, more than scared, felt major cringe seeing the familiar silhouettes of the Zumbe, ghosts of Rifin ex-disciples, marching with determination to take revenge on the martial king, and his teachings, which the MC considered a total trash gift. Cyrus tried to counterattack with his aura, but the beings, blocked with a spiral, guard and repelled him with a Kai blast, and Sirius also tried to fight, but his spiral attacks did nothing to the jacked ghosts, who easily surrounded him. Sirius asked how many of those ghosts there were, and Rifin mentioned that his master had beaten more than 100 students to death, with Sirius and Cyrus complaining about the situation, and Rifin wondering if it was a good idea to continue that lineage, before, ironically, trying to solve everything with his fists. However, all the ghosts used the spiral guard, which led the MC to complain about how annoying the technique was, and everyone noticed how extremely spiteful the ghosts were, on whom a desperate Cillian used his divine power with which he managed to bring peace to all those buff ghosts, ending up exhausted but was congratulated by the orc. However, that wasn't over yet, because they started feeling something more physical approaching. Rifin's blood almost boiled, just imagining that his master was twisted enough to have brought back his disciples, not just as ghosts, but what appeared in front of them was much, much worse, because their own demons appeared before them. Usos, who was ready to finish the job, Steven wanting revenge for the humiliation, and Christina wanting her husband. And although Cillian felt the pressure, nearby the most important thing for Rifin was Felena, his childhood friend from the magic tower. Upon seeing her, he assumed that surely Teslin would also be around, and right on cue the latter was approaching with a mysterious and confident entrance, allowing those old rivals to lock eyes for the first time in ages. With their new faces, Teslin complained that they had taken his body and made him a dwarf, while Rifin felt awkward because he didn't even recognize his own body now, muscular and tall, and he was shocked he'd always had so much potential. But Teslin argued it was quite the opposite, costing too much effort for too little gain. They carried themselves with such confidence and ease that Cillian saw them as if they'd been brothers forever. Because of this, Teslin went back to his old mysterious style, which Felena said didn't fit anymore, but even so, he kept claiming he would finish off the demon king before he brought chaos to the world. Cillian needed the details on that, but Rifin told them he'd explain later, and that right now they had to listen to the villain's maniacal speech, who was glad that seeing him again was all thanks to the master's loving gift, and it was bugging the MC how weird the gym bros from the Unbreakable sect were, and complaining that his brain suited him well, since the former meathead was more eloquent than before, which finally triggered the clash with the MC, planning not to hold back and making sure that if he did, he'd take him out, and so they charged at each other with pure ferocity, creating an impact that flashed all around them. And the others weren't far behind, with Steven charging at Rifin, but Toddy wouldn't let him interrupt the fight. Meanwhile, Usos knew exactly who he was facing, looking to end the family's disgrace. Cyrus thought the same thing, seeing that his sister had forgotten a knight's honor, and so they began their struggle to be Tennis's sword, and Felena decided to help, striking first with a brutal spell at the one most susceptible to magic, Tadith. But Cillian wouldn't just watch. He used his divine power to block the girl's magic. She was shocked to see such a confident and powerful saint. For his part, Rifin tried to take the upper hand with his fire key, even though Tess dodged them easily, mocking his strength, yet he admitted he couldn't take hits with that fragile body, as the Unbreakable sect demanded. And although the MC admired how agile his body was, he could only dodge. Tess responded with a spell which made Rifin laugh in his face, and Teslin didn't back down, mocking him right back, and so they moved to a different kind of fight. An absurd argument about who was using the other's body worse, leaving their allies totally confused, not knowing whether to step in or just watch. And getting back to the fight, the MC used his advanced magic to attack, surprising Tess that he could use it with his brain, while he moved so fast it made Rifin's head spin. Seeing the excellent condition of his body, he felt like he would be at a disadvantage if he kept fighting with that dumb brain of his, so he had to end it quickly. But as he lunged into a fierce attack, Tess smirked, seeing he had fallen for the trap, shrouding his sword in aura for a killing blow, and the massive flash from that strike left Rifin badly wounded and confused to see his own spiral guard being used with a sword, since his opponent knew his body couldn't take it, and the MC was frustrated by his rival, who was bragging that even if his body couldn't handle the Unbreakable sect style, he was still the indomitable martial king Teslin, proving that he's also capable of fighting like that. Though for Rife, it's no surprise, remembering him as the second strongest on the continent, alongside Cyrus, and Tess, annoyed that he's the one by his side now, reminisced how he was the only friend he ever had, noting that in this life, he had achieved so much more. The MC understood it. He used to be a very shy kid, but they went back to talking like old friends, and Tess saw it the same way, even though Felena had been confused by that for a long time. However, it wasn't friendship but rivalry, since he was determined to take down the Demon King, while the latter was sure he couldn't beat him with magic, so his rival would face him with all his physical power, gearing up to see who was truly the strongest. For his part, Cyrus had to deal with the repeated attacks from his brother's dragon sword, who kept harping on his honor. This surprised the kid here. He had literally stabbed him, but his brother didn't see it that way. And yet Cyrus didn't find it honorable to go around stabbing people, though it didn't matter anymore, because he didn't consider him a brother either, attacking him with everything he had, while Cyrus, for his part, summoned Selena once again to use her as a springboard, putting the pressure on the paladin who couldn't wrap his head around his power and thought she was just another love rival falling. Even harder for the nervous Cillian, but Cyrus denied it by summoning Ignisus, making things even messier for the paladin. Meanwhile, Cillian continued, holding back the mage, who knew full well that if things stayed this even, no one would win, though her smitten side was triggered seeing Riffin and Tess so close together, rolling around on the ground in a sort of submission hold, as Tess knew the weaknesses of the unbreakable Jim very well, having dedicated his life to learning Greco-Roman wrestling, and with it he had Riffin pinned down, who remembered that among his master's teachings, that was never an option. And even though Riffin tried to use brute force, Tess countered him just as easily, increasing the pressure on his leg, blocking his key channels with a Boston Crab, resisting as best as they both could, giving their all with their aura in a massive power struggle on the mat, which Riffin was clearly losing, falling into desperation until he remembered he was a mage, using a spell to make himself slippery as grease, breaking free from the hold. This shocked Tess, who couldn't believe that would work on humans. Fortunately, Riffin, thanks to Cecilia, had discovered long ago that his body wasn't very human. However, his rival took his back again to submit him and trying to slip away with magic once more. That spell was shut down, having to appeal to his honor as Gerard's disciple, but he wasn't that anymore, and he was willing to humble himself a little for the peace of the continent. Though the MC didn't take him seriously when he saw where his arm was now, and Tess tried to explain that it was an advanced jujutsu technique. However, Helena couldn't stop seeing it as something way more erotic, which is what all the girls there were thinking, embarrassing Tess enough that Riffin managed to break free. Nevertheless, the battle continued, with him getting caught and breaking loose over and over, noticing that he preferred to fight as a mage, awkwardly because clearly everyone was in their own fights, left without help. And although his biggest worry was a fired-up Stephen in berserker armor, about to defeat Tadith, with Stephen bragging about his power, demanding the orc kneel before him, but he had no intention of doing so for his honor. The kid, crazed by his status, saw him as nothing but a wild beast, determined to exterminate him. However, Tadith had no intention of giving up, using his magic sword to attack him. Still, Stephen, overconfident, used a single move to destroy everything, striking the orc hard. The warrior mocked the orc for holding out so long, approaching him with a look full of contempt and disdain, which Tadith recognized as the way humans had always seen orcs, and he remembered his days as a gladiator, when with a simple rusty sword, he entertained the masses by exterminating demons, members of his own species, and simple prisoners, watching how those fired-up human gazes were entertained by the growth of his honor as an orc would give everything before losing his life dishonorably. And that thought got him back on his feet, recovering his reliable friend and weapon, Dakar, as his aura began to glow with his honor based on being a member of the bear tribe, not a gladiator. Remembering the day he was saved by Riffin and unleashing a great power from his weapon, proud of his heritage, before the terrified gaze of his rival Tadith awakened his aura and stood back up, ready for the fight. Stephen, desperate and furious to see that a lesser being was imitating the aura, prepared himself once again. Tadith waited for him, ready for combat, and so their showdown began, which left the berserker more and more unhinged, unable to understand how the orc was not only holding his own, but was also an aura user. This only enraged the orc, who saw him as a coward for not admitting it, and threw a heavy blow that the kid could barely withstand, growing more desperate as he swung his sword in frustration. But the orc was done with it all and decided to end him, channeling all his power into Dakar to deliver a destructive slash, ultimately finishing off Stephen, who ended up collapsing on the ground. Cyrus happily cheered that someone finally took the berserker down a notch. Yusuf, on his part, couldn't fathom how an orc could use aura, but his brother made it crystal clear he simply could. This infuriated the Golden One, who unleashed his power, powerful slashes and flashes, and Cyrus blocked them all, but he noticed that the armor was so durable that no matter how many times he hit it, he couldn't leave a scratch. However, while observing his movements, he seemed to get an idea, and when Yusuf charged at him, Cyrus dodged him with ease and countered with a flurry of rapid thrusts, and his brother let out a mocking laugh, convinced that those attacks couldn't do anything to him. But Cyrus wasn't trying to hurt him directly. It was then that Yusuf noticed a blue glow right in the center of his chest, and before he could even react, Cyrus snapped his fingers. At that very instant, his aura erupted in a devastating explosion, and Yusuf ended up on the ground after the blast. And although Cyrus won, he felt his technique still left much to be desired, since it wasn't even close to the level of Estala and Usukaila, under the worried gaze of Valina, just like Stephen, who already lay on the ground before the imposing orc. The paladin was being held back by Cyrus. Seeing this, the mage had no choice but to alert Teslin, who was still making the MC sweat, and at that moment, Cyrus appeared behind him. But Tess reacted in time to dodge the blow, and so Rifin's friends bought him just enough time for him to be ready again to fight against Tess and stop him from interfering in his dreams. With Tess seeing he heavily underestimated the MC's friends, he decided to retreat to fight another day, leaving with his companions. However, Rifin didn't plan on letting him get away easily, though it wasn't like Tess didn't have a plan, summoning the unbreakable Jim, awakening the vengeful ghosts once again, who were furious because following that path was their reward, which unfortunately for Rifin meant they only attacked him, and while the rest escaped badly injured, Elena apologized for not being more helpful, and this reminded Tess that in the past she was a friend of the Demon King, just like how Iris was his, and with the changes that occurred, there was no turning back now, reaching an ancient rune, which according to him was the only way to clear the 5th stage of the Horn of Calamity. And at first he feared that Rifin might have learned it before their confrontation, but seeing he hadn't destroyed it, he was glad, because even though he lost the duel, Rifin also lost the goal of his journey, leaving them both incomplete. Meanwhile, the unbreakable ghosts continued to give the group trouble until Celia used Felenia's love to help them all ascend, although he ended up completely drained from it, annoyed at having to deal with such powerful ghosts. And Rifin understood these specters, since leaving the world through violence must breed a lot of resentment, feeling that such a sentiment was capable of even warping reality. And although his goal now was to track his enemies, Ciaro asked who Teslin was. The MC told him he was a hometown friend with whom he had a massive disagreement regarding his treatment of different species, and so they followed, noting that once destroyed, a mural had vanished. And Rifin assumed it was just Tess being petty while ignoring the creatures, and with this, Siri felt like he hadn't found anything, although the MC felt like he gained a new Laura user, with Tadith happy to be blessed. According to the MC, 10 years before his fight with Cameron of Hallion, he felt that with the root and the orc's victory, it was enough, and everyone decided to head home. Meanwhile, in a forest, several trolls ran in terror, fleeing the terrible fate of being turned into potions, courtesy of a group led by a knight named London, who sees trolls as walking gold, since they're useful for healing potions, and the elder troll protects the young ones, feeling guilty for descending into a forbidden region. Because of this, he saw no choice but to act as a distraction, like a bird that exposes itself to a predator to protect its eggs, and stood brave before the knights. But he wasn't going down without a fight. Using energy from the poppies and cotton to power up and launching an attack, he was met with a desperate slash from a terrified soldier, followed by a hail of arrows. Seeing that he kept regenerating, they decided to find a net to trap and burn him, but furious, he began to surge with power, starting his gigantification process, since trolls, while being the most peaceful of intelligent species, were also the most ferocious. When they were backed into a corner, turning into a giant monster ready for battle. And so, in a rural village on the outskirts of Peru Forest, the villagers were worried about the noises from the woods, though they thought it was simply the hunters luring the trolls, and one woman looked uneasy, wondering if the magic circle would actually trap them, even though her husband tried to reassure her. Meanwhile, outside, an old woman named Mrs. Tess begged them to stop bothering the trolls, since they were the protectors of the forest, but no one listened to her, viewing her as a superstitious lady, and they kept preparing the circle, though the villagers would have preferred it to be done far from the village. Still, they hoped Landon would bring something good, since they had invested heavily in the circle. Right at that moment, they began to hear sounds nearby, and the younger hunters were being chased by a massive troll heading straight for the village. Rose the mage saw it, prepped a spell, and launched a fireball that stopped the troll's advance for a moment, and although it began to regenerate, it was pummeled by more attacks, driving it little by little into the circle, where a spell finally trapped and chained it. the hunters readied a huge ballista to impale the troll, and while he was badly wounded, another mage used a toxic essence, finishing off the poor troll, who finally collapsed on the ground, and his body returns to its original size, in the middle of the circle, where the hunters pulled him out, tied up and ready for transport, and all the citizens were convinced they had been saved from the clutches of the monster. However, Mrs. Tess, completely terrified and filled with dread, confronted them about why they just woke the wrath of the forest that would fall upon them. But they only saw her as a crazy old lady. Meanwhile, in South Highland, in the mountains of Getter, the group of hunters was transporting the troll, hoping to make bank. Once they brought him to the alchemists, sure they would reach their camp soon. However, one of them seemed to hear something in the forest. The noises grew louder, putting on alert all the hunters who didn't understand what was happening, and suddenly, one of them vanished, which freaked everyone out. Nevertheless, they couldn't see who had attacked them, and so they began to be wiped out, disappearing one by one, everyone falling into confusion, seeing their comrades' blood fly, quickly blaming the devil. And one of the veterans geared up, claiming it was an ambush by the monsters, but he couldn't do anything else when his head was crushed. Everyone took formation, trying to defend themselves, sending their mage to try to detect the attack. However, when he cast the spell, it rebounded quickly, making him cough up blood and fall to his knees, without understanding what happened. And Landon then remembered the old lady's words, but tried to ignore them, asking the mage to tell him what was going on. It was then that, from the forest, a voice rebuked them, saying that although they had never harmed him, human greed certainly had hurt his species. This terrified all the hunters. Landon jumped to the front, pissed off that a mere monster harmed the order of Sayaj, but that only caused them to lose more soldiers. And one of them finally saw who they were up against. Ivory Fang, a troll that looked demonic, towering strong and with massive tusks. A monster, notorious for having slaughtered hunters and alchemists, who was now dangerously close, asking if their greed really outweighed their fear, right before staining a rock with their blood. And just like that, 8 days after, the encounter with Teslan Riffin's group returned to Antares, where a lot had happened, establishing the Blue Bear tribe in the Glotton Mountains. And despite the fear of sparking a conflict with the locals in the area, they were protected under the county's jurisdiction. And meanwhile, Geruton was settled in the Elven forest to finally live in peace. And the dwarves of the Great Forge signed a trade agreement with the Tauban Syndicate, so they no longer needed to hunt for food. Slowly but surely, the kingdom of Antares was coming back to life. And if the world doesn't want to see you happy, then you must happily change the world. Season finale, Chapter 67.